Drift of the Multiverse Marvel Resident Evil DC Bleach DBCP 1-25. Chapter 1. Ethan swallowed hard, his parched throat protesting as he took a small sip of water from the wooden spoon. This is it, my last bit of water. If I don't see land or rain soon, I might go down in history as the first reincarnator to die of thirst. Staring at the bottom of the bucket, he let out a bitter chuckle. The thought of such an inglorious death was both depressing and absurd. To think he might meet his end this way. Placing the wooden spoon aside, Ethan carefully covered the bucket. Returning to the bow of his small boat, he straightened his posture and muttered to himself, "There's always a way. Things will get better." Clinging to the shred of optimism, he fixed his gaze on the horizon, hoping desperately for a change in the endless expanse of blue before him. Anything land, a ship, even a bird in the distance, anything to prove he wasn't doomed to this monotonous seascape. Ethan raised his left hand and focused. A faint, light blue glow shimmered into existence in his palm, and moments later, a translucent blue orb materialized. The orb wasn't particularly remarkable. Its only defining feature was the arrow-like object at its center, which pointed unerringly in the direction his boat was headed. "I trust you're my golden finger," Ethan muttered, "but please, don't fail me." As the orb pulsed faintly in his hand, Ethan found his mind drifting. He thought back to the strange, unfamiliar world he had found himself in years ago. For the first time in a while, doubt crept into his heart. Depending on something so mysterious, something he barely understood suddenly felt reckless, even foolish. In the future, if there is a future, I can't afford to act so blindly again. The name Ethan had carried over from his previous life, but that was all. In his old world, he had a surname Parker, but here, he was just Ethan. No family name, no lineage, just a single name. In his past life, Ethan had been entirely ordinary. He was good at school but not exceptional, landed a decent job that paid the bills, and lived a quiet, uneventful life. He'd expected that life to stretch on into old age. But fate had other plans. A sudden illness struck him down, and before he knew it, he was here. When he awoke, he found himself in the body of a young man on the verge of death. Thankfully, he inherited the boy's memories, which included the local language and general knowledge about this new world. That helped him adapt quickly, ensuring that the boy's father didn't notice anything amiss. Under his new father's care, Ethan grew up, slowly learning the truth of the world he now inhabited. This was a world dominated by oceans. Land was scarce, so scarce that it couldn't sustain large populations. Even though the islands scattered across the vast seas were rich in marine life and had mild, pleasant climates, they could only provide so much. Over the years, Ethan had watched countless people leave their homes and families behind, sailing off into the unknown in search of the legendary endless land. They left everything to their children, hoping to give the next generation a better chance. But no one ever returned. Not once. Even the oldest residents of the island had no stories of someone coming back. To Ethan, the conclusion was obvious. The island was a backward, stagnant place, and its people clung to the most basic rules of survival. Those who ventured into the sea weren't pioneers or adventurers, they were sacrificing themselves so their families could live. The so-called endless land might exist, but it was likely just an ordinary continent, far out of reach for the island's primitive ships. They all died at sea, Ethan murmured to himself. After all, if they had succeeded, someone would have returned for their loved ones. Surely, at least one person would have tried to reunite with their family. Whether his theory was true or not, Ethan couldn't say for sure. What he did know was that when he was 16, his father returned from a journey gravely ill. Despite fighting for weeks, the illness claimed him. Once Ethan had completed the necessary rites as his father's son, he made a choice. He didn't join the island's bustling fishing fleet, which was considered the most respectable and reliable career path. Instead, he found the boat his father had quietly prepared and set out on his own journey, determined to find the endless land. Why? Because Ethan refused to settle for the mundane life of a fisherman on what he saw as a backwards, stagnant island. But there was another reason, one far more compelling. The glowing orb in his hand. When it first appeared, it was little more than a faint, flickering light. Over time, it grew more stable, until it finally took the form of a proper orb. It had taken Ethan 7 long years to bring it to this state. And during all that time, the arrow within the orb had never wavered. It pointed in the same direction, always steady and unchanging. Ethan, who had devoured countless novels in his past life, couldn't help but interpret it as a sign. "Leave this dead-end island," the orb seemed to say. "There's something greater waiting for you out there." He had taken the message to heart. Setting out to sea had been daunting, but over time, his awkward and clumsy movements turned into confident, practiced routines. The lessons his father had taught him transformed from abstract knowledge into instinctive skills. The sea had been kind to him thus far. This particular region was calm, with no violent storms or unpredictable currents, giving Ethan plenty of time to hone his abilities. And as the 3 arrows on the orb's display dwindled to 2, and then to 1, the problems he encountered on his journey seemed to disappear, as though the world itself was clearing the way. Now, as the single remaining arrow pointed the way forward, Ethan's excitement grew. The treasure he was searching for felt closer than ever. As the water in his boat dwindled to almost nothing, Ethan finally came to terms with the harsh reality of his situation. He was adrift in an endless sea, with no hope of rescue. All his hopes and resources rested on a small boat less than 10 meters long. Without fresh water, he estimated he wouldn't survive more than 3 days. Of course. I was just an ordinary guy in my last life. What made me think I could suddenly become the main character in some grand adventure? Ethan stared at the bone-dry bucket in silence. Gradually, his panic subsided, replaced by a strange calm. There's no point in losing my head now. Either I pray for rain, or I trust this pointer, wherever it's leading me. Desperation pushed Ethan to the very edge of his endurance. He pushed the boat as hard as he could, rationing the last of his water-rich fruits to keep himself alive. This way, he managed to hang on for 5 more days. Just when his strength was about to give out, something finally happened. The orb in his hand changed. The arrow, which had always pointed forward, suddenly shifted downward, pointing toward the water beneath him. Is this it? Did I arrive? Ethan quickly retracted the sails and dropped anchor. Standing on the deck, he scanned his surroundings, but the view hadn't changed in the slightest. It was still an endless stretch of ocean in every direction. Under the water. His face darkened at the thought. Having grown up on an island, Ethan was no stranger to swimming, but after weeks at sea, his body was far too weak for diving. And even if he were at full strength, who could say how deep the water was here? He glanced at the sea around him. It was still a clear, light blue with faint green undertones, the same color it had been for days. That likely meant it wasn't an actual deep sea, but still, it was far beyond the reach of someone diving without equipment. I'm stuck. He muttered helplessly. He sighed deeply, slumping back onto the bow of his boat. So this is how it ends. Just my luck to go out like this. I wonder if I'll get a second chance, again. For a brief moment, Ethan considered jumping into the water. Would drowning be less agonizing than dying of thirst? As his thoughts spiraled, his gaze drifted to his left hand, and that's when he noticed something unusual. Up until now, his left hand had always looked normal unless he summoned the orb. But this time, a strange, intricate pattern was forming on the back of his hand. What is this? The lines grew clearer and more defined, eventually forming a complex design. Is this a magic circle? As soon as the pattern completed itself, it began to emit a soft, blue glow. Then, without warning, a wave of mental energy surged into Ethan's mind from the circle. In an instant, he understood everything. Ha! So there really is a way out. Ethan laughed aloud. The relief was overwhelming, but the effort made him cough violently. Reeling from the sudden burst of energy, Ethan steadied himself and moved to the center of the boat, the most stable part of the vessel. Kneeling on one knee, he pressed his left hand firmly against the deck. I have to give it everything I've got. My body's in terrible shape right now, and I don't even know if I'll have enough energy to pull this off. But Ethan didn't hesitate. He knew this was his only shot. If he failed now, he'd have to try again after using the last of his food and water. And if his body gave out before he could try again, there's no other choice. Let's do this. Summoning every ounce of mental energy he had, Ethan focused on his left hand. Years of practice made the process almost second nature, and despite his weakened state, he executed it smoothly. As his mental energy poured into the magic circle, its glow grew brighter and brighter. Finally, the circle flared to life, projecting a matching design onto the boat's deck. It worked. Seeing the magic circle activate, Ethan felt a rush of hope. At the same time, a new stream of mental energy flowed back into his mind, carrying with it detailed information about the circle. He now knew how to use it, the exact process for activating it, and most importantly its purpose. Plane shuttle. That was what the magic circle was for. Ethan, having been thoroughly steeped in internet novels in his previous life, didn't need anyone to explain what that meant. He understood immediately. Of course, there were boundless risks ahead. But here, stranded in the middle of the ocean with no water or supplies, those risks didn't matter. He had no choice. Wherever it sends me, it can't be worse than this. As the magic circle's light enveloped him, Ethan felt his body start to fade. The teleportation was beginning. But just as he was about to leave, a wave of dizziness swept over him. His exhaustion finally caught up to him, making him feel like he was collapsing after an all-night study session back in his old life. Seriously? Passing out at the last second? Just my luck. Before his vision went dark, Ethan caught one final glimpse of his surroundings. The glow of the magic circle faded away, revealing a group of robed figures standing around him. They were watching him with wary eyes, and one of them, a bald woman in yellow robes, began to approach. Her lips moved as though she were speaking, but before Ethan could make out what she was saying, his consciousness slipped away entirely. Chapter 2. Ethan jolted upright, his consciousness snapping back all at once. His first instinct was to check his body. The worn, dirty clothes he had been wearing after days at sea were gone, replaced with a clean set of plain white robes. The fabric wasn't new, but it was fresh and neatly laundered. He touched his lips, once cracked and dry from lack of water. Now, they felt much better, almost completely healed. His body, too, felt reinvigorated, as though he were brimming with energy. That sleep, or rather, coma, had been the most restful he'd had in a long time. You're recovering well. Much faster than I anticipated. The unfamiliar voice startled Ethan. He immediately turned his head to see the bald figure he vaguely remembered before passing out. The person, no, the woman was sitting at a table near his bed, calmly brewing tea. I gave you some rejuvenation potions while you were unconscious, the woman continued without looking at him. Still, it's impressive that you've woken up so soon. Ethan stayed silent, taking in the sight of the woman busy with her tea. Strangely, though her lips weren't moving, he could still hear her voice clearly. It felt more like the words were echoing directly in his mind. Yes, she said as if reading his thoughts. I'm using magic to establish a direct spiritual connection with you. I assumed you wouldn't understand the language of this world, young man from another world. At this, she finally raised her head to meet Ethan's gaze, allowing him to get a proper look at her face. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. Where am I? Ethan asked, focusing his mental energy to form the thought. His words caught the woman by surprise. Her eyebrows arched slightly, and a small smile graced her lips. Ah, you're quite talented. You've grasped the basics of mental communication already. That's convenient. Carrying a cup of tea, she approached him and handed it over. This is Earth, she said. My name is the Ancient One. I'm a mage. Do you know what a mage is? Ethan accepted the cup and took a careful sip. I know. He didn't just know what a mage was, he also knew about Earth. After all, he had lived on Earth in his previous life, though it wasn't this Earth. The thought made Ethan's heart race. Wait. A spiritual link. Can she read my thoughts directly? Glancing at the Ancient One, Ethan tried to gauge her reaction. The enigmatic mage from the Marvel Universe showed no sign of having heard his stray thoughts. Was she deliberately feigning ignorance, or did she truly lack the ability to read minds? Ethan decided to test her. He deliberately mixed his mental energy when forming his words, while letting unrelated thoughts wander in his mind. If she reacted to the random thoughts, it would mean she could read his mind. After a few exchanges, Ethan reached a tentative conclusion: either the Ancient One was pretending not to notice, or she truly could only hear messages he consciously projected. Though he hoped it was the latter, he couldn't dismiss the possibility of the former. Still, her composed demeanor gave him some relief. At least, she hadn't immediately deemed him a threat and eliminated him on the spot. As the conversation continued, the Ancient One gently probed Ethan's situation. He explained that he came from a world covered in oceans, that he was only 17, that his parents were gone, and that his arrival here was purely accidental. In return, the Ancient One clarified a few things about his current circumstances. The orb in Ethan's hand, it turned out, had been pointing toward dispersed space-time energy. Once it located the energy, it would absorb it. Ethan, as the host, could then use his mental power to activate a magic circle for teleportation. After the teleportation, the space-time energy protected the host temporarily until it was depleted. Once exhausted, the energy would automatically send the host back to their original location. This explanation also clarified why the Ancient One had intervened. The magic circle's intended destination wasn't the Ancient One's home at Camartage. Instead, as Earth's protector against interdimensional threats, she had intercepted Ethan's arrival the moment his presence registered as an invasion. Of course, Ethan muttered inwardly. The Ancient One doesn't miss a thing. No wonder she intercepted me mid-teleportation. Makes you wonder how so many other fictional characters managed to slip into Marvel's world unnoticed by someone like her. At least he could be thankful this was the movie version of the Ancient One. The comic version? That might have ended very differently. The Marvel comic universe was notorious for being far more chaotic and far less forgiving. The energy within you is steadily depleting, the Ancient One continued, and I estimate it will completely dissipate in about 7 days. Ethan's heart sank. He knew the truth, the space-time energy wouldn't last 7 days. It would last 6. On the 6th day, when the energy reached its minimum threshold, it would automatically trigger the teleportation circle to return him to his original world. It's a shame to come all this way, only to be sent back after a few meals and a nap, Ethan thought, his mood souring. But then an idea occurred to him. Would the Ancient One be willing to teach me magic? After a brief discussion, Ethan tentatively brought up the subject, only to be gently but firmly dismissed. Your mental aptitude is adequate, the Ancient One said tactfully. But even with years of effort, you're unlikely to achieve much. It would be a poor use of your life. The message was clear, she didn't think he had the talent for magic. It wasn't a surprising assessment. In almost every story, becoming a mage required extraordinary aptitude, and Ethan had no delusions about himself. He was an ordinary person both in his past life and in this one. Still, the Ancient One wasn't entirely dismissive. If your goal is simply to solve practical problems, that's achievable. Ethan had already explained his predicament to her, hoping to earn her sympathy. Though she wasn't one to let emotions sway her, she also wasn't the type to leave someone in a desperate situation without offering some help. You have decent control over your mental energy, she said. That's enough to learn a basic spell. With diligent practice, it should be enough to solve your water problem. The Ancient One guided him through the basics of the spell using their spiritual connection. This method of teaching was incredibly efficient, allowing complex concepts to be communicated far more clearly than with words alone. The spell itself was straightforward. It extracted water molecules referred to as water elements from the surrounding environment and condensed them into drinkable water. The spell's effectiveness depended heavily on the environment. It wasn't creating water out of thin air or converting magical energy into water, it simply manipulated existing water molecules. The spell was simple but practical, and Ethan quickly grasped the fundamentals. Now all he needed was practice. The spell couldn't have been more fitting for the world he came from, a world dominated by endless oceans. Everywhere he looked, there was water, and yet, none of it was drinkable. The only real challenge was controlling mental energy. Many people possessed strong mental energy but lacked the fine control necessary to use it effectively, which prevented them from becoming mages. Fortunately for Ethan, he had been honing his mental energy for years, ever since he first began using the glowing orb to navigate his world. This constant practice had given him a precision that bypassed what others might find difficult. Watching the small droplets of water gradually form in his palm, Ethan finally allowed himself a smile. This trip wasn't for nothing. Even better, the Ancient One had used their spiritual link to teach him a local language, freeing him from the awkward barrier of being unable to communicate with others. Over the next 3 days, Ethan explored the area as much as he could. His movements were somewhat restricted, there weren't many places he was allowed to go, and he didn't encounter many people. He didn't even see any of the familiar faces he half expected. Though the Ancient One didn't harm him, she clearly didn't trust him enough to let him wander freely. Subtle but constant surveillance ensured that if Ethan tried to leave his designated area, someone would promptly stop him. Other than that, there were no real restrictions. He was free to chat with the apprentices, even discussing their magical studies. One young apprentice, in particular, seemed to delight in showing off. Armed with a smartphone, the apprentice kept flaunting it in front of Ethan, as though bullying an otherworldly native who didn't know what it was. The apprentice's smugness backfired spectacularly. Ethan, who had grown up with smartphones in his previous life, quickly taught him a lesson, particularly after figuring out how to tinker with the phone. Angry Birds, which the apprentice had proudly shown off as the latest craze, was a game Ethan had long grown bored of in his past life. Still, the apprentice's foolishness had a silver lining. By messing around with the phone, Ethan managed to figure out the timeline of his current location. Based on the apprentice's chatter and the release of the game, Ethan guessed it was sometime between Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 2. So Doctor Strange won't show up for a few more years. Ethan muttered to himself. Then, a thought struck him, and he grinned. Wait, does that make me his senior? Perhaps because of Ethan's good behavior, the Ancient One eventually gave him something unexpected. When Ethan returned to his room that evening, he found a variety of items waiting for him, packaged food, basic living and sailing tools, a few changes of clothes, and a stack of books. The energy in your body will activate tonight, sending you back to your original world, the Ancient One said as she appeared beside him. These items should be enough to sustain you for a while. Her precision was nothing short of remarkable. In the few days since meeting Ethan, the Ancient One had not only figured out the exact state of the energy within his body but had also calculated the exact moment of his departure. She had even prepared everything he might need ahead of time. Truly, the title of Supreme Mage wasn't just for show. Although the water-gathering spell I taught you is a simple and basic magic, she continued, practicing it diligently will strengthen your mental energy. You'll likely find it useful in the future. The Ancient One gestured toward the books on the table. The first was titled Introduction to Spiritual Power Training. Beside it were explanation of the use of basic spells and several other tomes. One stack caught Ethan's attention, a thick set of Oxford dictionaries, along with French and other language textbooks. Don't worry, she added. As you practice and improve your spiritual power, your memory will also strengthen. You'll find it easier to memorize these books as time goes on. Ethan scratched the back of his head, puzzled. But, why give me these? He glanced at the textbooks. The Ancient One's expression grew serious. I have a feeling you'll come back. Maybe, she said quietly, you'll be able to help me solve a great problem when that time comes. Chapter 3. The slight rocking of the boat made Ethan a little uncomfortable. He had finally gotten used to the constant motion of being at sea, but after a few days of steady ground during his stay in the Marvel Universe, his body was back to square one. Doesn't matter, I'll get used to it again in a few days, he muttered, shaking his head. It was clear to him now that his days at sea would be long. This trip had taught Ethan that his so-called golden finger, the glowing orb, came with many limitations. First, let's get everything organized, he said to himself. Looking at his empty left hand and the large bag slung over his right shoulder, Ethan began sorting through his thoughts and belongings. He had learned something important during this journey. The items I physically picked up and carried back with me, like this bag in my right hand, came along for the ride. But the things I merely touched with my left hand didn't. This discovery made one thing clear, the teleportation magic circle could only transport objects that he was actively holding or carrying. Anything he simply brushed against or touched lightly wouldn't be brought back. Too bad, Ethan sighed. If I could bring back everything I touched, this would have been a game changer for the future. Unfortunately, his strength was limited. At 17, with a thin frame and years of poor nutrition, Ethan didn't have much physical power to rely on. While he could carry a moderate load, anything overly heavy, like a large boat, was out of the question. Even with bursts of adrenaline, the heaviest he could probably lift was something around 100 kilograms, and that wasn't practical for his purposes. I was really hoping to get myself a better boat, he muttered, glancing at his current one. The boat Ethan's father had prepared for him was nothing more than a simple wooden vessel. It had a single mast and a weathered sail, with a length of less than 10 meters. Storage consisted of a few wooden barrels for food and water, all of which were exposed to the elements. There wasn't even a shed to provide cover, just lids for the barrels. When Ethan first set out, he had been convinced that this flimsy craft wouldn't survive the open sea. A stronger gust of wind or larger waves would surely capsize it, or so he thought. But as the days passed, Ethan realized something strange. The sea in this area was eerily calm. He had sailed for days without encountering deep blue waters, let alone any storms. The weather and climate barely fluctuated, to the point that it was disorienting. There's still so much I don't understand about this world, he mused. With the supplies he had brought back from the Marvel Universe safely stowed, Ethan raised the anchor, adjusted the sail, and set off in a random direction. Initially, he had hoped the orb would guide him to his next destination. Without a clear goal, finding another source of space-time energy seemed like the most reliable way to replenish his supplies. But when he activated the orb, there was no familiar arrow. Instead, a line of text appeared, searching. So, space-time energy isn't something I can just find whenever I want, he muttered, putting the orb away. Now left to his own devices, Ethan began considering his options. Hopefully, I'll come across land soon. This whole world can't really just be water, can it? Not even a single island. At first, Ethan had dismissed the idea as the ignorant belief of superstitious villagers. But his time at sea, while not long enough to definitively prove anything, had shown him just how different this world was. This wasn't Earth, and he couldn't rely on what he thought he knew about how things worked. Thankfully, the water-gathering spell he had learned from the Ancient One solved one of his biggest problems, drinking water. Food is another story, Ethan thought grimly. I don't know when I'll get another chance to resupply, so I need to ration what I have. I'll make sure to stay hydrated, though. Determined not to die at sea, and unwilling to pin his hopes on space-time energy that might not even exist nearby, Ethan began planning his next steps. He calculated how much food he could eat each day to maintain his strength while conserving his supplies. At the same time, he began sorting through the books the Ancient One had given him, deciding to study them in the order she had recommended. Slow and steady, Ethan reminded himself. The Ancient One said my aptitude is average, so I probably won't get far without a lot of time on the basics. I'll stick to the introduction for now and leave the rest for later. Thus began Ethan's new routine. Every morning, he ate a small meal to maintain his energy, then set the boat to sail in a fixed direction. With no way to determine north, south, east, or west, he simply picked a course and stuck to it. Once the sails and rudder were adjusted, he would spend the rest of the day studying and practicing. Daily use of the water-gathering spell quickly improved his proficiency. What had once yielded only a spoonful of clean water now produced half a bucket in a single attempt. When I started, I could barely gather a single drop, Ethan marveled. It's not like my mental power could have grown this quickly, so the improvement must come from the sheer abundance of water elements in this environment. Thanks to his progress, Ethan not only had enough water to drink but could even afford to take the occasional shower. While it didn't make his monotonous days at sea exciting, it at least made them more bearable. As for the introduction to spiritual power, Ethan found it far more challenging. The book began with an overview of spiritual power training and meditation techniques, which were so abstract and esoteric that Ethan couldn't make sense of them. For 3 days, he struggled to understand even the first paragraph, to the point that he began doubting his intelligence. It wasn't until the 3rd day, when he accidentally channeled his mental energy while reading, that something clicked. The book's instructions suddenly made sense, as if he had unlocked a hidden door to understanding. So that's the trick. Ethan muttered, feeling a mix of relief and exasperation. He couldn't help but wonder, was this some kind of test she left for me? After discovering the proper way to unlock the introductory text, Ethan added a new task to his daily routine. Each day, after practicing the water-gathering spell, he would meditate to restore his mental energy. Then, he would use his replenished energy to study the strange book, slowly building up his spiritual strength. As his mental power improved, so did his understanding of the book's hidden knowledge. The text explained that no matter what kind of mage one aspired to be, spiritual power was at the core of spellcasting. The strength of a mage's spiritual power directly influenced their magic, its potency, their control over it, and even their ability to perform advanced spells. A mage with sufficiently powerful mental energy could theoretically harm their enemies with pure spiritual power, even without using magic. However, this method was rarely employed. The book elaborated briefly on why. Since spiritual power was closely tied to one's origin, such as the soul, using it as a weapon left the mage dangerously exposed. Directly attacking an enemy with spiritual power was akin to laying one's soul bare, leaving it vulnerable to exploitation. This risk was especially high against certain enemies who could inflict devastating harm by targeting the mage's exposed origin. To mitigate this, mages preferred to control external energies, commonly referred to as magic power, to cast offensive spells. The term magic, Ethan realized, was a catch-all. It wasn't a single type of energy but rather an umbrella term for many kinds. The book explained that water elements, fire elements, arcane energy, and even more extreme forces like holy light or dark energy were all considered forms of magic. This broad definition meant that magic power could take many forms, depending on the mage's aptitude. Take the Ancient One as an example. The book hinted at her mastery of various forms of energy. Ethan, recalling the Marvel movies from his past life, knew she even drew upon negative energy from dark dimensions to sustain herself and enhance her power. It was a textbook example of the pragmatic mage mindset. Energy was energy, and it could all be used as magic if the mage was skilled enough. But all of this hinged on one crucial factor, mental power. Without sufficient spiritual strength, even the most abundant source of energy was useless. To Ethan, the book's theory boiled down to this: magic was a tool, and spiritual power was the hand wielding it. Striking an enemy with your bare hands could hurt you as much as it hurt them. Using a tool, on the other hand, minimized the risk. As for the finer details, how magic power was created, extracted, and stored, those were absent from the book. Ethan suspected he wasn't yet qualified to learn that level of knowledge. There wasn't much point dwelling on the gaps in his understanding. The book had made it clear that his current level of mental power barely exceeded that of an ordinary person. He lacked the qualifications to even attempt manipulating magic power. If he wanted to grow stronger, there was only one path forward: focus on strengthening his spiritual power. The rest would have to wait until he reached a higher level. Wait, Is that a storm? Ethan froze as he noticed the distant horizon. For the first time since setting sail, the endless blue sea had transformed. Towering black clouds loomed in the distance, and the torrential rain cascading from them looked like a solid wall. The sheer scale and intensity of the storm showcased the terrifying power of nature, and Ethan, an inexperienced sailor in a small, fragile boat, was suddenly all too aware of how vulnerable he was. I need to turn around. Fast. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to flee. Getting anywhere near the storm was suicide. Even if his boat didn't enter the storm's direct path, the waves generated by it could easily capsize his vessel. As he scrambled to adjust his course, he suddenly froze. He thought he heard a voice. A faint, desperate cry for help. Am I imagining things? Ethan quickly grabbed the binoculars that the Ancient One had given him. Scanning the storm's outskirts, he spotted something unusual. Wreckage, pieces of a broken ship. Among the debris, Ethan saw what looked like two people clinging to a plank of wood, waving frantically. Someone's out there. Without hesitation, Ethan adjusted his course. He steered his boat toward the wreckage, determined to save the stranded survivors. Chapter 4. After quickly rescuing the two people who had fallen into the water, Ethan asked if there were any other survivors. Upon receiving a negative answer, he wasted no time in turning the ship's bow and steering away from the area as quickly as possible. His boat was far too small to withstand the chaos of the storm, and even though they were some distance away from its core, the aftermath alone made him feel as if the fragile vessel could capsize at any moment. It wasn't until Ethan had sailed far enough for the waves to calm that he finally let out a sigh of relief. Glancing back, he saw that the storm wasn't advancing in their direction, giving him the chance to check on the two survivors he had saved. One of them, a slightly frail man in his 40s, had a handsome face marked by the passage of time. The other, a man in his early 30s and in the prime of his life, was muscular and well-built. His soaked clothes clung to his body, emphasizing the corded muscles beneath. Thank you so much for saving our lives. The older man, after taking a few sips of water, immediately expressed his gratitude before handing the wooden spoon back to his companion. It was evident that both were seasoned sailors. Even after surviving such a harrowing ordeal, they drank with care, ensuring not a single drop was wasted. Ethan couldn't help but notice their restraint. It seemed they hadn't had fresh water in a long time. You're welcome. After the younger man finished drinking, Ethan took the wooden spoon back and put it away. He then asked what had happened to them. The older man introduced himself as Wood, while the younger man was named Rodney. Both were veteran sailors who had spent years navigating this stretch of ocean. From their conversation, Ethan gleaned that they were experienced and knowledgeable about life at sea. Wood explained that he owned a decent-sized sailboat and had a capable crew working under him. For years, they had been venturing through the region, but just days ago, they had made a bold decision to cross the Sea of Storms in search of new waters. It was during their explanation that Ethan began to grasp the bizarre nature of this world. According to Wood, the ocean they were currently on was called the Sea of Calm. Despite its name, this sea wasn't entirely tranquil. It was vast and unpredictable, but compared to other regions, it was considered relatively safe. How big is the Sea of Calm? Ethan asked. Wood shook his head. I couldn't say. It's enormous, that much is certain. But I do know it's not endless. Surrounding the Sea of Calm was the Sea of Storms, a region perpetually ravaged by violent tempests, torrential rain, and constant lightning. This natural barrier encircled the Sea of Calm like an impenetrable wall, making it nearly impossible to leave. The closer one sailed to the edge of the Sea of Calm, the more dangerous it became. Conversely, the closer one stayed to the center, the safer it was. In these central waters, the weather was mostly stable, and marine life was plentiful. Sailors could survive for years as long as they had a reliable source of drinking water. Even if we can't find an island, the sea provides enough food to last until we return to State Island to restock supplies, Wood said. Ethan furrowed his brow. So, there aren't any islands nearby? Wood sighed. Not a single reef, let alone an island. Ethan found this hard to believe, but Wood quickly explained. The most astonishing feature of the Sea of Calm was the islands themselves. Unlike anything Ethan had ever heard of, these islands would appear and disappear without warning. They can emerge suddenly, Wood said, his tone serious. In just a short span of time, they'll be covered with vegetation and fruit-bearing trees. But just as quickly, the plants will wither, and the entire island will sink back into the ocean, leaving no trace behind. Ethan listened, incredulous, as Wood described these phantom islands. Some islands lasted only a few days, while others remained for weeks or months before vanishing. The only permanent landmass in the Sea of Calm was State Island, a large and stable island that served as the center of life for the sea's inhabitants. State Island doesn't sink? Ethan asked. Wood nodded. It's the only one that doesn't. Its size and stability have made it the hub for everyone who lives in the sea. All trade and supplies flow through it. But State Island, as Wood explained, wasn't a paradise. Its resources were limited, and it couldn't accommodate the sheer number of people trying to settle there. Most people had to continue venturing out to sea, relying on the transient islands to gather resources and sustain themselves. So, all the people who left their islands to explore the sea were heading for State Island. Ethan asked. Wood shook his head. Not exactly. State Island can't take in everyone. Most people who leave their islands end up wandering the Sea of Calm, searching for those transient islands to collect resources they can trade for necessities. Wood glanced at Ethan. You must have just left your home, haven't you? Yes, Ethan admitted, keeping his explanation vague. He mentioned that his parents had passed away and that he had no reason to stay on his island, so he decided to leave. Rodney, who had been silent until now, shot Ethan a glance that could only be described as skeptical, as if silently saying, "This guy must be out of his mind." He quickly schooled his expression, but Ethan's heightened senses caught the slip. Wood chuckled. "It takes courage to set out on your own, but the Sea of Calm isn't as peaceful as it seems. Wandering these waters for years, searching for fleeting islands, it's not the kind of life most people dream of." He didn't try to persuade Ethan to turn back or give up, likely because he'd seen plenty of young dreamers before. "So, what kind of resources can you find on these islands?" Ethan asked. Wood leaned back slightly. "Anything and everything: food, minerals, timber, anything you can carry. You take what you find back to State Island and trade it for supplies. You can even commission a boat or hire a crew if you've got enough to trade." Ethan nodded slowly. It made sense. In a world dominated by endless seas, every resource was precious. State Island functioned much like a central hub in an online game, where adventurers could trade the resources they gathered for necessities, repair their gear, and prepare for their next journeys. This system kept the community alive in a world dominated by endless seas. There must be a powerful authority controlling this island, Ethan thought. Without an absolute ruler enforcing the rules, it would be impossible to maintain order among so many people. Wood continued sharing his knowledge with Ethan, teaching him the basics of survival in the Sea of Calm and explaining the strange customs and realities of this world. One of the first things Ethan learned was that this world didn't have the concepts of north, south, east, or west. Directions were determined entirely by the position of the sun. Sailing in the direction of the rising sun or the setting sun was how sailors navigated. "We're heading toward the rising sun now," Wood explained. "That'll take us to State Island. If you really want to make a living at sea, I recommend joining the Adventurers Guild when we get there." "The Adventurers Guild?" Ethan asked, intrigued. Wood explained that the Adventurers Guild was an organization designed to support adventurers who made their living at sea. It offered a variety of services, such as providing basic necessities like food and clothing, storing excess materials, helping members sell goods, and even offering a secure account system for storing wealth. The guild also provided exclusive benefits to its members, like access to rare resources, assistance with ship repairs, and even help with commissioning new ships. "And when you've got a sturdy enough crew and a well-built ship," Wood said, "you can try crossing the Sea of Storms along its safest route. That's the first step toward reaching the legendary Endless Land." Wood explained that the safest route through the Sea of Storms started from State Island and followed the direction of the setting sun. Compared to other parts of the stormy seas, this route had fewer storms, less lightning, and more manageable waves. "Of course, safest is relative," Wood added with a wry smile. "Even that route is still dangerous. We thought we were ready, but, well, you saw how that turned out." Wood and Rodney had attempted the crossing when they believed they were strong enough, but they hadn't made it far. A violent storm had forced them to turn back, and they barely escaped with their lives. As Wood finished his explanation, his exhaustion finally caught up with him. After spending so long adrift at sea, surviving on sheer determination, the adrenaline that had kept him going finally wore off. He slumped back and fell into a deep, unshakable sleep. Rodney, too, was out cold. Curled up awkwardly in the cramped boat, he didn't stir even when discomfort should have woken him. Ethan glanced around the crowded little boat. Between the supplies and the two sleeping men, there was hardly any room to move. After some consideration, he decided to sit by the rudder, leaning against a pile of debris to rest for the night. Though he was tired, Ethan didn't dare let down his guard completely. The lesson of never trust too easily had been drilled into him by life's hardships. Using the excuse of wanting to make progress during the night, he stayed awake as much as possible, only taking short naps when absolutely necessary. The following days were uneventful. The trio continued their journey toward State Island without any major incidents. Ethan remained cautious, but Wood and Rodney showed no signs of hostility. Wood continued to share his knowledge of the Sea of Calm, while Rodney maintained his quiet demeanor, rarely speaking unless absolutely necessary. The three of them, cramped together on the small boat, steadily made their way to the largest, unsinkable island in the Sea of Calm, State Island. When they finally reached the bustling port of State Island, Ethan felt an immense sense of relief. Stepping onto solid ground again after days at sea was a small but significant victory. As they prepared to part ways, Wood turned to Ethan with a sincere expression. "It's hard to repay the kindness of saving our lives, but if you ever need help, leave a message for me at the guild. Just ask for Captain Wood of the Swordfish." Ethan noticed that most people in this world didn't seem to have family names. To avoid confusion with others who might share the same given name, extra identifiers like a ship's name were used instead. "And take this." Wood reached into his belongings and pulled out a small, red stone, pressing it into Ethan's hand. "It's a fire attribute magic stone. Think of it as a small token of thanks for helping us out." Chapter 5. The Adventurers Guild. This was the official name of the organization Wood had mentioned. The guild's headquarters was conveniently located right at the port's exit, at the end of the main street. Its large, prominent building was impossible to miss. However, there was one peculiar detail: there were multiple entrances, each without any signage or indication of their purpose. For a newcomer unfamiliar with the layout, choosing the correct door might be a frustrating task. Fortunately, thanks to Wood's guidance, Ethan knew to enter through the door on the far left. This entrance was designated for rookies and handled matters like applying for membership and arranging accommodations for newcomers. Wood and Rodney, on the other hand, headed toward the hall frequented by veteran adventurers. They needed to report the loss of their ship and crew, withdraw their stored funds, and begin the process of purchasing a new vessel. As he watched the two disappear into the crowd, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Rodney had been casting him occasional glances. There was something about the man's gaze furtive, and definitely not friendly. Is it because of the magic stone? Ethan wondered. Magic stones were considered one of the most valuable and mysterious resources in this oceanic world. Rare and difficult to obtain, they served as both a magical resource and a form of currency. Even if someone didn't need one personally, trading a magic stone could fetch enough supplies to last for weeks. The Fire Attribute Magic Stone. I wonder what it can actually do. Magic stones had unique properties based on their attributes. For adventurers, one of the most sought-after types was the Water Purification Magic Stone. Just placing one in a barrel of seawater or contaminated water would purify it into drinkable, crystal-clear water. It's a shame it's not water attribute, Ethan mused, glancing at the stone in his hand. I'll have to figure out how this Fire Attribute one works later. Carefully tucking the stone into his backpack, he tightened the straps. His bag contained all of his most important belongings, including the stack of books gifted to him by the Ancient One. He didn't dare leave anything valuable on his small, unsecured boat, fearing it could be stolen while he was away. Entering the newcomer reception hall of the Adventurers Guild, Ethan immediately noticed how quiet it was compared to the bustling port and main guild hall. A quick glance around confirmed that he was the only person there. At the counter near the entrance, a young man stood waiting. Spotting Ethan, he waved enthusiastically. Welcome to the Adventurers Guild. Are you here to apply for membership? Ah, yes. Ethan replied, nodding as he approached the counter. Do I need to pay a fee to join? Ethan asked, realizing belatedly that he hadn't considered the possibility. In his time here, he hadn't seen anything resembling coins or currency. Bartering had been the norm on his home island, and he wasn't sure how things worked here. The clerk smiled. No, there's no membership fee. However, in the future, the guild will take a small commission when you store materials, order ship repairs, or conduct trade through us. Ethan nodded in understanding. So, the services have fees, not the membership itself. That's fair. The young clerk seemed delighted by Ethan's interest, perhaps because newcomers were a rare sight. Honestly, even if there's no fee to join, it's been a while since we've had anyone new sign up. You're actually the first person to apply for membership in the last 6 months. Really? Ethan was surprised. While the hall seemed quiet, he hadn't expected such a long drought of new members. The clerk, noticing Ethan's reaction, quickly added, "Oh, don't get the wrong idea. There are a lot of benefits to joining the guild. We offer better ships, access to experienced sailors, and plenty of other resources. For example, there are ships and crews registered with the guild that may not be in the best condition, but they're still very experienced. They're available for members to hire. Additionally, storing or consigning supplies with the guild saves adventurers a lot of time. And if you've had a tough trip, the guild provides returning adventurers with 3 days of free food and accommodation so they can rest and prepare for their next journey. All in all, the guild's services are designed to let adventurers focus on exploring and gathering resources without worrying about logistics." Ethan couldn't help but think that the guild sounded like a godsend for people trying to make a living at sea. Then why hasn't anyone joined in half a year, he asked. The clerk sighed, his cheerful demeanor dimming slightly. Fewer and fewer newcomers manage to make it to State Island from their home islands. And those who do are often old-timers who are too set in their ways. They're unwilling to part with even a fraction of their resources, convinced that the guild is trying to take advantage of them. The clerk shrugged, a look of disdain crossing his face. Honestly, those people just want to scrape by. They collect resources, trade for what they need, and only head back out to sea when their supplies are nearly gone. It's not a real life, it's just survival. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. Some of them don't even bother stocking up properly before heading out. They'll grab a few barrels of clean water and nothing else. 9 times out of 10, those people never make it back. Ethan frowned. The description reminded him of the people who had left his home island, chasing the dream of a better life only to find themselves stuck in an even worse situation. Once they arrived on State Island and realized things weren't as they'd hoped, many seemed to lose all motivation. To them, surviving one more day was just a bonus. How do they trade for food and supplies? Ethan asked. There's a market just down the road, the clerk explained. Go out this door, turn right, and follow the gravel path. It's the largest market on the island. Even guild members do most of their trading there, only using the guild to store or sell items that don't move quickly. Got it. Thanks for the info. No problem. Now, let's get your membership set up. I'll need you to fill out some basic information. Ethan nodded. Joining the guild seemed like the best choice, especially since it could provide him with valuable information about this world. He was determined to make the most of it. Name: Ethan. Age: 17. Gender: male. Height: I haven't measured. The clerk, clearly very experienced with the process, quickly jotted down Ethan's responses and grabbed a measuring tool to get the exact height, filling in the information without missing a beat. Ship name: this. Ethan hesitated. He hadn't thought about naming his boat, and the question caught him off guard. After a long pause, he rubbed his forehead and said casually, Goddess of Dawn. Oh, what a nice name, the clerk said with a grin, clearly pleased by Ethan's answer. Once the basic information was filled out, the clerk reached for a white magic stone from the counter. Without making any visible gestures, the stone released a soft blue light that swept over Ethan's face, scanning him. The clerk then moved the magic stone over the paper containing Ethan's information, and with a faint shimmer, the paper slowly faded away, as if absorbed by the stone. Next, the clerk slapped the magic stone against the desk with a sharp pop. When he removed his hand, the once rounded stone had transformed into a long, white strip about the width of a finger. The process had happened so fast that Ethan could only gape silently. Magic stones can do that? Before he could fully process what had just occurred, the clerk motioned for him to extend his hand. With another quick snap, the white strip was secured snugly around Ethan's wrist. It had turned into a flexible wristband that fit him perfectly. This will serve as your guild membership certificate, the clerk explained, showing Ethan how to use it. The wristband could be easily removed and wasn't restricted to the wrist, it was flexible enough to be worn around the neck, arm, or even the leg if needed. The clerk assured him that losing it wasn't a concern either. All of Ethan's information was stored in the guild's records, and he could request a replacement at any time by visiting the guild's main hall. By the way, if you don't like the white color, you can have it changed, the clerk added. But you'll need to pay for the customization. What's the cost for a color change? Ethan asked, curious. A magic stone of the corresponding color, the clerk replied cheerfully. Ethan grimaced. He couldn't imagine wasting a valuable magic stone, especially his fire attribute one, just to change the color of a wristband. Magic stones were rare and useful, and while his wasn't as prized as a water purification stone, it surely had some significant value. Yeah, I think I'll pass for now, Ethan said with a dry chuckle. It's fine, the clerk said with a wave of his hand, clearly unfazed. Actually, magic stones aren't as rare as you might think. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Really? Really? In fact, more than 80% of the floating and sinking islands have at least one magic stone. Most people just don't know how to find them, the clerk explained, clearly enjoying the conversation. Wait, are you serious? Ethan asked, feeling like he'd stumbled onto a valuable secret. It's true, the clerk said with a nod. It's not exactly a hidden fact, but the guild doesn't advertise it in the basic information we provide about the Sea of Calm. It's part of a kind of screening process. Screening process? Yeah. It's a way to identify potential adventurers with the skills or determination to succeed, the clerk said with a knowing smile. Ethan couldn't help but feel like he'd uncovered something important. So what happens after you find these potential adventurers? The clerk shrugged. What else? We encourage them to grow stronger and to set their sights on bigger goals. Eventually, the hope is that they'll be able to cross the Sea of Storms and search for the Endless Land. The mention of the Endless Land made Ethan pause. It was a name he'd already heard multiple times, a vast, boundless land said to lie beyond the ocean. Supposedly, it was a paradise where millions could live in peace and prosperity. But to Ethan, it sounded too good to be true. Are you sure it's not just a legend designed to lure people out to sea? Chapter 6. Whether the Endless Land was a fabricated legend or truly existed, Ethan still didn't have a clear answer. After completing his guild membership, Ethan was handed a small, unassuming pointer and directed to a resting area specifically prepared for adventurers. Though the room was modest, just a private bedroom and a small bathroom, it was a haven compared to life at sea. For adventurers who spent weeks floating in cramped, unstable boats, these basic comforts were a luxury. A clean bed, fresh water to drink, and food to eat. For the guild to provide this for free, they must be far more powerful than I thought, Ethan murmured to himself. His mind wandered back to the clerk who had handled his registration. The faint mental energy Ethan had sensed when the clerk used the magic stone made one thing clear, the seemingly friendly man was far from ordinary. What should I do next? Ethan muttered, pulling out the fire attribute magic stone Wood had given him. It was the only valuable resource he had left. The books and clothing gifted by the Ancient One had sentimental value, but they wouldn't fetch much if traded. This magic stone is all I have, Ethan thought. Without selling it, his only options were to rely on his water generation spell for fresh water and catch fish for food while hoping to stumble upon one of the fabled floating islands, or better yet, space-time energy. Relying on hope. I've already done that once, and it nearly got me killed. From the materials the guild had provided, Ethan had gained a better understanding of how survival worked in this world. Adventurers collected resources to trade for better tools, sturdier ships, and more provisions. Those improvements, in turn, allowed them to collect more resources, repeating the cycle and gradually increasing their chances of survival. It was a system of progression, and the guild maintained the balance by ensuring these rules were upheld. Exchanging this magic stone for food is the minimum I'll need to do, Ethan reasoned. I won't need to prepare water thanks to my spell, but it's better not to draw attention. I should still carry water with me. With a plan in mind, Ethan began working out the details. If possible, I should replace my boat. The one I have now is too small. Its storage capacity is terrible, and its stability is worse. A slightly larger wave could tip it over, and even if I survive, I'd lose all my supplies. The problem was that he had no idea how much ships cost in this world. If a new ship was out of his reach, he'd have to make do and limit how far he ventured out to sea. Ethan glanced at the pointer he had been given. While it looked unimpressive, the guild-issued pointer had a vital function. It could locate the nearest floating islands within a certain range, making it easier for adventurers to find their targets. Additionally, the pointer had a dial that could guide users back to State Island, ensuring they could always find their way home no matter how far they strayed. Putting the pointer away, Ethan resumed his daily mental exercises. Although the progress was barely noticeable, he refused to give up. It was the only path he knew to grow stronger, and he needed every edge he could get in this unpredictable world. This place might look peaceful, but it's far from safe, Ethan muttered. He understood the harsh truth, danger lurked everywhere, and being kind didn't mean others would return the favor. Let's hope I'm just being paranoid. The next morning, feeling rested and ready, Ethan made his way to the guild hall to trade the fire attribute magic stone. He avoided the bustling market, reasoning that it was safer to conduct his business through the guild. While the guild would take a small cut, it was worth the peace of mind knowing he wouldn't be scammed or worse, targeted. To his surprise, the process went better than expected. Not only did the guild handle the transaction fairly, but the staff also informed him that the magic stone was a high-quality combat-grade stone. It was valuable enough to exchange for ample supplies and a considerable amount of wealth. With this, you could live comfortably on the island for a while, the guild clerk said. Ethan hesitated before asking, could I exchange it for a boat? Instead of ridicule, his question earned him a look of approval. The clerk's tone became more respectful, as though Ethan's willingness to reinvest in his survival made him stand out. It seemed the guild truly valued adventurers who aimed to grow stronger, rather than those who simply drifted through life. What size boat are you looking for? Ethan considered his options. He wasn't planning to recruit a crew, he couldn't risk exposing the secret of the space-time energy or the pointer's true purpose. That meant he'd need a boat small enough to manage alone. Something compact, but sturdy enough to handle rough waters, Ethan said. A 10-meter, double-deck sloop should fit your needs, the clerk replied, pulling out a notebook to check the inventory. Would you be open to an older boat? If so, we could include a full load of food and fresh water, plus some additional supplies. Ethan nodded quickly. That works. As long as the boat is in good condition, I don't mind if it's used. Honestly, it'll probably just be a temporary solution anyway. The clerk smiled. Don't worry. Any boat listed by the guild has been inspected and certified as seaworthy. Older boats with significant issues are dismantled and repurposed for materials. Hearing this, an idea struck Ethan. I have a boat of my own. Would you be willing to take it as part of the trade? Of course. Shall we include it in the transaction? Ethan agreed without hesitation. The deal had turned out far better than he'd hoped. Not only was he getting a more reliable boat, but he also managed to offload his old one in the process. The value of the magic stone exceeded his expectations. Still, something about the term combat magic stone nagged at him. It hinted at a world far more dangerous than he had initially imagined. The world really isn't as peaceful as it seems. Ethan thought grimly. After completing the inspection and transaction, Ethan was handed the keys to his new boat. It was a 10-meter-long sloop with 2 levels, a deck, and a lower cabin. While its length was similar to his previous boat, its height and draft made it far more stable in the water. The design was practical, a single mast and sail, a raised bow and stern, and 2 small cabins accessible via doors. It was sturdy and well suited for solo adventuring. In addition to his new boat and a full load of food and water, Ethan used the remainder of his funds to purchase some basic necessities. One of his more practical acquisitions was a low-quality fire attribute magic stone stove. With it, he wouldn't have to risk setting his boat on fire just to cook food during his journey. Once the transaction was complete and the guild staff had finished loading the supplies onto his newly painted boat, the Goddess of Dawn, Ethan wasted no time. He didn't return to the guild's accommodations, nor did he stay on the boat overnight. Instead, he immediately set sail, leaving State Island behind. While he had been at the port, he'd felt the unmistakable weight of malicious gazes following him more than once. Most came from strangers, but one came from someone familiar. Rodney. Ethan muttered to himself as the boat cut through the water. I didn't see Wood. Did they part ways? Or is Wood simply better at hiding his intentions? Ethan hated to assume the worst of people, but he couldn't afford to be careless. His current lack of strength left no room for error, and the safest course of action was to leave State Island immediately, disappearing before anyone could make a move. On the vast ocean, the likelihood of being found was far lower than it would be on land. Everything went according to plan. Those watching him hadn't anticipated he'd set out to sea so quickly. By the time some of them realized what was happening and attempted to organize a pursuit, Ethan was already far away. The few who managed to react in time lacked seaworthy boats to chase him. Most of them were likely part of the group despised by the guild, people scraping by with poorly maintained vessels. While Ethan's new boat wasn't top of the line, it was far sturdier than their rotting ships. When the shadow of State Island disappeared from view and the ocean stretched empty in all directions, Ethan finally relaxed and let out a long breath. For now. I'm safe, he murmured. Now, his next priority was to pick a direction and begin searching for floating or sinking islands. However, before making his decision, he instinctively summoned his space-time pointer to check if it had located a new target. The result made his heart leap. The orb, which had been stuck on searching, for days, now displayed a clear arrow. Even better, the arrow was pointing nearby, and there was only one arrow displayed this time. When I first set out, there were 3 arrows. If there's only one now, that must mean the space-time energy is close, Ethan whispered, a grin spreading across his face. His excitement grew, but his luck didn't stop there. Taking out the pointer for floating and sinking islands, he saw it start to spin before locking onto a fixed direction. So, constant spinning means no target, and a fixed point means it's found something. My luck just keeps getting better, Ethan said with a wry smile. As he compared the 2 pointers, he noticed something surprising. their directions were almost identical. Well, that makes things easy. I'll head that way and see which one I find first. Although he spoke casually, Ethan's true priority was clear. Space-time energy was far more important to him. Being able to travel between planes was a source of immense opportunity and perhaps even survival. Over the next several days, Ethan adjusted his course repeatedly, always following the space-time pointer. The possibilities are endless, he mused to himself. Even if I can't stay in a new world for long, there are boundless ways to improve my life in this one. Immortality, becoming a higher-level being, it might not even be impossible. He knew that finding the endless land was a distant, uncertain goal, but the allure of immortality was something much closer, much more tangible. But those thoughts came to an abrupt halt when he finally found the space-time energy. After activating the teleportation circle, Ethan barely had time to process his arrival before he was surrounded. A group of women in leather armor appeared out of nowhere, their bows drawn and arrows aimed unerringly at his vital points. The grandeur of his dreams vanished instantly, replaced by the stark reality of his predicament. Chapter 7. The tall, long-legged archers, with arrows glinting dangerously in the dim light, made it clear just how precarious Ethan's situation was. Hello. I mean no harm, Ethan said, raising his voice slightly to sound more confident. He was met with stony silence. None of the archers reacted in the slightest. Language barrier. The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Out of all the frustrating scenarios he had imagined when traveling between planes, this was one of the worst. With no other option, he raised his hand slowly, showing that he was unarmed and no threat. A towering woman, taller even than the already formidable archers, stepped forward and barked something at him in a serious tone. Too bad Ethan couldn't understand a single word. This is oppressive, Ethan muttered under his breath, sweat forming on his brow. In that moment, he couldn't help but miss the Ancient One. Despite her often enigmatic demeanor, she had at least been able to use spiritual links for initial communication, even transmitting basic linguistic knowledge so he could grasp new languages quickly. While mastery was out of reach, it had been enough for everyday conversation. In fact, among the introductory spells the Ancient One had left him were instructions for creating a spiritual communication link with civilizations that spoke foreign languages. Ethan had studied the spell extensively, but his spiritual energy was still too weak to cast it. It didn't require magic, but the sheer concentration of mental power it demanded was beyond him. As Ethan debated his next move, the archers parted, forming a narrow pathway. Through it stepped a woman unlike the others. She was plump yet solidly built, her wide frame lending her an imposing presence that didn't seem bulky or awkward. She wore a brown floor-length dress beneath a purple tunic, along with a lilac cape that covered her shoulders and trailed down her back. Around her neck hung a simple necklace that exuded faint, strange waves of energy. The aura it gave off caught Ethan's attention immediately. You are. Ethan began instinctively, but he stopped himself mid-sentence. He remembered that communication was still impossible, so instead, he awkwardly waved his hand to show he meant no harm. To his surprise, a familiar sensation washed over him. The woman initiated a spiritual link. Like the Ancient One, she could communicate mentally. Greetings, young man, she said, her voice calm and composed. I am Akara, a priestess of the Sisterhood of the Sightless Eye. I do not know where you come from, but you've activated a teleportation circle long thought dormant. Regardless, you are welcome here in our camp. Thank you, Priestess Akara, Ethan replied through the link. My name is Ethan. I'm just passing through. As for the teleportation circle, that may have been a misunderstanding. Akara's name immediately rang a bell. The sight of her, the tall archers, and the camp they stood in confirmed Ethan's suspicions. He had landed in the world of Diablo 2. More specifically, this was the rogue encampment from the first act of the game, a temporary stronghold established by the remaining Sisterhood of the Sightless Eye and their rogue warriors. Ethan felt a mix of nostalgia and apprehension. Back in the day, Diablo 2 had been immensely popular. Though Ethan hadn't been deeply invested in it, he'd played through it several times at the urging of his friends. Years later, much of the game's details had faded from his memory, but the opening sequence and its key characters remained vivid. Akara, in particular, had stood out. In the game, she was the priestess who restored the player's health and mana. But in this far grimmer and more realistic version of the Diablo world, Ethan couldn't be sure what role she would play. Was she still a kind healer? Or was she a hardened priestess, as dangerous as her world demanded? Maintaining a cautious demeanor, Ethan kept the conversation simple. Akara spoke briefly to the tall, battle-hardened woman beside her Kasia. After exchanging a few words, Kasia motioned for the archers to lower their weapons. One by one, they dispersed, leaving only Akara and Kasia standing with Ethan. I must apologize for the earlier hostility, Akara said. The forces of darkness grow stronger each day, and we've lost all our teleportation outposts. When we saw the circle activate, we feared it might be a demonic invasion. No need to apologize, Ethan replied, keeping his tone calm. While he hadn't memorized the lore of Diablo 2, he knew enough to understand the precariousness of their situation. In a world teeming with dark creatures that could attack at any time, their caution was entirely justified. So, young man, Akara continued, where do you come from? Where are you headed? And why did you activate the teleportation circle leading to our camp? Kasia, though reassured that Ethan bore no demonic presence, still regarded him with a cautious, assessing gaze. Her sharp eyes didn't miss a single detail as Akara translated her question. Ethan hesitated. I come from a distant place. There was an accident when I used magic to teleport. Arriving in your camp was purely a coincidence. Magic teleportation. Kashi repeated, narrowing her eyes slightly as she turned to Akira. So, he's a mage. Akira frowned slightly. She couldn't sense any magical energy from Ethan, but his ability to create a spiritual link suggested he had at least some training in mental energy manipulation. I wouldn't call myself a mage, Ethan said quickly. I've only learned some of the basics. I haven't even gotten started yet. Akira nodded, her expression softening. That matches what I've observed, she said to Kasia. He's likely just a novice who's recently begun exploring mystical practices. Kasia's sharp gaze lingered on Ethan. To her, he seemed like little more than a greenhorn, barely an apprentice, let alone a full-fledged mage. But that raised another question. If you're just a novice, Kasia asked, how did you manage to perform high-level magic like teleportation? Ethan had anticipated this question and already prepared his answer. A scroll, he said quickly. I used a teleportation scroll. But it seems like something went wrong with it. As the discussion continued, Akira, who had been quietly checking something on her end, nodded to Kasia and explained, all connected teleportation arrays remain sealed and inactive. This young man likely activated the one leading to our camp by pure coincidence while using his teleportation scroll. It must have triggered the circle briefly, which brought him here. Kasia frowned, her expression still cautious. The magic energy behind this is unclear and unstable. That explanation does make sense, though. Having received the answer she wanted, Kasia finally eased her guard against Ethan and even arranged for a separate tent where he could rest. Surprisingly, no one assigned to watch him, and he was even provided with food and hot water. Ethan guessed this was because the enemies in this world were primarily demonic creatures and beings corrupted by dark forces. His complete lack of dark energy or any ominous aura clearly marked him as a pure human being, and as such, he was automatically viewed as being on their side. With only a few lingering doubts resolved, he wasn't treated as a threat. While chatting with Akira, Ethan began to piece together the reality of this world. Though it was based on the Diablo game he remembered, there were significant differences. For one, there was no such thing as a convenient storage space. A backpack was just that, a backpack. If he wanted to carry more, he'd have to strengthen his body to bear the weight. Potions did exist, but they weren't the miraculous instant heal elixirs of the game. Red potions could speed up wound recovery but often required internal and external application to be effective. As for blue potions, Ethan hadn't seen any yet and wasn't sure if they even existed in this more grounded version of the world. Additionally, there were no predefined classes. The paladin, sorceress, or barbarian roles from the game were, in this world, specific sects or organizations one had to join. Even joining was no guarantee, rigorous testing and harsh training were required to earn the right to be called a paladin or mage. It's impossible, Ethan thought grimly. He knew his time in this world was limited to a single month. There was no way he could join a faction, undergo rigorous tests, and receive formal training within that time frame. Even if he were the so-called chosen one, there simply wasn't enough time. Just traveling to the different sects from the rogue camp would take longer than a month. Time is short, he muttered. What can I realistically gain in this world? Sure, he could gather some food and water to take back, but the rogue camp itself was clearly struggling with limited resources. Most of its residents lived in tents, taking turns to share the limited space. Stockpiling large amounts of food and water without something valuable to trade for it or using this world's currency was unrealistic. More importantly, returning home with only basic supplies would be a massive waste of his 1 month stay and the precious space-time energy he had spent to get here. I need to focus on gaining something that'll actually help me, Ethan decided. Even if I can't take down Andriel, I need to at least leave here with some level of self-defense. Enough to handle ordinary enemies. He couldn't forget that the world he'd left behind was filled with its own dangers. So, learning combat skills has to be my top priority, he continued. I might not be able to improve my physical strength significantly in a month, but I can at least master the basics and keep training after I leave. Then there's the matter of tools. Any external force that can boost my strength in the short term will be crucial. Ethan's thoughts shifted to the weapons of this world. Though the Diablo universe was set in a medieval-like period, its weapons weren't crude or primitive. In a world infused with mystical energy, even a discarded staff might conceal immense power. Maybe I can commission some custom-made weapons from a blacksmith, Ethan thought. At first, his mind wandered to the idea of crafting a gun. It seemed like an ideal solution, simple, effective, and powerful. But reality quickly set in. He didn't know enough about guns to explain their structure, let alone oversee their construction. And even if a blacksmith could forge the barrel, where would he find the materials for bullets or the chemicals for gunpowder? Yet, not happening, Ethan muttered with a sigh. That left cold weapons, swords, daggers, spears, or axes. Ideally, he needed something imbued with magical properties to make up for his lack of physical strength. So, cold weapons with magical enhancements are my best option, he concluded. Now the question is, how do I get my hands on one? Chapter 8. Money? Ethan didn't have any. In fact, he didn't even own much of anything. Everything he possessed was on him, a set of clothes, the spiritual training book, the island pointer from State Island, and a small supply of dry food and water. There's no way I could steal anything. I don't have the strength or the skills to pull that off, Ethan muttered to himself. After thinking it over, he decided the safest option was to work at the rogue encampment. Selling his labor in exchange for rewards was straightforward, wouldn't raise suspicions, and would help him gather the resources he needed. The next morning, after a solid night's rest, Ethan went to find Akira. She was the only person in the camp he could communicate with, so he needed her help to convey his intentions to others. Akira's tent was easy to locate. As one of the few remaining senior priestesses of the sisterhood, her status in the camp was unmatched. The northeastern corner of the camp was reserved for the nuns, and among the cluster of tents, Akira's was the largest and most prominent. In addition to her high status, Akira was invaluable for her exceptional healing skills and potion-making abilities, which were critical to maintaining the rogue warrior's combat effectiveness. Whether through her knowledge or her authority, she was a cornerstone of the camp. When Ethan arrived, Akira was outside her tent, staring thoughtfully at a patch of plants. She appeared to be deep in contemplation, and only when Ethan approached, blocking what little light there was, did she finally turn to face him. "Young apprentice mage," she said, her tone kind but curious. "Do you need help with something?" "Yes, Priestess Akira," Ethan replied, carefully forming his thoughts before projecting them through their mental link. "I need your help. As you can see, I'm penniless. I don't have anything to trade for travel expenses. I was hoping to do some work in exchange for rewards, enough to buy some protective weapons and enough food to last me for a while." Akira nodded, understanding his predicament. "So you need me to translate your intentions to others?" "Exactly," Ethan confirmed. Since he couldn't speak directly with the people in the camp, Akira's help was essential. Thankfully, she didn't seem to mind the request. "Wait here," she said. "I'll write a few notes for you and teach you some basic vocabulary. That should be enough to get you by." True to her word, Akira wasted no time. She quickly jotted down several notes with simple messages, such as "need help," "I can work," and "I need to earn money to go home." She then instructed Ethan to copy the words, ensuring he could recognize and differentiate them. At the same time, she taught him a handful of basic words and phrases, like hello, using gestures and repetition. For nearly 3 hours, they worked outside her tent, and by the end of it, Ethan had surprised even himself with how much he'd learned. "I never learned this fast in my past life," Ethan marveled, running through the new vocabulary in his mind. Not only had he picked up the words quickly, but his memory was unusually sharp. Despite learning more than a dozen words in one sitting, he felt no confusion or mental fatigue. "It seems the Ancient One was right," Ethan muttered to himself. "As my mental strength improves, learning new languages becomes much easier." The enhancement of his memory was a direct benefit of his growing mental power. While it didn't make him inherently smarter, it allowed him to process and retain large amounts of information with ease. In the world of mages, this wasn't just a bonus, it was an essential skill for advanced mages. Akira, observing Ethan closely, noted his rapid progress. Though he had yet to formally begin his journey as a mage, his mental control and memory retention were already at the level of an apprentice. However, this observation gave Akira pause. She began to consider whether the tasks Ethan was currently seeking were truly suitable for someone of his abilities. Her decision came quickly. The rogues who guarded this camp were already stretched to their limits. Between their regular patrols to fend off the growing number of dark creatures, their efforts to maintain the camp's defenses, and their need to collect resources, they had no extra capacity for additional tasks. "If you truly wish to help, there is one thing that we could use assistance with right now." Ethan's thoughts immediately jumped to the game he had played before. Akira had been the one to give the first quest in Act 1. Was this the same? A dangerous combat mission involving killing an unknown number of dark creatures? Is she seriously going to send me out to clear the den of evil? I can't possibly handle something like that. Ethan wondered, already considering how to politely refuse. But Akira's next words dispelled his concerns. She had clearly assessed him well. Thin, untrained, and without armor or weapons, let alone any practical experience as a mage. Ethan wasn't ready for any large-scale combat. What she wanted, however, was far simpler: herb gathering. "The darkness is encroaching ever closer," Akira explained. "The pressure on the rogues is increasing by the day. They are now forced to stay near the camp for defensive purposes and have no manpower left to gather materials. The herbs we use for potions are running low, and I need fresh supplies to make more." Akira herself couldn't leave the camp, and neither could the lower-ranked nuns, who were under strict protection. These tasks, therefore, fell to others. "Gathering herbs," Ethan repeated, the task sounding simple enough. "That doesn't sound too hard. I can do that." Akira seemed relieved to see his willingness and provided a detailed explanation of the herbs she needed, including their shapes, characteristics, and even a few illustrations to make identification easier. "But be cautious," she warned. "According to the patrolling rogues, the number of dark creatures near the camp is steadily increasing. Even some of the local wildlife has begun to fall prey to the corruption of dark forces. It's no longer entirely safe, even close to the camp." Ethan nodded, already planning to stay close to the camp's perimeter. He wasn't foolish enough to venture too far, knowing he'd have no way to escape if something went wrong. "I'll write a note for you," Akira added, "to take to Kasia. She will prepare some basic self-defense weapons for you." "Thank you," Ethan said, accepting the note. He left Akira's tent and headed toward Kasia, the formidable leader of the rogues. She stood in the center of the camp, her tall and commanding figure unmistakable. Handing the note over, Ethan watched as Kasia quickly recognized Akira's handwriting. "So, you're helping Akira gather herbs?" she asked. Ethan couldn't understand her words, but he nodded and handed over another note Akira had prepared for him earlier. The note contained a phrase in the local language, which Ethan understood to mean, I need to earn what I need to get home. Kasia read it, then glanced at Ethan with a mixture of scrutiny and amusement. She didn't bother repeating the dangers of venturing outside the camp. Akira's request was clear enough. Turning to one of the rogues nearby, she gave a series of instructions, all the while muttering something under her breath. Ethan couldn't understand a word, but Kasia's tone made him feel as if she were criticizing him. If he had understood, he would have been quite annoyed. Too thin. Clearly lacking in strength. With such a weak physique, even light leather armor would slow him down. Just prepare a small weapon and forget the protective gear. He could use some training, any one of my rogues could take down 10 of him. Despite the uneasy feeling of being judged, Ethan kept a polite demeanor. When Kasia handed him a short dagger and a small shield, he thanked her. I wish you a safe return, young man, Kasia said, her tone softening slightly. Ethan understood this phrase, as Akira had taught it to him specifically for such moments. Thank you, he replied. He sheathed the short dagger at his side, strapped the small shield to his arm, and began his journey outside the camp. His steps were steady, but his heart raced. Am I scared? Of course I'm scared, Ethan admitted to himself. Though he had been given a second chance at life, he had never experienced anything like this, facing actual monsters corrupted by dark forces. But I have to face this sooner or later. There's no running away from it, he told himself firmly. Taking a deep breath, Ethan pressed forward. As he stepped past the camp's gates, the rogues called out, I wish you a safe return. The area surrounding the camp was known as the Blood Moor. Despite the ominous name, it was still populated with plants and animals. However, their unnatural colors hinted at the world's growing corruption under the influence of dark forces. Ethan didn't know the full extent of the corruption. Even the herbs Akira needed were tainted by dark energy, forcing her to purify them with magic before they could be used to make potions. This purification process weakened the potion's effects, which was one of the reasons supplies were running low. As long as I don't go too far, I shouldn't run into any monsters, right? This logic seemed sound. The rogues patrolled daily to keep the area around the camp clear, ensuring that it remained relatively safe. Unfortunately, Lady Luck was not on Ethan's side. He had barely walked far enough for the camp to disappear from sight when he spotted the first herb on his list. But next to it, 2 zombies in tattered clothing shuffled aimlessly. Their movements were stiff and sluggish. Zombies. Just 2 of them. No other monsters around. Ethan's grip tightened around the hilt of his short dagger. While zombies were slow and clumsy, they were still dangerous if underestimated. However, this situation was manageable. With only 2 of them, he could use his agility to stay out of their reach. If he took one out quickly, he'd only have to deal with the second one in a one-on-one fight. After carefully surveying the area and confirming there were no other threats, Ethan made his decision. Drawing his short dagger, he charged forward. He moved as quickly as he could, building momentum with every step. When he reached the first zombie, he leapt into the air, using the weight of his small shield to smash into the zombie's head. Take this. The impact knocked the zombie off balance, sending it toppling to the ground. Without hesitating, Ethan brought his short sword down in a sharp, decisive strike aimed at its head. Ethan's mind flashed back to the countless novels and movies he had consumed in his previous life. He had seen too many experienced characters get killed because they hesitated or underestimated zombies. Those lessons were burned into his mind. Quick. Hard. Precise. In one fluid motion, Ethan landed the killing blow. And just like that, he claimed the first kill of his life. Chapter 9. After his first successful kill, Ethan didn't allow himself to feel overly triumphant. His mind was clear, there was still danger. The second zombie stood nearby, its stiff movements betraying its intention to make him its next meal. Pulling his dagger free with a sharp tug, Ethan slashed again for good measure, severing the first zombie's head entirely. The rotting body made the task easier, its brittle bones offering little resistance. With the first threat neutralized, Ethan turned his attention to the remaining zombie. No head-on fighting, he muttered to himself. Zombies might be slow and clumsy, but their strength was nothing to scoff at. Ethan's body, though healthier than in his previous life, was nowhere near strong enough to match a zombie's raw power in direct combat. Speed and agility, that's my edge. I need to attack from behind or the side. Anything but a frontal assault. With his strategy settled, Ethan adjusted his grip on the dagger, his muscles tensing in anticipation. He charged forward, but just before reaching the zombie, he pivoted sharply, darting to its side. As he moved, he feigned a forward strike, baiting the zombie into reacting. Despite its sluggish appearance, the zombie's reflexes weren't slow. Its clawed hands swung to the side with surprising speed, the force of the blow strong enough to create a faint whooshing sound as it cut through the air. If it had landed, Ethan had no doubt he would have been incapacitated immediately. But Ethan was ready. His initial charge was a feint, designed to gauge the zombie's reaction. The moment it swung its arm, Ethan stopped his forward momentum, sidestepped, and darted to a spot just outside its reach. Now positioned at its side, he raised the small shield in his left hand and struck hard at the zombie's neck. The shield slammed into its target with a dull crunch. Ethan had noticed earlier that the neck was a weak point, and he was right. While the strike didn't fully decapitate the zombie, it severely damaged its neck, leaving it twisted at an unnatural angle. The injury disrupted the zombie's movements, making it even more sluggish than before. Now's my chance. Ethan didn't hesitate. He followed up with a precise thrust of his dagger, driving it into the zombie's head. The rotting flesh and fragile bone offered little resistance as the blade pierced its skull. Just to be certain, Ethan struck again with his shield, smashing the zombie's head into an unrecognizable mess before stepping back to assess the situation. Breathing heavily, he glanced around, scanning the area for any additional threats. Only after confirming that both zombies were fully incapacitated did he allow himself to relax. 2 zombies down, and not a single scratch. I'll call that a perfect first battle. Ethan gave himself a mental pat on the back, a small way of releasing the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But he didn't stop there. He carefully replayed the fight in his mind, analyzing every movement and decision to refine his technique. When I was fully focused, it felt like I could see everything more clearly. Ethan wasn't sure, but he suspected this heightened awareness might be a side effect of his improved spiritual power. If that was the case, then even with his limited physical strength, he had a decent chance of holding his own so long as he remained calm and focused. I'll need to test this theory in future fights, he decided. With that thought, he sheathed his dagger, knelt down, and examined the 2 corpses. Do zombies drop loot? He wondered, half-jokingly. Of course, this wasn't a game. The zombies' tattered clothing and decaying bodies yielded no treasure or equipment, much to Ethan's disappointment. If only it were that easy, he muttered. If they actually dropped equipment, I could just hunt lone zombies and gear up in no time. Shaking his head, he pushed the fantasy aside and focused on his primary objective, herb gathering. Ethan quickly collected the herbs near the zombie corpses, then moved on. To stay safe, he carefully managed his distance from the rogue camp. Whenever he ventured far enough to lose sight of it, he would backtrack slightly, ensuring he never strayed too far. He moved in a sweeping arc with the camp at its center, gradually expanding his search radius. His approach was methodical. He searched for herbs, harvested them, and killed any lone zombies he encountered along the way. Over the course of half a day, he managed to collect several herbs and dispatched more than a dozen zombies. Thankfully, he didn't run into any of the quill rats or fallen he dreaded. Quill rats, in particular, were a nightmare for someone like Ethan. These creatures blended seamlessly into the grass and shadows, making them nearly impossible to spot before they attacked. Worse still, they were capable of launching surprise attacks from a distance, and Ethan's current skills and equipment were no match for such threats. The fallen were nothing to scoff at. They always operated in groups and were typically led by a fallen shaman capable of casting fireballs and resurrecting their fallen comrades. This made them doubly dangerous both alive and dead. Their tendency to dart around erratically only made them harder to deal with, as they avoided direct confrontations and relied on speed and numbers to overwhelm their opponents. Even trying to escape was risky. Fallen were incredibly fast, and anyone attempting to run would often be chased down and surrounded. With Ethan's current strength, encountering even a small group of 5 fallens would undoubtedly result in his demise. So, when he ventured slightly farther than usual and spotted a group of red-skinned fallens dancing and shouting around a bonfire in the distance, his decision was immediate. He turned and began retreating. I really am, unbelievably weak, Ethan muttered to himself, shaking his head. In the game, even a level 1 character could take out fallens without much difficulty. But here, in this world, he didn't even have the qualifications to face them. The realization was both humbling and frustrating. If Akara had asked me to clean out the den of evil, I'd have no choice but to back out like a coward. Moving cautiously, Ethan kept his movements controlled to avoid attracting the fallen's attention. At the same time, he observed the small camp they had set up. When I get back, I'll have to tell Kasia. She should send the rogues to deal with these fallen. They're too close to the camp. If they're allowed to grow stronger, it could lead to serious trouble. As he was thinking this, Ethan noticed something strange. In the distance, a figure appeared. Before he could wonder if his eyes were playing tricks on him, the figure moved. One moment it was far away, and the next, a flash of light lit up the darkened sky. Suddenly, the figure was standing right outside the fallen camp. The figure, a woman, Ethan realized, raised a long staff. She waved it, and a massive fireball shot out, streaking toward the fallens. The fireball exploded in their midst with a deafening roar, engulfing the entire group in a blaze of flames. The brightness of the explosion lit up the night, and when the flames finally subsided, there was nothing left of the fallens. The only one remaining in the camp was the woman, who now turned her gaze directly toward Ethan. Ethan stiffened. Before he could even process what had just happened, another flash of light erupted, and the woman who had been standing far away was suddenly right in front of him. Hello, the woman said. Ethan understood that. My name is Isandra, she added. He understood that too. I'm a mage from the east. Is there a town nearby where I can find food and shelter? That, he didn't understand. Ethan's response was simple. Hi, my name is Ethan. There was an awkward pause. Isandra's expression shifted into a confused frown. Why wasn't this young man answering her question? Was he being cautious? Wary of her intentions? Or did he simply not understand her? I don't mean any harm, she said, her voice calm. I just need a place to rest and buy some food. Ethan still couldn't fully understand her, but he caught the word food and guessed the general meaning. In response, he pointed in the direction of the rogue camp. Isandra tilted her head, studying him. Was he showing her the way? Ethan's decision to direct Isandra to the camp wasn't made lightly. He had recognized her almost immediately, despite her not introducing herself beyond her name. Isandra was one of the original 5 character classes from Diablo 2, a mage who wielded the elemental powers of fire, ice, and lightning. While Ethan didn't know her backstory or real name, her appearance was unmistakable. Her slightly dark skin, green leather-like armor that left much of her midriff exposed, a short black skirt, brown leather boots, and golden accessories, all of it matched perfectly with her in-game depiction. The staff she carried, while outwardly simple, radiated powerful magical energy that Ethan could feel even at a distance. For a fleeting moment, he felt an irrational urge to take the staff for himself. The thought was so sudden and intrusive that it startled him. Recognizing this as a dangerous sign, Ethan immediately began practicing the meditation techniques the Ancient One had taught him, calming his restless thoughts. Isandra noticed this. "Oh," she said, a hint of surprise in her tone. "A mage apprentice, are you? Weak, but you've got a solid will." Her gaze shifted to the herbs strapped to Ethan's back. "Collecting herbs, I see. Your teacher must specialize in potion making. Take me to meet them. I have questions about the dense dark energy in this area." Chapter 10. Ethan couldn't fully understand Isandra's words, but as the day wore on, the sky grew darker, and his vision began to blur. It was time to head back to the camp. Despite their inability to communicate properly, Ethan gestured for Isandra to follow him and led her toward rogue camp. The wooden fences and the rogues patrolling at key points around the perimeter made it clear to Isandra that this wasn't the town she had been hoping to find. However, from her interactions with Ethan so far, she realized that their lack of shared language would only complicate things further. Choosing to hold back her questions for the time being, she quietly followed him inside. "Nice to see you back safely," one of the rogues on guard greeted Ethan warmly. Then, her gaze shifted to Isandra, and her expression became more cautious. "Who are you, and what's your purpose here?" "I'm a mage from the east," Isandra replied calmly. "I've been traveling for some time and noticed the growing dark energy in this area. I came here to investigate." "Welcome, Master Mage," the rogue said respectfully. "You're most welcome here in Rogue Camp. I believe Captain Kasia would be the one to answer your questions." With a nod to her fellow guards, the rogue escorted Isandra further into the camp to meet Kasia. Ethan, meanwhile, had no interest in the conversation that would follow. Even if he did, he wouldn't have understood much of it. Instead, he headed straight for Akara's tent, carrying the herbs he had gathered. His priority now was to exchange them for supplies and see if he could learn anything about potion making from Akara. He hadn't initially planned on learning such a skill, but during his herb gathering and battles with zombies, Ethan had realized something crucial: in a world like his own, full of endless oceans, he couldn't guarantee he'd never get sick or injured. With no companions to rely on, having a few survival tricks up his sleeve like potion making was a necessity. After carefully counting the herbs Ethan had collected, Akara handed him the prepared food, water, and a few gold coins as his reward. When Ethan brought up his interest in learning how to make magic potions, Akara looked thoughtful but ultimately nodded. "The corruption of dark power is worsening," Akara explained, her tone weary. "These herbs are becoming increasingly tainted with dark energy. Before I can use them, I have to purify that energy, which drains a great deal of my own strength." Akara sighed, her expression heavy. "The nuns of the Sisterhood of the Sightless Eye are stretched thin. They don't have the capacity to help with these smaller tasks. If you're willing to assist me with them, I can teach you the basics of magic potion making." Then, after a pause, she added, "But as for healing spells, I don't think that's something you can learn." Ethan asked why, and Akara explained that the healing magic used by the Sisterhood was deeply rooted in faith. Unlike the spells used by most mages, which drew from personal skill and mastery of energy, the healing techniques of the Sisterhood relied on divine blessings and borrowed power. "I see," Ethan said, nodding in understanding. He wasn't disappointed. Potion making alone was valuable enough. Besides, he hadn't expected to learn everything. But there was one catch. Before Akara could teach him potion making, Ethan had to memorize an entire tome on the basics of herbal medicine. "You need to learn how to identify and differentiate herbs," Akara explained. "Every herb has unique properties, and you'll need to understand them fully before you can begin crafting potions." With the introductory book in hand, Ethan left Akara's tent, feeling slightly dejected. "What's the point of this book?" he muttered to himself as he returned to his tent. "How useful can this knowledge really be to me? Are these herbs even going to exist outside of this world?" His frustration lingered as he opened the book. But as he began to read, Ethan realized he had been completely wrong in his assumptions. The book wasn't a simple manual filled with descriptions of fixed herb shapes, colors, and medicinal properties. Instead, it was an introduction to using mental power to analyze the energy characteristics within herbs. Rather than classifying herbs by their physical traits, the book taught how to identify and categorize them based on the energy they contained, how it behaved, what effects it could produce, and what kinds of potions it was suitable for. "Wow!" Ethan muttered, flipping through the pages. This method of identification wasn't limited to the plants in this world. By focusing on the energy properties of herbs rather than their appearances, the knowledge in this book could potentially be applied to other worlds and planes of existence as well. For instance, any herb that could stop bleeding or accelerate wound recovery was categorized as suitable for making red potions. Even two herbs that looked entirely different might belong to the same category because they shared the same essence and could be used to create identical potions. So that's how it works. This book wasn't just an introductory guide to herbal medicine, it was a specialized manual tailored for mages. It emphasized extracting the essential qualities of plants, amplifying their effects, and prolonging their duration. In essence, it taught the true fundamentals of potion making. This realization reassured Ethan that the book wouldn't become useless if he ever left this world. In fact, the knowledge it offered about crafting magical potions turned out to be far more significant than he initially thought. Understanding the book's value sparked a newfound enthusiasm in Ethan. He spent the entire night poring over its pages, absorbing its contents. He only paused when a nun from Akara came to summon him in the morning, reminding him of the passing time. I don't even feel tired. Aside from a bit of stiffness from sitting for so long, Ethan felt as energetic as ever, a stark contrast to his previous life. Back then, even at peak health, working through the night would have left him utterly drained. Is this because of my improved mental power? Mental power came from two sources, the body and the soul. Both needed to be strong for someone to reach their full potential. Ethan's physical condition, though not remarkable, was above average and steadily improving due to his youthful, developing body. His mental strength, on the other hand, had always been unremarkable. However, his years of training with the space-time pointer had laid a solid foundation for controlling it. The unexpected side effects of his possession had also given him an advantage. The remnants of the original owner's mental energy had been absorbed by his soul, enhancing his own. Had he not begun practicing mental exercises, this energy would have dissipated over time. But by training consistently, he managed to harness it, triggering a period of rapid improvement. As his mental strength grew, it stimulated subtle changes in his physical body. While the effect was small, merely making his cells more active, it had slightly boosted his recovery and growth. For Ethan, who was already in a stage of rapid physical development, this enhancement became more pronounced. Maybe mages aren't as frail as I thought. The realization struck Ethan as logical. After all, mages in various universes weren't weaklings. In the Marvel world, for example, they were capable of wielding mystical energy while engaging in melee combat. Gandalf from the Lord of the Rings carried a staff and a sword, epitomizing the image of a battle-hardened mage. Even Merlin from Arthurian legends reportedly preferred swordplay over magic in certain situations. Yet in most of the games and stories Ethan had encountered, mages were portrayed as fragile, frail beings. It seemed ridiculous now. How could a mage endure long journeys through mountains and forests, engage in life-or-death battles, and still be considered physically weak? Even the idea of mages toiling in their laboratories for days or weeks on end seemed implausible without a robust constitution. If they were truly fragile, wouldn't they have succumbed to exhaustion or sudden illness? So, being healthy is a prerequisite for becoming a good mage. Ethan mused, stretching his stiff body as he emerged from his tent. As he turned his head, he noticed Isandra, the female mage he'd guided to the camp the previous day. She was stepping out of her own tent, staff in hand. It seemed Kasha had already accepted her into the camp. Isandra spotted Ethan as well and approached with a polite smile. Good morning, Ethan. Thank you again for showing me the way yesterday. Instead of using words, she communicated with him through mental energy. Ethan appreciated her courtesy in seeking his permission before establishing the mental link. You're welcome, he replied. Even without me, you'd have found the camp soon enough. Curious, Isandra continued, where did you say you're from again? Mages in this world typically came from a few major factions, all of which shared a common language. The fact that Ethan couldn't communicate fluently had intrigued her. From the East, Ethan replied vaguely. My teacher isn't well known. The East. Isandra frowned in disbelief. Most mage groups were based in the East, and language barriers were unheard of among them. Sensing her skepticism, Ethan quickly added, it's much farther east than you're thinking. I got here by accident using a teleportation scroll, so I'm not entirely sure how far it is. Farther east. Isandra still seemed doubtful but chose not to press further. Anyway, I was about to look for Akara. Kasia mentioned she might need my assistance. Do you know where I can find her? Relieved by the change of subject, Ethan smiled. I'm headed to Akara as well. Let's go together. Chapter 11. Ethan and Isandra arrived at Akara's tent together. While Isandra sought Akara's help for her own reasons, Ethan was there to keep his earlier promise of assisting with potion making. The tasks Akara assigned him weren't difficult, but they were time-consuming and required a great deal of patience. Ethan's job was to process the herbs, cleaning, sorting, and preparing them into semi-finished products that Akara could later use to craft the finished potions. For Ethan, this was more than busy work. He took the opportunity to apply the knowledge he had absorbed from his late-night study session, gaining practical experience that helped solidify his understanding. He also carefully observed Akara as she completed the potion-making process, committing each step to memory. So, this is how magic potions are made, Akara explained as she pointed to the materials in front of her. She gestured first to the raw herbs, then to the finished product, a small transparent bottle filled with a glowing red liquid. First, you select the appropriate raw materials and perform basic preparation cleaning, removing useless parts, or, if necessary, using magic to purge unsuitable energies. Then comes drying, which can be done through natural methods or directly with magic. During this step, you must ensure that the useful properties of the herbs are preserved. For some herbs, like the healing grass you collected, this step can be skipped entirely. She then moved on to the critical part of the process. Next is extraction and refinement. You extract the essence of the herbs and mix in auxiliary materials to produce the desired potion. For this particular potion, water is the auxiliary material, it's convenient and effective for creating consumable medicines. While most of the initial steps were straightforward, Ethan quickly realized that the key to potion making lay in the final phase, extracting the specific properties you wanted and amplifying them into a usable form. But when Ethan pressed Akara for more details about this process, her explanation became vague, even cryptic. This part is about understanding, Akira said with a knowing smile. It's not something that can be taught in a straightforward way. You must perceive it for yourself. Only then will you truly understand how to do it. Ethan frowned. This is complicated. He struggled to find the right words to describe how nebulous this process felt. It seemed less like a set of instructions and more like a skill requiring intuition and creativity. This wasn't the kind of thing he could simply memorize and replicate. Magic really is a profession with a high entry barrier, Ethan muttered to himself. You need a strong body, a sharp mind, and now even a talent for abstract thinking. No wonder mages seem overpowered in some stories. If the requirements are this high, anyone who actually becomes a mage would naturally be exceptional. Ethan knew he had no choice but to practice. Fortunately, potion making didn't demand much in terms of magical power. While certain spells were involved, they could be performed using a magic circle powered by external forces. This magic circle became another point of interest for Ethan. If he could learn to modify the circle to draw magic power from the environment or other sources, it might solve many of his current limitations. He even began thinking about creating a simple, portable magic circle that could power small spells. For example, he envisioned a magic circle capable of casting a basic fireball, nothing too large or destructive, just a fist-sized flame to use in emergencies. Such a project, however, was easier imagined than achieved. Even for a simple fireball, Ethan would need a clear understanding of the spell's principles, the nature of the flame, the energy required, and the mechanics of its creation and control. Without this foundational knowledge, constructing the magic circle would be impossible. Still, the idea excited him. Fueled by this newfound motivation, Ethan threw himself into his studies with even greater enthusiasm. He listened intently to Akira's lessons and peppered her with questions, some of which were so unconventional that Akira herself was momentarily stumped. What an unusual way of thinking, Akira remarked with a faint smile. You must have quite the creative mind. Ethan wasn't sure if that was a compliment, but it encouraged him nonetheless. Fortunately, Akira had an ample supply of herbs, including lower quality ones she didn't mind wasting. She gave these to Ethan for practice, allowing him to refine his skills. Over the next several days, Ethan established a routine. In the mornings, he helped Akira process herbs and observed her potion-making techniques. In the afternoons, he practiced with the leftover materials, experimenting with both potion creation and magic circle usage. Akira continued to guide him, pointing out mistakes and offering advice. She also humored Ethan's experimental ideas regarding magic circles, many of which evolved as his understanding deepened. After a few days, some of Ethan's revised ideas even earned Akira's approval. If you can find a stable source of magic power, Akira said, then the magic circles you've described could work. However, you'll need to redesign the structure of the circles based on the specific spells you wish to cast. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. He hadn't yet decided on a specific spell, but he had been leaning toward the fireball spell. It didn't need to be particularly powerful, just a small flame would suffice for his current needs. But even this modest goal was a challenge. Without a clear understanding of the fireball spell's principles, Ethan couldn't move forward. He understood the basics of energy supply and had a grasp of how to address the source of magic power for his envisioned magic circle. However, the actual construction and casting of spells were completely beyond him. Akira, for all her wisdom, was a priestess, not a mage. Her expertise lay in healing magic and the divine arts, not elemental attack spells. If Ethan truly wanted to complete the magic circle he had in mind, he needed formal and systematic instruction in spell casting. Fortunately, a suitable mentor was already within reach, Isandra, a seasoned mage who specialized in the three elemental forces of fire, frost, and lightning. You want to learn magic from me? Isandra, who had been staying at the camp for some time, was quick to respond when Ethan approached her with his request. Her daily routine included investigating the increasing dark energy in the region while helping the rogues fend off nearby creatures. Thanks to her efforts, the camp had been under significantly less pressure, and her reputation among the rogues had grown considerably. Finding her wasn't difficult, the camp residents were always aware of the whereabouts of the mighty mage Isandra. Yes, Ethan explained, I want to learn the principles of basic spells and their applications. Specifically, I'm trying to design some equipment engraved with simple magic circles. Ethan went on to detail his idea, using magic circles triggered by mental power to cast preset spells. His goal was to create practical tools that would allow him to defend himself. Isandra listened carefully, though her expression gradually shifted to one of mild disapproval. Making such magical equipment isn't difficult, she said eventually, but honestly, it's not very worthwhile. Ethan's proposed equipment was rudimentary at best, basic materials inscribed with low-level magic circles. To someone of Isandra's caliber, the concept was laughably simplistic. Magic circles like these were common and unremarkable, often dismissed as crude and inefficient. Something this primitive can hardly be considered useful, she continued. Thinking along these lines isn't good for your growth as a mage. Instead of wasting time on these shortcuts, you should focus on improving your spiritual power. Once it's strong enough, you'll be able to cast these simple spells with your bare hands. Ethan sighed and shook his head. But I don't have any means of protecting myself right now. If I encounter dark creatures, I'll likely die before I ever get a chance to improve my spiritual power, let alone learn magic. Isandra paused, conceding the point. You're right. Survival is a priority. Fine, I'll teach you the principles of some basic spells. These fundamental principles weren't particularly secretive. Any mage in training would learn them sooner or later. Isandra initially intended to simply teach Ethan a few offensive and defensive spells. However, after some thought, she reached into her belongings and retrieved a book. This is a primer on basic magical principles, she said, handing it to him. The spells you need are recorded here. Study it carefully. Ethan's face lit up as he took the book, but Isandra added a warning. I must remind you, those simple spells are one thing. But if you plan to construct more advanced magic on basic materials, you'll fail. Ordinary materials won't hold up under the strain. Ethan nodded in agreement. Akira had already mentioned this to him. That's why I'm only aiming for weakened versions of entry-level magic, he explained. Even entry-level magic required materials with decent magical conductivity and durability to handle the energy flow. Such materials were rare and beyond Ethan's current reach. This meant his designs had to remain small-scale and low-power for now. With the book in hand, Ethan prepared to return to his tent and begin studying the principles of basic spells. He planned to identify a simple spell that could be adapted into a practical magic circle. But just as he turned to leave, Isandra stopped him. I've been exploring the area for a while, she began, and I've finally identified the place where the dark energy is strongest. It's an underground cave called the Den of Evil. After discussing it with Akira, we suspect it's a central hub where the dark creatures in this region are gathering. Ethan frowned. And? He couldn't imagine why Isandra was telling him this. Surely she wasn't asking him to join her in clearing out the Den of Evil, he had no combat ability to speak of. I need a favor, Isandra said, pulling out a sealed letter. Before coming here, I encountered a priest of Rathma. He's also investigating the surge in dark energy. I want you to deliver this letter to him and ask him to come here to help me clear out the dark creatures in the cave. Chapter 12. What is a priest of Rathma? As Ethan carried the letter Isandra had entrusted to him, this question occupied his thoughts. His understanding of this dark and dangerous world was surface level at best, and he had no idea what kind of organization Rathma was or what kind of person he was about to meet. Following Isandra's directions, Ethan headed north along a worn path that wound its way through the wilderness. It was called a road, but in truth, it was little more than a trail beaten into the dirt by frequent travelers. Even so, it provided a reliable sense of direction. In this underdeveloped world, if one got lost in the wild, the best way to regain their bearings was to find such a path. Following it long enough, in one direction or another, would eventually lead to a settlement. Another advantage of sticking to the road was the relative safety it offered. Creatures like the quill rats and the fallen, both of which Ethan dreaded, rarely appeared on the main paths. Instead, the occasional zombie, slow-moving and few in number, posed the greatest threat. Ethan was confident enough in his abilities to deal with those. According to Isandra, I should reach the priest after 3 days of travel along this road. But it's already been 2 days, and I've neither seen nor heard a thing, not the priest, not even another traveler. The oppressive environment was also wearing on him. The corruption of dark energy had grown noticeably stronger, even in the short time since Ethan had first arrived in this world. The sky remained perpetually overcast, robbing the days of warmth and light. The air itself seemed thick with an unsettling force that Ethan instinctively resisted. Over time, as his spiritual power developed, Ethan began to feel an inexplicable pull toward the dark energy around him, as if his body wanted to absorb it and convert it into magic power. While it's true that mages can use any energy as magic, Ethan muttered to himself, I'm sure channeling this kind of negative energy would come with a heavy cost. Images of mages seduced by power only to meet tragic ends flickered through his mind. He forced himself to remember their mistakes, taking a deep breath to steady his thoughts. Uncontrollable power doesn't belong to me, he whispered, as if reaffirming his resolve. Just as he prepared to continue forward, Ethan spotted movement in the distance. A group of skeleton soldiers, armed with long bone-bladed swords, was patrolling in a disciplined formation. Skeleton soldiers. The sight of them immediately put Ethan on high alert. These weren't mindless monsters wandering aimlessly, their movements were deliberate, almost strategic. This isn't normal. Peering farther into the distance, Ethan spotted more skeletons patrolling in formation. There's too many of them. If I try to push through, it's suicide. He quickly decided to retreat. Moving slowly and deliberately, he backed away, keeping his steps light and his eyes scanning for a place to hide. Unfortunately, the area around him was barren, offering little in the way of cover. Not even a dead tree or rocky outcrop could shield him. As he cursed his bad luck under his breath, the skeletons suddenly stopped their patrol. To his surprise, rather than charging at him, they began to congregate in one place. What happened next startled him even more. One of the skeletons at the front turned toward him and waved. Wait, is it waving at me? Ethan froze in place, his mind racing. Was this some kind of intelligent undead? Could he have stumbled upon a skeleton inhabited by another transmigrator like himself? Before Ethan could decide whether to flee or approach, his question was answered. A man dressed in black and white robes emerged from behind the skeletons. With a simple gesture from the man, the skeleton that had been waving at Ethan dissolved into nothingness, as did the rest of the undead. A necromancer, Ethan muttered, his eyes narrowing. The sight was unmistakable. As one of the original classes in Diablo 2, Ethan recognized the necromancer immediately. So those skeletons were his summons. It explained the strange, coordinated behavior of the undead, they were under the control of this necromancer. Despite his recognition, Ethan hesitated. In a game, necromancers were popular, even heroic figures. But in reality, a mage who dabbled in corpses and souls would hardly be considered trustworthy. Turning and running didn't seem like an option. The necromancer had already noticed him, and Ethan vaguely remembered the game lore portraying them as defenders of balance rather than harbingers of destruction. Deciding to take a chance, he approached cautiously, his hand still resting on the hilt of his dagger. "Greetings, young traveler," the necromancer called out, his voice calm and measured. "I am Sol, a priest of Rathma. I sense the presence of someone familiar on you. Did she send you to me?" Sol's words startled Ethan. Only then did he realize this was the priest he had been searching for. "That should be right," Ethan replied hesitantly, pulling the letter from his pouch. "Are you the Rathma priest Isandra mentioned?" Sol nodded, though he clarified, "I wouldn't call us friends. We've only met once, but we share a common goal." "She must have imprinted her mark on the letter, let me see it." Ethan handed over the letter but couldn't suppress his curiosity. "So, you're really a priest?" Noticing Ethan's doubt, Sol offered a small smile. It seemed he was accustomed to such misunderstandings. As he read Isandra's letter, he began explaining the nature of the Rathma priest. The Rathma priests, Ethan learned, were entirely unlike the necromancers he'd imagined. Their core belief was in maintaining balance in all things, between life and death, creation and destruction. They weren't aligned with either good or evil, instead pursuing absolute neutrality. Their magic, derived from the primal energies inherent in all things, wasn't inherently dark or evil. It was the same energy harnessed by other groups, such as the Amazons. However, because of their ability to manipulate undead creatures, the Rathma priests were often misunderstood and their practices unfairly labeled as black magic. "Our magic is neither black nor evil," Sol insisted, his voice firm. "This classification is born of ignorance and prejudice." Ethan listened attentively, though part of him couldn't help but find Sol's enthusiasm for his beliefs amusing. Eventually, Sol returned to the matter at hand. "The letter says Isandra has discovered significant clues at the rogue camp. The surge in dark power seems linked to a mysterious figure, and the blood wastes are crawling with dark creatures. Even Andriel has claimed the fortress, blocking the path to the east." Sol paused, rubbing his temples as if the information he'd just read gave him a headache. "One way or another, I need to head to the rogue encampment." He turned to Ethan, his expression more measured now. "Young man, Isandra mentioned that you are diligently working to become a mage." "Yes," Ethan replied, though inwardly, he wasn't entirely sure if he could actually succeed in becoming a mage. Still, everything he had been learning and gathering was pushing him in that direction. "Have you considered joining the Rathma priests?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. Sol's tone was casual, but there was an unmistakable enthusiasm in his voice, the kind that suggested he was already imagining Ethan among the ranks of the necromancers. After a brief pause, Sol launched into what Ethan could only describe as a recruiting pitch. The priest spoke about balance, discipline, and the noble path of seeking equilibrium in all things. But the more Ethan listened, the more he realized he wasn't interested. Learning that the necromancers of this world were more akin to Puritan ascetics than dark sorcerers had already dulled his curiosity about the profession. "No, I think it's better to stick to the path I've already chosen," Ethan said firmly. "Wavering between options won't get me anywhere." To his surprise, Sol nodded approvingly, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Well said, young apprentice. With that mindset, I believe the day you become a full-fledged mage isn't far off." Ethan felt a faint spark of encouragement, but it was quickly doused when Sol gave him a once-over, his gaze lingering on Ethan's thin frame. "However," Sol said thoughtfully, "in this dangerous environment, you'll need to improve your ability to protect yourself. Otherwise, you might not survive long enough to realize your potential as a mage. Since your mental power won't improve overnight, you should consider working on your combat skills in the meantime." Ethan nodded instinctively, but then the implications of Sol's words hit him. Combat skills? Did Sol think he was part of some team that would take on hordes of dark creatures? And why melee combat of all things? "Wait, are you suggesting I focus on close combat?" Ethan asked, his skepticism plain. Sol raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "And why not? Do you think I'm unqualified to teach you?" Before Ethan could respond, he felt a sudden blur of movement. In the blink of an eye, Sol, who had been standing 2 steps away, was now right in front of him. A cold dagger pressed lightly against Ethan's neck. As a priest of Rathma, Sol said evenly, his voice low and steady, "Close combat is a required skill." Chapter 13. On the way back to Camp Rogue, Ethan found himself torn between relief and discomfort. He was thrilled to have finally gained some basic combat training from Sol, the so-called Rathma priest, whose skills in close combat were unexpectedly sharp. But the discomfort? That came from Sol's teaching methods, which were blunt, brutal, and unrelenting. Beyond an initial explanation of basic movements and how to apply force effectively, Sol's training sessions primarily consisted of sparring or, more accurately, Ethan being thoroughly beaten down. "In your current state, you shouldn't focus on trying to defeat enemies," Sol had told him after yet another round of bruising lessons. "What you need to master first is survival. Learn how to endure attacks, protect yourself, and wait for the perfect moment to strike." Ethan couldn't argue with the logic. Improving physical strength and combat skills wasn't something that could be done overnight. For now, focusing on how to stay alive in the face of overwhelming danger made sense. By the time they reached Camp Rogue, Ethan was aching all over. The rogues stationed at the gates recognized him immediately and didn't raise any objections to the necromancer he brought along. When Sol explained that he had come at Isandra's request to investigate the surge in dark energy, the rogues even greeted him with respect and relief. "Interesting," Sol muttered, surveying the guards. The rogues, a branch of the mighty Amazons. Even warriors as formidable as these are now pinned down by the corruption spreading across this land. Ethan could see what he meant. Though the rogues tried to maintain an appearance of strength and confidence, it was clear that their situation was deteriorating. The ever-thickening dark energy weighed heavily on them, forcing them to hunker down in their camp. The boldness they once displayed when facing demons seemed to have dimmed into cautious desperation. It's clear that Andriel needs to be dealt with as soon as possible, Sol said, his tone grim. I don't know if killing her will completely purge the growing corruption, but it should at least give us some breathing room. With the pressure eased, these rogues might regain their morale and begin clearing the area of lesser dark creatures. True to his pragmatic nature, Sol immediately asked where Isandra was. Wasting no time, he was eager to meet up with her and organize their next move. Isandra, as it turned out, had been waiting for him at the camp. The two powerful mages quickly found one another and launched into a discussion about the strategy for combating the dark creatures. Sol, ever the direct action taker, proposed heading straight for Andriel to confront her in her lair. However, Isandra had a more cautious approach in mind. We can't ignore the dark creatures surrounding us, she argued. Especially the ones gathering in the den of evil. They might not be individually powerful, but their sheer numbers pose a significant threat. If we leave them unchecked, they could easily overrun this camp. She gestured around the camp. This is one of the last human strongholds in the region with any real combat capability. Even if we kill Andriel, we'll still need the rogues to mop up the remaining dark creatures in the area. Securing the den of evil is critical to ensuring the camp's survival. After a moment of thought, Sol nodded in agreement. You're right. Clearing the surrounding areas first will make our ultimate goal much more achievable. It won't take long with the three of us working together. 3. Isandra raised an eyebrow, confused. Her gaze shifted to Ethan, who had been standing silently nearby. Wait. You mean him? Sol looked genuinely puzzled. Isn't he part of the team? At this, Isandra couldn't help but chuckle. Not quite. Ethan has potential, but he's far from ready for this kind of battle. He hasn't even mastered the basics of magic yet. Putting him on the front lines would be a mistake. Ah, Sol said, a note of disappointment in his voice. I see. Then it's just the two of us for now. Don't worry, Isandra said reassuringly. The growing dark energy will draw the attention of other factions and groups. I'm sure reinforcements will arrive soon. We won't be fighting this battle alone for long. Ethan, standing off to the side, listened to their exchange in silence. Her words reminded him of the other heroes from the world of Diablo, the paladins, barbarians, amazons, druids, and assassins who would eventually join the fight. Together, they had stood against the forces of evil, confronting the demon lords Diablo and Baal in their ultimate battles. But Ethan knew he wouldn't be around to see those events unfold. He'd already calculated that his time in this world was running out. More than 20 days had passed since he first arrived, and the residual energy from the magic circle would soon send him back to his own strange ocean world. Still, he couldn't deny how much he had gained from this unexpected journey. He'd learned how to construct magic circles and had acquired a book detailing the basic principles of magic, including how to use teleportation spells. He now understood the fundamentals of potion making, as well as how to use spiritual power to identify the properties of herbs. And thanks to Sol, he'd even picked up some basic hand-to-hand combat skills. These skills and knowledge were securely locked in his enhanced memory, and the books he'd obtained would allow him to continue studying after his return. All in all, Ethan thought to himself, this trip has been more rewarding than I could have imagined. But before he left, there was one last piece of business to attend to. Next up is picking up the equipment I ordered, Ethan muttered to himself. Before leaving Camp Rogue in search of Sol, he had used the rewards he'd earned to commission a small piece of equipment from Charsai, the camp's skilled blacksmith. On the second day after Ethan left Camp Rogue, Charsai had already completed the small piece of equipment he had requested. To be fair, it wasn't a complex design, just a pair of lightweight bracers with a built-in mechanism capable of firing 3 short, 10-centimeter-long arrows from each bracer. Before commissioning the design, Ethan had consulted Kasia to learn the rogue's methods for attaching magic to arrows and launching them. With her advice, he finalized the plans and handed them to Charsai for crafting. What Charsai delivered was still a half-finished product, ordinary bracers capable of firing 6 short arrows in total. Ethan still needed to carefully inscribe the magic circles onto the bracers in the designated areas, a painstaking and delicate process. With only this single pair of bracers, failure wasn't an option. A single mistake could ruin them entirely, leaving him without the protective gear he had planned so carefully. Understanding the high stakes, Ethan took every precaution. He meticulously prepared, adjusted his mental state, and even hung a large sign outside his tent that read, "Do not disturb." Once everything was in place, he began the precise task of engraving the magic circles, following the design he had drafted beforehand. The concept behind this equipment was simple: split the components of spellcasting into separate steps, leaving only the triggering of the magic to Ethan's mental power. The magic power needed to fuel the device would come from a few small magic stones he had in his possession. To streamline the process, Ethan added a magic power storage function to the magic circles. This allowed him to preload magic power from the stones into the bracers, removing the need to install the stones directly into the equipment. This design not only eliminated the need for additional hardware but also shaved off precious seconds from the activation time. The magic circles would handle the shaping and casting of the spells automatically. While this approach lacked the flexibility and power of manually cast spells, it compensated by offering simplicity and consistency. To make up for the limitations of the rough magic circles, Ethan added the short arrows as a physical carrier to increase the lethality of the attack. Following Kasia's advice, he incorporated a method to imbue the arrows with magic as they were launched. When fully completed, the bracers would become magical weapons capable of firing 6 flaming arrows imbued with fire magic. The bracers had no manual trigger mechanism, instead, Ethan had designed them to be activated entirely through mental power. This meant the equipment was effectively custom-built for him. Those skilled enough to wield it wouldn't need it, and those who might need it wouldn't be able to wield it. This thing feels oddly delicate, Ethan muttered to himself after a long, sleepless night of work. The bracers were finally completed, and while he was thrilled with his accomplishment, he couldn't help but note that they seemed more suited for a certain aesthetic than the rough practicality he had envisioned. Ignoring the stray thought, he slipped on the bracers to test their fit and weight. They felt light enough not to hinder his movements, and the mechanism functioned smoothly. Satisfied, he began sorting through his supplies. He took out several bottles of potions he had brewed earlier, tucking them into a small pouch on his back. He strapped the short dagger to his waist, positioned his shield within easy reach, and made sure everything was secured. Ethan stepped out of his tent, his preparations complete. Despite working through the night, his stamina and energy had recovered after a short rest. His recent physical and mental training had significantly improved his overall condition, making him more resilient than ever. He reflected briefly on his progress and made a decision: he would accompany Isandra and Sol to the evil cave to help clear out the dark creatures infesting the area. There's no better opportunity than now, Ethan thought, gripping the hilt of his short sword. With two powerful teammates like Isandra and Sol, this is probably the safest chance I'll ever have to face a real threat. If I can't even stand against a few of the weakest dark creatures, how can I hope to handle the challenges ahead? His mind wandered to the uncertain future. He didn't know what kind of world he would find himself in after the next teleportation, nor what kinds of monsters or dangers he might face. Was it realistic to believe he could always hide and rely on safe opportunities to gather resources? And what of the ocean world he'd left behind? Who could say what awaited him there? Sometimes, you just have to take the risk, Ethan muttered, his resolve hardening. It's time to stop hesitating. I've prepared as much as I can. This is my chance to prove I can handle it. Chapter 14. Ethan's shield blocked a heavy blow just in time. Pivoting swiftly, his dagger struck out, piercing through the chest of the fallen demon that had lunged at him from the side. The creature let out a guttural snarl before collapsing, and Ethan quickly withdrew his blade, scanning his surroundings and repositioning himself for another potential attack. Well done, Ethan. You've made significant progress, Isandra said approvingly, her tone calm but with a note of genuine praise. It had been over half a day since they left the Rouge encampment. Unlike his earlier cautious self, who avoided danger whenever possible, Ethan was now actively seeking out dark creatures and eliminating any he came across. In that time, their group had taken down over a dozen quill rats, at least 24 zombies, and an uncountable number of fallens. As they ventured farther from the camp, the encounters became increasingly difficult. The dark creatures were not only more numerous, but their strength and coordination also seemed to grow. This latest encounter was no exception. A small tribe of fallens, numbering in the dozens, had been discovered. Among them were at least 3 fallen shamans whose fireballs and resurrection spells made them particularly troublesome. Isandra and Sol worked efficiently, focusing first on eliminating the shamans. Without their support, the lesser demons would fall apart. Meanwhile, the remaining demons were carefully left for Ethan to handle, giving him the opportunity to gain valuable combat experience. For 2 seasoned mages like Isandra and Sol, eliminating a group of fallens, even with their shamans, posed no real challenge. However, their primary concern was ensuring Ethan's safety. To their surprise, Ethan had announced his intention to join them in the fight against the dark creatures in the Den of Evil, a decision neither of them objected to. All who are determined to fight against the darkness are our allies, Sol had said when Ethan revealed his plan. Strength was not a prerequisite in their eyes. Even though Ethan was still relatively weak, both mages were willing to guide and support him, knowing that he had the potential to grow. Along the way, they took every opportunity to train him. Whenever they encountered scattered zombies or lone creatures, Ethan was tasked with handling them on his own. When they ran into larger groups, Isandra and Sol would deliberately leave some weaker enemies for him to fight, carefully observing his progress. This time was no different. After the pair eliminated the most dangerous shamans, they intentionally let a few fallen demons slip past them to attack Ethan. It wasn't a random test, they were confident he could handle it. By now, both mages had a clear understanding of Ethan's abilities. They also had the insight of trained spellcasters who were intimately familiar with the relationship between spiritual power and physical performance. As Ethan's mental strength had increased, so too had his reaction time. In the heat of battle, his heightened focus made enemy movements appear almost sluggish, giving him a critical advantage in combat. This mental sharpness was something even Rathma priests relied on heavily when first learning melee combat. With enhanced awareness and quick thinking, they could anticipate their opponent's movements and formulate strategies in mere moments. However, mental acuity alone wasn't enough. The body also needed to react quickly enough to capitalize on the advantage. Ethan was no exception. Fortunately, at 17 years old, his young body was at the peak of its natural reflexes. While his strength was still developing, his flexibility and reaction speed allowed him to keep pace with his sharpened instincts. In recent weeks, his growth had been remarkable. He'd gone from barely managing to fend off surprise attacks to actively countering them. Even if the attackers were weak fallens, the improvement was undeniable. Fallen were far from harmless. Their physical strength was comparable to that of a strong adult human, and their speed made them particularly dangerous. They could easily outrun heavier or less agile opponents. The fact that Ethan could now face them alone and come out victorious was a testament to how far he had come. With a final strike, Ethan took down the last of the Fallens. Breathing heavily, he stood in place, his chest rising and falling as he took in the sight of the battlefield. The air was thick with the foul stench of blood and decay, tinged with the unsettling aura of dark energy. It was far from pleasant, but as Ethan sheathed his dagger and steadied his breathing, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Your progress is faster than I anticipated. It's truly surprising that you have such aptitude. At your age, why haven't you begun the path of a true mage apprentice yet? Isandra asked, a slight frown of curiosity on her face. In her experience, a real mage apprentice should have already mastered some basic spells by now. Apprentices are typically able to assist their mentors in preparing for minor magical experiments, marking them as more than just ordinary individuals, they've already stepped into the realm of magic. Most young apprentices, chosen by accomplished mages, are born with exceptional spiritual power. Their training focuses only on refining that power and, before long, beginning to condense their own magic. For someone Ethan's age to still be at the starting line was, frankly, rare. Because I only started learning magic recently, Ethan replied, his voice calm but tinged with a hint of self-reflection. As he answered, he glanced at the short dagger in his hand. It was the same weapon Kasia had given him when he first set out, but it had reached the end of its life. The blade was now jagged and broken, its pointed tip completely gone. Even the hilt, though intact, showed signs of wear. In its current state, the dagger no longer had any practical use. Its blade was so bent and twisted that it couldn't even be sheathed properly. Sentiment aside, the weapon would have to be discarded. There's a lot of stuff lying around from the Fallens we killed. Maybe you'll find something more useful, Sol suggested as he gestured toward the scattered remnants of the small camp they had just cleared. Both Isandra and Sol had no need for replacement weapons. Isandra carried her long staff, which could double as a melee weapon when necessary, while Sol wielded the peculiar dagger that was the hallmark of Rathma priests. The dagger served multiple purposes, close combat, spell casting, and even ceremonial uses. However, Sol rarely relied on it, preferring instead to conjure a long bone scythe from magic, which complemented his ominous, shadowy demeanor. Ethan glanced at Sol's scythe and, half-jokingly, asked, "Can't you make me a magical sword or something?" Sol shook his head, his voice tinged with amusement. "This type of magic requires a constant infusion of my personal magic to maintain its form. It's also imprinted with my spiritual signature, so you wouldn't even be able to wield it." Acknowledging this, Ethan sighed and began searching the area for a replacement weapon. Most of the fallen demons had been wielding crude wooden clubs or short knives, none of which seemed like an upgrade from his battered sword. Eventually, he settled for a sturdy-looking wooden stick. "I guess this'll have to do for now," he muttered to himself. As the group prepared to move forward, with the Den of Evil's entrance now visible in the distance, Isandra suddenly stopped. Her eyes fell on something half-buried in the dirt beside a stone. She bent down and pulled out a metal rod. "Interesting," she murmured, giving it a few test swings. The weighty hum as it cut through the air suggested it was sturdier than it looked. Moments later, faint sparks of electricity danced across its surface. "Well, looks like you've got some luck after all," Isandra said with a grin as she handed the rod to Ethan. "Ditch that firewood you're holding. Use this instead." "What is it?" Ethan asked, inspecting the rod. It was encrusted with dirt and grass, giving it a battered, unimpressive appearance. Sol stepped closer, examining the object. "If I'm not mistaken, this is the handle of a one-handed warhammer." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A warhammer? Where's the hammerhead?" "It's broken off," Isandra explained. "This is just the handle and the shaft that once connected to the head. But don't let that fool you, it's still magical equipment." Ethan's eyes lit up as he remembered the electric sparks from earlier. "But without the hammerhead, is it still functional?" "It is," Isandra replied confidently. "The enchantment on the weapon hasn't been fully destroyed. The core magic is still intact, even if it's not operating at full power." She then explained how to activate the rod's latent magic using spiritual energy. Ethan followed her instructions, channeling his energy into the rod. Almost immediately, arcs of bright lightning crackled along its surface. Even Sol, who was standing nearby, took an involuntary step back as the electricity surged. "Impressive," the necromancer muttered. Despite his magical defenses, he could feel a faint tingling sensation where the lightning had brushed against his bone armor. "So, what kind of magic is imbued in this thing?" Ethan asked, holding the rod gingerly as the lightning gradually subsided. "It's clearly some form of lightning magic," Sol speculated. "But without the hammerhead, the specific spell it was designed to cast is incomplete. The inscription for shaping and directing the magic was likely on the hammer itself. While the rod's full potential was lost with its broken head, it still retained enough magic to serve as a viable weapon. Its ability to absorb and store ambient energy meant that Ethan wouldn't need to constantly recharge it, he could simply trigger the stored lightning when needed. Isn't this basically an electric baton? Chapter 15. With the shield strapped to his left arm and the electric baton firmly gripped in his right hand, Ethan's combat capabilities had improved significantly. Though he was still far from being able to decimate hordes of dark creatures like Sol and Isandra, he was now capable of holding his own in the chaos of battle. Without the need to constantly monitor Ethan's safety, the two mages unleashed their full strength. This time, the dark creatures inhabiting the Den of Evil met their end in spectacular fashion. Frost engulfed entire groups, flames erupted violently, and Sol's necromantic magic shone with an eerie, pale light. The screams of the fallen and the groans of zombies echoed through the cavern, a cacophony of despair. Ethan felt like he was living inside a high-budget fantasy film, one that no 3D movie could ever compare to. The intensity, the vividness, the sheer adrenaline, it was incomparable. A fallen lunged at him, and Ethan swung his iron rod, its crackling electricity sparking with each movement. The demon crumpled to the ground. He pivoted quickly, planting a solid kick into the chest of an approaching zombie, its decayed flesh giving way beneath his boot. With a sharp inhale, Ethan drove his foot down in a follow-up attack, crushing the zombie's brittle skull under his heel. Taking a quick glance around, Ethan noticed that most of the dark creatures had been obliterated by the combined might of the two mages. Only a few stragglers remained, easily dispatched by his own efforts. Good call coming along, Ethan muttered to himself, grateful for his earlier decision to join Isandra and Sol. Opportunities like this, fighting alongside two powerful allies, weren't likely to come often. Under their guidance and protection, his combat skills had advanced noticeably in a single day. The Fallens and zombies, simple as their attack patterns might seem, presented countless challenges due to the unpredictable terrain and sudden ambushes. Navigating these conditions had rapidly honed Ethan's instincts and adaptability, transforming him from a fledgling fighter into a budding adventurer. I owe a lot of this to Ancient One, Ethan reflected as he steadied his breathing. His ability to maintain clarity during combat, to analyze situations and act decisively, was all thanks to the significant improvement in his mental strength. The extra split second of thought provided by his enhanced mental power had repeatedly saved his life. As the sounds of battle, the blasts of Isandra's fireballs and the guttural cries of the fallen faded into silence, it became clear that the fight was nearly over. Only a handful of creatures remained, a few scattered Fallens and slow-moving zombies. Previously, the two mages would have intentionally left these remaining creatures for Ethan to deal with, using them as training tools. But now, Sol declared, you've outgrown these exercises. It's time to challenge yourself in more complex and unpredictable combat scenarios. Hearing this, Ethan felt a rush of pride. For the first time, he was being treated not as a liability but as an equal, a comrade in arms against the forces of darkness. Even so, Ethan remained cautious. As he carefully inspected the battlefield, scanning the corpses of the dark creatures for signs of lingering danger, his grip on his iron rod tightened. He knew better than to assume all enemies were truly dead. After all, this wasn't a game where a fallen enemy was guaranteed to stay down. The cunning nature of the Fallens made it entirely plausible that one might feign death, waiting for the right moment to strike. Better safe than sorry, Ethan thought, his gaze sweeping over the bodies. His vigilance was soon justified. Just as he approached a pile of corpses, a Fallen suddenly sprang to life. With a guttural screech in its infernal tongue, it brandished a crude blade and lunged at Ethan, its beady eyes burning with malice. Ethan's preparation paid off. Reacting instantly, he raised his iron rod to block the incoming strike. The Fallen's blade clashed against the rod with a metallic clang, and Ethan's left foot shot out in a powerful kick. His boot connected squarely with the demon's grotesque face, sending it reeling backward. Wasting no time, Ethan stepped forward and swung the rod with both hands. This time, he activated the rod's lightning magic. Electricity surged through the weapon, the sparks illuminating the dark cavern in an instant. The Fallen let out a blood-curdling scream as the lightning coursed through its body, leaving it convulsing before collapsing lifelessly to the ground. Ha, good thing I stayed alert, Ethan muttered, exhaling heavily. He inspected the body one last time to ensure the creature was truly dead before turning back to rejoin Sol and Isandra. Well done, Ethan. Ethan's movements were increasingly refined, shedding the clumsiness of an inexperienced fighter. Both Sol and Isandra took note of his rapid progress, their surprise evident as they exchanged glances. I might regret not trying harder to recruit you, Sol said with a faint smile. Whether he was being serious or not, the remark still filled Ethan with a sense of accomplishment. He no longer bothered with forced humility, simply nodding in acknowledgement, his own grin widening. All right, let's keep moving, Isandra interjected. Her voice carried a note of irritation as she glanced around the dark, damp cave. This place is endless, and we have no idea how many creatures are still lurking. Stay vigilant. She sounded impatient. The oppressive atmosphere of the den of evil and its maze-like network of tunnels was clearly starting to grate on her nerves. It felt like they had been wandering for hours, though her impeccable memory assured her that they hadn't passed the same area twice. I've been mapping out the layout mentally, Isandra continued, her tone steady despite her frustration. Based on what we've seen and what Akira and Kasia told us before, we've cleared out most of this cave. The Den of Evil had only recently earned its ominous name. Initially, it was nothing more than an unremarkable hollow in the blood moor, devoid of resources or strategic importance. Its only claim to attention was its recent role as a haven for dark creatures, drawn in by the surge of sinister energy radiating through the land. Rogues from the Sightless Eye and Kasia's warriors had scouted the area extensively, drawing up a detailed map of the cave. Though the original map was lost in the chaos of the monastery's fall, Kasia's sharp memory had been enough to provide the team with a decent understanding of the cave's layout before they embarked on their mission. We're approaching the deepest section of the cave, Isandra added, her voice growing more serious. If the pattern holds, the strongest dark creature in this area should be waiting for us down there. The deeper they ventured, the stronger the dark energy became. The creatures lurking in the shadows grew more powerful with every step, reinforcing the sense that the cave's most dangerous inhabitant awaited them in its darkest depths. Ethan couldn't help but recall the first major boss he'd encountered in the game during his past life, Corpse Fire, an elite zombie with significantly enhanced strength and dark energy. The memory made his palms sweat. But how could he explain this knowledge without drawing suspicion? What if they started questioning how he knew so much? Would they mistake him for a spy sent by the dark forces? Even if he tried to give them a heads up, maybe suggest attacking corpse fire from a distance. He quickly dismissed the idea. Both Sol and Isandra were seasoned mages. Rushing recklessly into melee combat was the last thing either of them would do. These two are practically max-level veterans, Ethan muttered under his breath. My worry is completely unnecessary. His concerns proved unfounded as they reached the cavern's heart. From a safe distance, Ethan spotted corpse fire, unmistakable amidst the horde of regular zombies. The elite zombie radiated dark energy so potent it seemed almost visible to the naked eye. Without hesitation, Ethan took a step back, instinctively positioning himself behind the two mages. Stay back, Ethan. Sol commanded sharply. This opponent is far beyond what you can handle. Let us deal with it. Sol didn't summon his usual bone scythe. Instead, he produced a strange, rune-carved dagger he hadn't used until now, while his left hand conjured a pale, translucent bone shield for defense. Isandra was equally prepared. She quickly cast a shimmering magic shield around herself before turning to Ethan and summoning a protective frost shield to encase him. Without missing a beat, she hurled a massive fireball toward the horde of zombies. Simultaneously, Sol unleashed his spell. A bone spear materialized in his right hand, crackling with primordial magic. It radiated a dazzling white light, briefly illuminating the entire cavern as though it were midday. The combined light of Isandra's fireball and Sol's bone spear revealed the full extent of the enemy forces. Ethan's breath hitched as he saw the horde clearly for the first time, dozens of zombies packed tightly together, with countless skeleton archers lurking in the shadows at the edges. The archers already had their bows drawn, their bony fingers releasing arrows aimed directly at the group. The whistle of arrows cutting through the air filled the cavern. Sol surged forward, his bone shield raised to intercept the incoming projectiles. The sharp clang of arrows striking the shield sounded like a downpour, a testament to the archers' overwhelming threat. Take out those archers first. Sol barked. Isandra was already ahead of him. She adjusted her aim, launching her fireball in a high arc over the zombie horde. It exploded with devastating force among the skeleton archers, bathing the cavern in a fiery glow. The blast reduced the archers to smoldering heaps of ash, their threat neutralized in an instant. With the archers dealt with, the remaining zombies posed far less of a challenge. Isandra and Sol switched to precision attacks, casting less mana-intensive spells to conserve their strength while thinning the enemy ranks. At this point, Ethan could safely join the fray. He stayed near the cave's edge, carefully maneuvering to avoid getting surrounded. Using the terrain to his advantage, he positioned himself so he only had to face one or two enemies at a time. He made a conscious effort to keep his distance from corpse fire, fully aware that a single attack from the elite monster could spell his end. Know your limits, Ethan reminded himself grimly, clenching his iron rod tightly. Don't pick fights you can't win. He struck down a straggling zombie with a precise blow to its skull, then retreated further along the cave wall. As the remaining creatures dwindled, Ethan stopped fighting altogether, stepping aside to let the two mages finish the job. In the end, corpse fire despite its ominous aura proved no match for Isandra and Sol's combined power. A massive fireball from Isandra reduced the elite zombie to charred remains, indistinguishable from the ordinary undead it once led. Chapter 16. After successfully annihilating all the dark creatures within the den of evil, the three adventurers took time to sweep the surrounding areas of the cave to ensure no lingering threats remained. It wasn't until the night of the fourth day that they finally returned to the rogue camp. Ethan had been considering his options ever since arriving in this world. After some thought, he decided to continue hunting Blood Raven with Sol and Isandra. Blood Raven, once known as Morina, the heroic rogue archer from Diablo 1 who defeated Diablo and saved the world, was now a fallen legend. Unfortunately, after Diablo's defeat, Morina, the idol of the rogues, began to succumb to darkness. As the influence of evil spread, she completely fell into corruption and became one of Andariel's most loyal minions, tasked with hunting down her former allies. The only way to help this hero now, Sol had said grimly, is to free her from the grip of the dark forces. Everyone knew there was only one way to do that. After a night's rest, the mage, necromancer, and apprentice mage set out once more on their journey against the darkness. This time, however, the task proved far more challenging than anything Ethan had faced before. Blood Raven was not only a powerful hero in her own right but had grown even stronger in her corrupted state. Her fall had granted her the ability to summon and control undead creatures. An endless tide of skeletal soldiers surrounded her, creating an impenetrable barrier. From within her layers of defense, Blood Raven could unleash devastating attacks, fully displaying the skill and precision of a top rogue archer. Ethan found himself completely outmatched during this crusade against Blood Raven. Though he avoided injury thanks to the protection of Sol and Isandra, the battle still took its toll. He ended up losing a magical bracer he had recently crafted. The bracer's primary purpose was to serve as a last resort shield, capable of blocking critical strikes in emergencies. During the fight, one of the incidents occurred when Ethan had to block the slash of a skeleton soldier after his shield was destroyed. Thankfully, Charsai's craftsmanship held up, the blacksmith's sturdy work prevented the blade from severing Ethan's hand. However, the impact completely destroyed the delicate magical formation embedded in the bracer. The second incident was even more harrowing. Amid the chaos of battle, Blood Raven herself took notice of Ethan and fired a deadly arrow aimed directly at him. At that moment, a sudden sense of danger surged in Ethan's mind, sharpening his focus to an almost unnatural degree. Time seemed to slow as his heightened mental awareness allowed him to see the incoming arrow with perfect clarity. He managed to raise his bracer in time, deflecting the arrow. Even so, the arrow pierced through the bracer and nearly shattered his wrist. It only missed a fatal blow because Ethan turned his head at the last second and twisted his arm to redirect the arrow's trajectory. The near miss left him shaken, his wrist throbbing in pain, but he survived. From that point on, Ethan could only stand back and watch as Sol and Isandra unleashed their formidable powers, turning the tide of battle. His role had been limited to taking out a few skeleton soldiers early on. Clearly, I still have a long way to go, Ethan muttered bitterly as he treated his wounds after the battle. Once the battlefield was cleared and their wounds tended, Ethan turned to Sol and Isandra with a helpless smile. It seems this is as far as I can go with you. Though our time together has been brief, Sol said, I'll always remember it. Isandra followed up with a question, what will you do next? Will you stay at the rogue camp? They both understood that Ethan's current strength wasn't enough for the increasingly dangerous battles ahead. Bloodraven had pushed him to his limit, and the demons that lay beyond her would be even more formidable. Continuing the journey would almost certainly result in his death, a death that would serve no purpose, as Ethan lacked the power to truly harm the forces of darkness. However, staying at the camp wasn't without its merits. Ethan could help Akara by gathering herbs or brewing simple potions. He could also assist the rogues with basic healing or first aid, skills he had picked up from the nuns. Even patrolling the surrounding areas and clearing out minor dark creatures could be valuable. With careful preparation, the creatures in the Bloodmoor wouldn't pose a significant threat to him as long as he remained cautious. As for returning home, that wasn't an option for now. Ethan had previously claimed to have come from the east, but the fortress leading to the eastern regions was still occupied by Andriel's forces. The only way for him to return would be for Sol and Isandra to either defeat or seal Andriel, allowing the Sisters of the Sightless Eye to reclaim the eastern gate. What they didn't know, however, was that Ethan only had 2 days left in this world. Even if he had the strength, his time here was running out, leaving no chance for him to join them in their fight against Andriel. For the past few days, Ethan had been crafting a suitable excuse, and now it was finally time to use it. Actually, Ethan said, feigning casualness, my teacher has located my position through special magic and plans to use teleportation to bring me back in the next 2 days. Isandra's eyes widened in shock. Ethan swore it was the first time he'd seen such an exaggerated expression from the normally calm and collected mage. To be able to do something like that? Your teacher must be an exceptionally powerful mage, Isandra said, her voice tinged with awe. Neither of them doubted Ethan's claim. In fact, they seemed to take it in stride. As experienced practitioners, both Sol and Isandra had long since realized that their understanding of magic was but a fraction of its true scope. They were used to encountering phenomena that seemed impossible at first glance. Of course, some mages, those arrogant enough to believe they had reached the pinnacle of knowledge, would dismiss anything outside their own understanding as nonsense. But fortunately, neither Sol nor Isandra fell into that category. They accepted Ethan's words without hesitation. Even if they had harbored doubts, those would surely vanish when they saw Ethan vanish into thin air 2 days later, courtesy of the space-time magic circle. After packing their belongings, the trio made their way back to the rogue camp. Ethan's impending departure wasn't kept a secret, so it wasn't long before word spread throughout the camp. By the time they returned, both Akara and Kasia were already aware of his plans to leave. Before his departure, they came to bid him farewell. Thank you for everything you've done for us during your time here, Akara said warmly. You will always be a friend of the Sisters of the Sightless Eye. If you ever have the chance, we hope you'll return as our guest. As a parting gift, Akara gave Ethan several herbs. They had been processed into powders for easy transport. Though simple in appearance, Ethan suspected they would prove invaluable. Kasia, on the other hand, presented Ethan with a refined longsword. The weapon could be wielded with either 1 or 2 hands. Its design was understated, the hilt and crossguard were devoid of intricate engravings, and the blade seemed ordinary at first glance. But when Ethan unsheathed the sword and swung it experimentally, he noticed faint magical fluctuations emanating from it. Is this magical equipment? Ethan asked, his curiosity piqued. Kasia nodded. The sword has no special abilities beyond being reinforced with magic. It's far stronger than a typical longsword. Hearing this, Ethan couldn't hide his excitement. While the enchantment sounded simple, it was precisely what he needed. One of the biggest drawbacks of weapons was their tendency to dull or break after prolonged use, especially in high-intensity battles. The durability provided by the enchantment was far more practical than flashy effects like fireballs or lightning. Kasia wasn't finished. Aware that Ethan had little experience with longswords, she also handed him a small manuscript. This contains basic swordsmanship techniques and training methods, she explained. I've also included some of my personal insights and experiences. I hope it will be of use to you. Ethan accepted the codex with both hands, bowing his head in gratitude. This was exactly what he needed. He never expected Kasia to give him something so precious. In a world like this, where resources and knowledge were scarce, such gifts weren't handed out lightly, especially to someone who wasn't a rogue or a disciple of the Sisters of the Sightless Eye. Even Akara, with whom he had spent far more time, had only given him herbal powders, not an instructional guide on potion making or magical theory. Maybe, it's because my actions indirectly helped save more rogues, Ethan speculated. After Kasia and Akara's farewells, other camp residents came to bid Ethan goodbye. However, both Sol and Isandra were conspicuously absent. Ethan assumed they were busy with other matters and planned to see him off closer to his departure. But his assumption was proven wrong. Early the next morning, as Ethan stood in an open field with his packed belongings, waiting for the teleportation magic to activate, Sol and Isandra finally appeared. To his surprise, they weren't alone, they had brought Charsai, the camp's blacksmith, with them. I thought you weren't going to see me off, Ethan said with a grin. How could we miss it? Sol replied. You're leaving so suddenly that we needed time to prepare a gift. Fortunately, we made it just in time. Sol stepped forward, opening his hand to reveal a small, unassuming copper ring resting on his palm. Ethan stared at the ring, his expression shifting between curiosity and incredulity. After a moment, he couldn't help but ask, what is this? He doubted Sol would present him with something as mundane as a plain copper ring. It was better to ask directly than waste time guessing. This is a ring, Ethan, Sol said with a playful smirk. But I've enchanted it with a curse. Ethan immediately took a step back, his face a mixture of disbelief and mock betrayal. You're giving me something cursed? Are you trying to kill me? Sol remained unfazed, his expression stoic. It's an active spell, he explained. You can use your mental power to trigger it. It'll help you deal with enemies. Realizing Sol was serious, Ethan stepped closer again, his interest rekindled. The necromancer began detailing the ring's function. As he explained, Ethan learned that the ring allowed him to cast a curse of weakness on enemies by channeling his mental energy. The curse would reduce the target's strength, agility, and durability, with the exact effects depending on the target's capabilities. Weakness was a fundamental curse from the Rathma priest's arsenal, and its simplicity made it an ideal match for Ethan, whose mental power and magical abilities were still in their infancy. Additionally, the ring had an auto-replenishing mechanism. It could absorb ambient magical energy from its surroundings, eliminating the need for Ethan to supply the curse's energy himself. This feature, Sol explained, was the most technically complex aspect of the ring's creation. This is amazing, Ethan said, inspecting the ring more closely. Does it have a name? Sol grinned. I came up with one last night, Sol's blessing. Fitting, don't you think? Chapter 17. Ethan looked at the ring now snugly sitting on the index finger of his left hand and briefly tested its function. The ring was incredibly straightforward to use. More importantly, the enchanted magic circle inscribed on it was exceptionally stable, it wouldn't lose its effectiveness from a mere bump or scrape. Ethan thought back to the pair of bracers he had crafted previously. Despite surviving direct hits without much physical damage, the engraved magic circles on those bracers had been completely destroyed after minor impacts. In comparison, this ring was on an entirely different level. Thank you, Sol, Ethan said sincerely. Sol accepted the thanks with a calm nod, stepping back to make room for Isandra, who was standing nearby with an expectant look. I made this for you with Charsai's help. Didn't your old pair of bracers break? To Ethan's surprise, Isandra handed him a new set of bracers. At first glance, they looked similar to his previous ones, but they were far more refined and delicately crafted. The moment he held them, Ethan noticed that the bracers were crafted from a metal alloy mixed with mithril, a material far better suited for conducting magic and channeling mental energy. Additionally, the precision of the engraved magic circles was leaps and bounds ahead of his own amateurish work. These bracers have multiple enchantments, don't they? Ethan asked. He put them on and channeled a bit of his mental energy into them. Almost instantly, he realized how extraordinary the bracers were. The one on your left hand, Isandra explained, not only imbues the 6 short arrows it carries with frost damage but also allows you to summon an ice shield. She guided him through the process, and Ethan, keen to try it out, focused his mental energy in the way Isandra described. He activated the magic circle in the left bracer, issuing a silent command. Almost immediately, icy cold air radiated from the bracer, forming a translucent circular shield about a meter in diameter. In addition to offering decent defense, the frost shield will have an effect on anything that gets too close to you, Isandra continued. Ethan noticed the surrounding temperature drop significantly. While the icy chill would weaken anyone nearby, he remained unharmed within the shield's protective radius at most. He felt a refreshing coolness. The only downside to the ice shield was that it required a constant flow of mental energy to maintain. For now, Ethan lacked the mental strength to keep it active for an extended period during battle. Even so, the shield was an incredibly effective defensive tool, especially considering it was paired with 6 frost-imbued arrows. To test the arrows, Ethan fired one at a nearby stone. Upon impact, a layer of frost instantly spread across the rock's surface. If this hits a person, Ethan mused, even if it doesn't freeze them completely, it'll cause severe frostbite and immobilize them. Compared to his old bracers, which could only fire 3 arrows with minimal effects, these new ones doubled his offensive capability. What about this one? Ethan asked, pointing to the bracer on his right hand. Ah, that one is designed primarily for offense, Isandra replied. The right-hand bracer was inscribed with a fire attribute magic circle, a much more advanced version of the fire magic Ethan had attempted to engrave on his previous equipment. When Ethan launched a fire-imbued arrow from the bracer, it struck the ground with a fiery explosion, leaving a small crater in its wake. The power was leagues beyond the minor flames his old bracers had been capable of producing. In addition to that, Isandra continued, this bracer can also fire 5 fireballs. Ethan's eyebrows shot up. Fireballs? Yes, Isandra said with a faint smile. Even though it's a basic spell, its power can vary greatly depending on the caster or, in this case, the enchanted item. The fireball spell inscribed on the bracer wasn't a weak entry-level version. Considering the flame arrows it already had, there was no need for another minor offensive capability. Instead, the fireballs it produced were powerful enough for area of effect damage, though not as devastating as the ones Isandra could cast herself. Isandra had clearly considered Ethan's current strength and potential for growth while crafting the bracers, likely putting a great deal of thought into striking the right balance. Thank you, Ethan said earnestly, thoroughly impressed by the bracers. The 2 bracers even had names, as Isandra cheerfully informed him. The left-hand bracer, capable of summoning the ice shield and firing frost arrows, was called Isandra's passion. The name symbolized the warm and protective care Isandra had imbued into the equipment. The right-hand bracer, with its fireballs and flaming arrows, was named Isandra's ruthlessness. It represented the merciless destruction it could unleash upon enemies. Together, the pair of bracers was collectively referred to as Isandra's guardian. Ethan couldn't help but laugh. Shouldn't the names be reversed, he joked. But upon hearing Isandra's reasoning behind the names, he had to admit they made sense in their own way. After explaining the bracers' features, Isandra stepped aside, allowing Charsai to step forward. Though Ethan hadn't interacted much with Charsai, the blacksmith had left a strong impression on him. When he'd asked for help crafting his old bracers, Charsai had dropped everything to assist, even when Ethan insisted there was no rush. I didn't have much time to prepare, Charsai began, and I didn't have the right materials to make anything that would match what these mages use. But I had this light armor I made earlier by mixing some unusual metal particles. I think it'll suit you well. She handed him a set of lightweight armor, consisting of a breastplate, gauntlets, and greaves. The design was minimalist, focusing only on protecting vital areas, the chest, hands, and legs parts most likely to engage in direct combat. Despite its simplicity, the armor was surprisingly well suited to Ethan's needs. What surprised him the most, however, was how light it was. Even the breastplate felt no heavier than a piece of leather armor. Once he put it on, it felt as though he were wearing ordinary clothing. I don't fully understand the effects of those strange metal particles, Charsai admitted, but I do know that this light armor is lighter than common cloth and can even float on water. Hopefully, that will be useful to you. Ethan's excitement soared when he heard that. Moments ago, he'd been jokingly imagining himself as some kind of bronze saint, but the idea of floating armor left him genuinely thrilled. His grin nearly stretched off his face. Useful? This is beyond useful, it's incredible. In a world dominated by endless oceans, the ability to float could very well be a lifesaver. No one could guarantee they'd never fall into the water whether from exhaustion, accidents, or unforeseen events. A life jacket like this armor would add a vital layer of security to his survival. If Sol and Isandra weren't watching, Ethan might have thrown caution to the wind and hugged Charsai in gratitude. Of course, with Charsai's towering physique, it was hard to tell who would be hugging whom. I also repaired your weapon for you, Charsai offered, clearly pleased with Ethan's enthusiasm. She reached behind her and pulled out the iron rod Ethan had used during the Den of Evil's expedition. After defeating Blood Raven and returning to camp, Isandra had asked to borrow the weapon. At the time, Ethan had handed it over without a second thought. Now, he realized Isandra had passed it to Charsai for repairs. The blacksmith had polished the rod to a silver sheen, cleaned off the grime, and even etched intricate decorative patterns onto its surface. The broken connection where the hammerhead had once been was fully repaired, leaving the weapon looking brand new. This weapon doesn't have a name yet, Charsai said. Maybe you can come up with one. Naming weapons seemed to be a tradition in this world, but Ethan struggled to think of something fitting. One ridiculous name after another flashed through his mind, but none of them felt quite right. I'll think of something later, Ethan said at last, laughing at his own indecision. Before he could dwell on it further, the space-time energy within his body began to surge violently. A glowing magic circle appeared beneath his feet, radiating an intense brilliance. My teacher's teleportation magic is activating, Ethan said, quickly collecting the scattered packages at his feet. He remembered from experience that only items he physically carried with him would travel through the teleportation. The food and water he had were useful, but far less important than the books and manuscripts Akara, Isandra, and Kasia had gifted him. He made sure none of them were left behind. Seeing the magic circle intensify, the group instinctively stepped back. None of them knew the exact range of the spell or what would happen if they were caught in it. Even with the best intentions, being accidentally dragged into a teleportation spell could have disastrous consequences. If they were torn apart by the sheer force of magical energy, it wouldn't matter how much they'd wanted to say goodbye. It's been an honor to fight alongside you all, Ethan called out as the light enveloped him. I'll always remember this time we've shared. The glow intensified, drowning out the world around him. Ethan's form became a silhouette, and even his parting words grew indistinct, swallowed by the overwhelming fluctuations of magic. Chapter 18. Back on his familiar ship, surrounded by the familiar endless sea, and under the familiar warm sunshine, Ethan exhaled deeply. Though it had only been a month, the feeling of the sun on his skin was something he had almost forgotten. Sure, I gained a lot and made some good friends, but I'd really rather not go back to that cold, dark world again, he murmured to himself. Still, Ethan knew that if he ever became powerful enough in the future, he wouldn't hesitate to return and repay those who had helped him. Maybe their world really does deserve to be saved, stuck as it is between heaven and hell. After living in the dark world for a month, Ethan had learned quite a bit from Akara and Sol about its deeper truths. Strictly speaking, the dark world consisted of three realms: hell, home to the demons; heaven, ruled by divine beings; and the human world, caught in the middle of their eternal struggle. The human world was the place Ethan had been thrown into. The Rathma priests, to which Sol belonged, had long understood a harsh truth about their world: balance was key. If either heaven or hell gained the upper hand, humanity would face annihilation. This belief formed the core teachings of the organization, which saw its role as maintaining that precarious balance between the two powers. It's such a harsh world, Ethan sighed. He now understood why the demons in that world could never be eradicated entirely, because complete destruction of one side would only allow the other to dominate unopposed. If the angels held absolute power, humanity might be reduced to nothing more than enslaved worshippers, a fate no better than being ruled by demons. Heaven and hell, Ethan realized, were like rival nations ruled by higher beings. Humans, trapped between the two, had no choice but to play the role of pawns. The fragile balance between the two sides was the only thing allowing humanity to survive at all. Ah! Ethan sighed again, thinking about Isandra and Sol, who were heading off to confront Diablo. He knew their fates likely wouldn't be happy. Like the heroes of Diablo 1, their path seemed destined to end in tragedy. Looking down at his gear, the bracers on his wrists, the ring on his finger, the light armor on his body, and the long sword and iron rod beside him. I owe them a lot, he muttered. Resolving to repay his debts someday, Ethan began to sort through his newly gained treasures. There were several books, an introductory guide to magical potions, a basic text on magic circles, a beginner's guide to elemental magic, and a swordsmanship training manual filled with detailed handwritten notes. Then there was his equipment, the bracers, the ring, the light armor, the iron rod, and the long sword, all imbued with magical properties. Even without considering the knowledge he had yet to fully digest, Ethan could confidently say he'd become far stronger than the man he'd been a month ago. And I've gained plenty of combat experience, too, he added. A month ago, Ethan had still been nothing more than the son of an ordinary fisherman. Now, he felt like a legitimate adventurer. Unfortunately, I didn't find any space equipment, he lamented, glancing at the large pile of bags and gear scattered across his small ship. Ethan couldn't help but worry about his future travels. If he continued collecting resources and books like this, his boat would soon be overflowing. And that didn't even account for food and water storage, which were essential for survival at sea. Books are the real problem, he muttered, frowning at the pile. They're bulky, fragile, and in this humid, salty air, they're bound to get damaged if I don't take them out to dry regularly. For a moment, Ethan thought back to the clerk at the Adventurers Guild who had used a magic stone to store information. Glancing at the white wristband hidden beneath his bracer, he remembered that it contained his own data, which the guild could read. Wait, he said to himself. Doesn't that mean the magic stone can store data from paper? That's exactly what I need. Ethan groaned in frustration. Why hadn't he thought to ask for a tool like that earlier, back when he had plenty of resources to barter with? Well, there's no point regretting it now. If I want something like that, I'll have to find a floating island. His curiosity about the floating and sinking islands of this world hadn't waned. The thought of an empty sea suddenly giving rise to a lush, resource-rich island in a matter of days was fascinating. It must be a spectacular sight, he thought. Before entering the dark world, his island pointer had already locked onto a nearby target. What he didn't know was how much time had passed in this world during his month away. Was that same island still there? Glancing at the pointer, Ethan saw it still firmly indicated a direction. Whether it was the same island or a new one, the fact that something was nearby was enough to spur him into action. Wood did say the islands vibrate before they sink, Ethan recalled. The shorter the intervals between vibrations, the closer the island is to disappearing. He remembered asking guild staff for more details about these mysterious islands. Once a floating island emerged, life began to flourish at an astonishing rate. Plants grew rapidly, and in rare cases, animals appeared as well. The lifespan of these islands varied. Some lasted mere days before sinking back into the sea, while others remained for months or even years. Interestingly, islands that hosted animals always lasted at least a year before disappearing. How do animals even appear out of nowhere? Ethan wondered, shaking his head. The logic of this world continued to defy his understanding. Sitting at the bow of the Goddess of Dawn, he let the spray of the ocean wash over his face. Back in the Sea of Calm, Ethan resumed his daily routine of practicing spiritual techniques and water-gathering spells. This time, however, his training regimen had expanded to include melee combat and the basic swordsmanship techniques Kasia had taught him. The exercises were dull and repetitive, but with nothing else to do on his small boat, Ethan embraced the monotony. Alone at sea, with no one to talk to, training and reading were the only ways to pass the time. Perhaps it was this environment that had allowed his mental strength to improve so quickly before. With no distractions, he had been able to focus entirely on his development. Now, Ethan filled his days with endless practice, gradually refining his skills. Though the progress was slow, he could feel himself improving bit by bit, which kept him motivated. Still, there were moments when he longed for a break in the routine. Even a strong wind and some choppy waves would be a nice change of pace, he muttered. Maybe being too idle is what makes people suicidal, he added sarcastically, laughing at his own joke. As he spoke, his gaze caught sight of a small black dot on the horizon. Ethan froze, staring at it for a long moment before reaching for his telescope. Peering through the lens, he felt a surge of excitement. It's an island. Ethan stood at the bow of the boat, staring intently for over 10 minutes, half afraid that the island was just a mirage conjured by his desperate mind. Only when he was absolutely certain it was real did he lower the telescope and breathe a sigh of relief. He glanced at the pointer. Sure enough, the direction it indicated perfectly matched the island now visible ahead. After 10 days of endless sailing, it seemed his journey was finally coming to an end. Ethan couldn't help but smile, his mood brightened by the prospect of something new. As long as it's not more open sea, it's already worth celebrating, he muttered. An island meant food and resources. Although Ethan had started this voyage well stocked with provisions and had even supplemented them with rations from the Diablo world, his supply had steadily dwindled over the long days at sea. Fishing and scavenging seafood had helped stretch his food supply, but his reserves were now dangerously low. If he hadn't found this island, he would have had to adjust course and head toward the next space-time energy point, hoping to restock along the way. If that clerk wasn't lying, there's a good chance I'll find a magic stone here, Ethan thought to himself. Even a mediocre quality one would be enough to trade for food, water, and maybe even a tool to store data. He wasn't aiming for a high-quality magic stone. Something average would be perfectly fine, it could at least buy him what he needed to make the next leg of his journey easier. The possibility of acquiring an item to record his growing collection of books and materials was particularly enticing. Lost in thought, Ethan barely noticed as the island grew clearer and more distinct. Its lush, green vegetation painted a vibrant contrast to the endless blue of the sea. From this distance, he couldn't see much beyond the dense foliage, so it was impossible to tell if the island supported any animal life. Carefully, Ethan adjusted the boat's speed and altered its course slightly. Instead of heading directly toward the island, he angled the boat so it would graze the island's perimeter. This allowed him to circle it, observing the surrounding waters and scouting for a safe place to anchor. It didn't take long for him to find an ideal spot. The island boasted a small natural harbor, partially concealed by a narrow entrance flanked by a few large, jagged rocks. The channel wasn't particularly wide, but it was just large enough to accommodate his boat. Looking into the water, Ethan saw smooth, sandy shallows below, free of reefs or sharp rocks. Even during low tide, there would be little risk of damaging the boat. Perfect, he said aloud, a note of satisfaction in his voice. Not only was it a secure place to dock, but the nearby coastline also seemed like an excellent location to establish a temporary camp. Chapter 19. After docking the boat, Ethan surveyed the beach carefully. Initially, he considered setting up camp directly on the sand near the shoreline, but after some thought, he realized it wasn't a practical idea. The rising tide could easily submerge his hard-built resting spot, forcing him to move further inland. This looks better, he muttered to himself, stopping at a small dirt slope farther from the water. The spot had a few clear advantages, it wasn't too close to the woods, reducing the risk of being ambushed by anything lurking in the trees, and its slightly elevated position ensured it wouldn't be flooded by high tide. Now I just need to build a shelter, Ethan said, glancing up at the sky. Dark clouds had crept in while he worked, and it looked like it might start raining at any moment. If he couldn't finish his shelter quickly, he'd have no choice but to retreat to the boat for the night. But after so many days at sea, Ethan craved a good night's sleep on solid ground. Exploring the island could wait, he needed to deal with the immediate concern of staying dry. Good thing I learned how to make tents with simple materials in the Diablo world, Ethan said with a wry smile. With his current strength, he wasn't capable of chopping down large trees or building a proper wooden house from scratch. His best option was to gather sturdy branches, about as thick as his wrist at most, along with some large leaves for the roof. He stripped bark from the branches and twisted it into a makeshift rope, using it to bind everything together into a crude but functional tent. After hours of back-and-forth adjustments, Ethan stepped back and assessed his work. The tent was oddly shaped and far from elegant, but it would serve its purpose. Well, it's not pretty, but it'll keep the rain out, he said, patting the side of the tent. The structure held firm under his touch, and Ethan nodded in satisfaction. At least it won't blow away in the wind. Crawling inside, Ethan stretched out on a bed made from large leaves and began planning his exploration of the island. I'll start with a quick survey of the perimeter, he decided. His ideal plan was to systematically map out the island, starting at the edges and working inward in ever-tightening circles. That way, he wouldn't miss anything and would maximize his chances of finding a magic stone. But he also knew this approach might not be practical. It would take too much time, and many adventurers believed the most valuable resources were often located near the center of an island. If that were always true, though, everyone would know about it, Ethan reasoned. Wood would have mentioned it, or the guild would have made it common knowledge. He decided on a compromise, he'd divide the island into sectors, establish key reference points in each direction, and focus on one sector at a time. It's slower than heading straight for the center, but at least it's manageable, Ethan thought. The work ahead seemed daunting, and Ethan couldn't help but think how much easier it would be if he had a partner. Too bad finding a reliable teammate isn't exactly easy in my situation, he sighed. The loneliness of solo adventuring was starting to get to him. When he first set out to sea, he hadn't minded being alone, he'd spent most of his life surrounded by people and was eager for independence. But now, after working alongside Isandra and Sol, Ethan had grown accustomed to having allies by his side. The return to solitude felt stifling. As the rain began to fall, the rhythmic sound on the leaves above lulled him into an uneasy sleep. In his dreams, Ethan found himself aboard a grand ship filled with lively companions. Together, they laughed, explored uncharted waters, and eventually discovered the fabled endless land. When Ethan awoke, sunlight was streaming into the tent. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled fresh and clean. Stretching and stepping outside, Ethan used the rainwater he'd collected the night before to wash his face. The vivid memory of his dream lingered in his mind, but one detail irked him. Why were there only men on the boat, he muttered in frustration. Not even one girl? What kind of dream is that? Shaking his head, Ethan threw a leaf he'd used as a washcloth onto the ground and began suiting up. The light armor Charsai had given him felt stiff after days of disuse. When he first returned to the Sea of Calm, Ethan had worn it frequently, but he'd soon grown tired of its discomfort. Still, it was better to be prepared. As he buckled the armor into place, he finally understood why medieval knights wore tunics and cloaks over their armor. I always thought the cloaks were just for show, he mused, grimacing as the metal plates absorbed the morning sunlight. Without a barrier, the armor would turn into a walking oven in warmer weather. In winter, the metal would absorb the chill from the cold air, turning into a mobile freezer. Without a thick cloak to cover it, wearing armor in such conditions would be unbearable. Char-size armor gift, while excellent, lacked such accessories. Ethan quickly realized how uncomfortable it was after only a short time wearing it. In the end, he had to take it off during his voyages. But today, he wore it anyway. He had no idea what dangers lurked on this small island, and it was better to be fully equipped than caught unprepared. Moreover, once he entered the densely forested areas of the island, the canopy of leaves would block most direct sunlight, preventing the armor from heating up like an oven. Maybe I should consider engraving a temperature-regulating magic circle on this thing, Ethan muttered as he adjusted his route, sticking to shaded paths to minimize the heat radiating from the armor. Fortunately, the island wasn't particularly large, and Ethan's endurance and walking stamina were solid. He managed to circle the entire perimeter in just half a day and returned to his camp in the late afternoon. The island's small enough. Since there's still time before dark, I can start exploring the forest, Ethan decided, glancing toward the lush greenery. He also needed to gather food. Along the way, he had noticed several fruit trees bearing a unique kind of fruit he recognized. It was one of the resources he had seen at the Adventurers Guild during his early days at State Island. The fruit, aptly named Fruta, was a staple for sailors and adventurers in this world. It resembled a small coconut, with a blue-green shell that was surprisingly fragile. Inside was a hollow core filled with fragrant, plant-infused water. This water-rich fruit was a key survival resource for adventurers. Unlike fresh water, which could quickly spoil without a purification magic stone, Fruta could be stored for a long time without degrading. It also seemed to contain essential vitamins, sparing adventurers from the scurvy-like ailments that plagued sailors in Ethan's previous world. Ethan usually relied on his water creation spell, so he hadn't brought much Fruta with him. But now, he realized this island had a bounty of them. Enough, in fact, to fill his ship's cargo hold. I wonder what else this island has to offer, Ethan murmured, eyeing the forest again. Over the next few days, Ethan fell into a routine. Every morning, he would wash up, eat, and then head out to explore the island, sticking to his planned sector-by-sector approach. Along the way, he gathered fruits and other familiar foods, carefully sampling any unknown plants to bring back for identification at the guild later. It was a mistake not to buy a field guide to edible plants, Ethan muttered one afternoon as he studied an unfamiliar berry. Would have made things so much easier. Ethan was still inexperienced in many areas. While he was steadily adapting to this world's unique rules, he sometimes overlooked practical details. Still, he took care to learn from each mistake, making a mental note to avoid similar oversights in the future. As the days passed, his exploration brought him closer to the island's center. However, the closer he got, the less remarkable the landscape became. The heart of the island was dominated by a small, barren dirt slope. In stark contrast to the lush greenery around it, this area was devoid of grass or any visible life. Ethan had visited this spot several times but hadn't found anything noteworthy. Could it be underground, he wondered, frowning at the lifeless soil. If so, it would be a problem. Ethan hadn't brought any digging tools, and using his sword as a makeshift shovel felt like sacrilege. He could already imagine Kasha appearing across dimensions to scold him for abusing a fine weapon. As he debated whether to start digging or explore other areas first, a sound broke through the quiet, footsteps, coming from the woods ahead. Ethan tensed, instinctively lowering his body and scanning the direction of the noise. Moments later, a small group of people emerged from the trees. Among them was a face Ethan immediately recognized: Rodney. Of all people, it had to be him. Rodney was one of the sailors Ethan had rescued during his first sea voyage. But Rodney's suspicious behavior back on State Island had prompted Ethan to leave earlier than planned, sensing that the man bore him ill will. And now, here he was, grinning like a predator that had cornered its prey. Well, what are the odds? Rodney sneered. Fancy bumping into you here, kid. Today's your unlucky day. Rodney turned to a larger man standing beside him, clearly the leader of the group, and jabbed a finger in Ethan's direction. Captain, that's him. He's the one who got the combat magic stone from Wood. Chapter 20. Ethan eyed Rodney and the burly man, fully anticipating their next move. Hand over the magic stone, kid, the burly man demanded, his voice rough and laced with greed. Ethan almost rolled his eyes. It was just as predictable as he had imagined. Have you been tailing me all this time? Ethan asked, ignoring the leader's barking orders. Instead, he focused on Rodney, his tone calm but with a hint of mockery. You were on State Island with me, Ethan continued, spreading his hands in a gesture of feigned helplessness. You must know that I exchanged everything I had for supplies in my boat. Do you really think I still have the magic stone? His meaning was clear: whatever you're looking for isn't here. Now what? But as Ethan expected, his words didn't matter. The group closed in on him, ignoring his explanation entirely. Two of the men moved to block his retreat, weapons drawn, while Rodney brandished a machete with a malicious grin. Doesn't matter, Rodney sneered. Even if you traded the stone, you won't be leaving here alive. Everything you've got is ours now. The realization struck Ethan like a slow tide: it wasn't just about the magic stone. His light armor, the fine sword at his hip, and even the iron rod strapped to his back, all of it had painted a target on him. Like attracts like, Ethan muttered under his breath, shaking his head in dismay. Rodney was the kind of man who could only fall in with those just as rotten as him. People like this weren't just thieves, they were the kind who'd kill first and loot later. Though he had suspected Rodney's true nature before, confirming it now left no room for doubt. For Ethan, there was no hesitation. He had lived through the horrors of the Diablo world, battling unholy creatures that wanted nothing but destruction. These people, by comparison, were nothing more than petty, violent scavengers. As the group drew closer, Ethan made a decision. There would be no talking his way out of this. Words were useless in situations like this, and he wasn't the type to beg for mercy. Without warning, he spun on his heel, raised his right hand, and fired a short arrow from his bracer at one of the men behind him. Boom! The explosion was sudden and deafening. Flames erupted from the impact point, sending the unfortunate man reeling. The others froze in shock, stunned by the unexpected chaos. Ethan wasted no time. He drew his sword in one fluid motion and lunged at another attacker, his blade flashing as it slashed across the man's throat. The strike was clean, efficient, textbook perfect. The man's eyes widened in disbelief as blood poured from the wound, and he collapsed to the ground, twitching. Ethan didn't pause to admire his handiwork. His expression remained cold as he stepped forward and delivered a final, merciful thrust to end the man's suffering. It was only then that the others seemed to snap out of their stupor. The leader cursed loudly, his face twisting with anger as he turned to Rodney and backhanded him across the face. "You told me he was just some rookie from State Island," the burly man roared, his voice laced with fury. "You said he'd be an easy mark." Rodney staggered back, clutching his cheek, his confidence crumbling. The leader glared at Ethan, his previous arrogance replaced with the wariness of a man who had clearly underestimated his opponent. He wasn't a fool, he could see the young man before him wasn't some naive kid. The precision of Ethan's movements, the cold efficiency of his strike, and the magic-enhanced weaponry he wielded, all of it screamed danger. "This kid's a killer," the leader muttered under his breath, his earlier greed now mixed with caution. Ethan, of course, couldn't hear the man's inner thoughts. But if he could, he'd have found it ironic. This was the first time he had ever killed someone, and while he was no stranger to life-or-death situations, he certainly didn't see himself as a ruthless killer. Ethan glanced at the burly man and Rodney, noting their greedy expressions, and already knew exactly what kind of people he was dealing with. "Man, this is actually a misunderstanding. I'm willing to give you half of all the supplies on my ship if you let me go," the burly man said, attempting to negotiate. Hearing this, Ethan nearly burst out laughing. "If I had offered my supplies earlier, would you have let me leave safely?" he asked mockingly. The burly man hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. He could lie, of course, but what would be the point? From Ethan's response, he understood the young man's stance clearly. "Then there's nothing to talk about," the burly man admitted. "There was never anything to talk about," Ethan replied coldly. From the very beginning, Ethan had no intention of letting them go. Rodney was someone he had saved, only for him to harbor murderous intent against his benefactor. To spare such a person would be to invite trouble upon himself. As for the others, they had already crossed the line by ambushing him and attempting to kill him. Did he expect them to forget everything and leave peacefully after this? Cut the weeds, eliminate the roots. Without a second thought, Ethan raised his hand, pretending as if he was about to fire another short arrow. The sudden motion sent the group into a panic, each of them scrambling to dodge what they assumed was an attack. However, this time, Ethan only faked the movement. Instead, he cast a frostbolt with his left hand. Frostbolts didn't have the sheer damage of firebolts, but their utility in battle was undeniable. Ethan aimed the frostbolt at the ground near two of his opponents. The freezing air quickly spread, forming a slick layer of ice on the flat ground. What happened next was almost comical. The two men, caught off guard by the sudden ice, lost their footing and fell hard. Before they could regain their balance, Ethan was already upon them. With his sword in hand, he delivered two swift strikes, one for each of them. One of the men tried to roll away in a last-ditch effort to avoid the blade, but his companion's corpse hindered his movement. Ethan's sword came down, ending his life with brutal efficiency. The remaining members of the group, now terrified, scattered in different directions. The burly leader, however, decided on a different approach, running for his life. Desperate to ensure his escape, the big man shoved Rodney toward Ethan, using him as a human shield to buy himself time. "As long as I can reach the boat," he muttered to himself. The leader's landing spot was in a different direction from Ethan's, and he had deliberately cleared the path earlier. If Rodney could delay Ethan for just a few moments, he was confident he could escape to safety. But his plan was laughably naive. The moment Rodney stumbled toward him, Ethan drew the iron rod from his waist. A bright arc of electricity sparked across the rod, crackling menacingly. The arc leapt to Rodney, engulfing him in an electrified shock. Rodney's body convulsed violently as the electricity coursed through him. He fell to the ground, twitching uncontrollably, completely incapacitated. Ethan didn't even spare him another glance. Turning his attention to the fleeing leader, Ethan calmly sheathed his sword and raised his right hand. The magic circle engraved on his bracer activated as he cast the fireball spell. In an instant, a watermelon-sized ball of fire materialized in Ethan's hand. He hurled it forward, the spell whistling through the air as it pursued the burly man. The leader, oblivious to the attack at first, felt a sudden surge of heat behind him. Realizing something was wrong, he didn't dare turn around. Instead, he sprinted toward a large tree, hoping to use it as cover. "If I can just get behind the tree." The plan wasn't bad. The leader's combat instincts were sharp, and using the tree as both cover and a way to obscure himself from Ethan's view was a sound tactic. Unfortunately for him, it wasn't enough. The fireball didn't need to hit him directly. The moment it came close, it detonated with a deafening boom. The shockwave sent the big man flying, slamming him against the very tree he had hoped to use as cover. The impact was so powerful that the trunk split in two, the top half crashing down in a shower of splinters. The burly leader crumpled to the ground, his body limp and lifeless. Ethan scanned the area, his gaze lingering on the unmoving figure of the leader. Satisfied that the man was dead, he finally lowered his hands. His first real battle in the Sea of Calm had ended. 6 enemies dead. No injuries on his side. The only resources he'd expended were 2 short arrows. It's a perfect fight, Ethan muttered, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Chapter 21. In this skirmish, Ethan, armed with the overwhelming advantage of his equipment, utterly dominated his opponents, leaving no room for resistance. The enemy lacked the courage to fight to the bitter end, leaving Ethan no opportunity to test his other equipment. Even so, the battle served as a good chance for him to gauge his combat capabilities. Against regular bandits in the future, not only will they be unable to harm me, but I'll also be able to counter them with ease. This wasn't mere overconfidence, it was a solid conclusion. Ethan retrieved 2 short arrows from the battlefield. These arrows were not easy to replace. If he could recover them, he would. He rummaged through the fallen bodies again, collecting bits and pieces of value. Among his findings, the weapons were by far the most useful. Maybe I'll get lucky and find some low-grade magic stones, he thought. Even the tattered clothes on these bandits could potentially be bartered for something, but Ethan chose to leave them untouched. It wasn't because he lacked the means, he was far from desperate for money. Rather, he felt a vague sense of discomfort at the thought. Though he wouldn't call himself a noble person, desecrating corpses he had already killed felt unnecessary and distasteful. Because of this principle, the robbers were left with their clothing intact, a final shred of dignity as they were laid to rest. Speaking of which, these guys have a boat docked by the shore. I wonder what kind of vessel it is. There were 6 of them, and it wasn't clear whether any crew remained on board. But even if the ship was unguarded, a vessel capable of carrying 6 people was bound to be significantly larger than his own. It didn't matter whether the robbers had discovered other islands before this one or how much food and water they had stashed on board. The ship alone made this encounter worthwhile. Ethan's voyage hadn't been in vain. As dusk fell, Ethan decided not to return to his camp. Instead, he chose to investigate the bandits' ship. If there were crew members aboard, he planned to deal with them under cover of darkness. If not, he could tally his spoils and inspect the vessel. Following the path Rodney and his crew had carved earlier, Ethan quickly located the ship. It was a brig, roughly 15 meters in length, with a design reminiscent of the caravel ships he used to sail in a grand strategy game during his previous life. However, this one was slightly smaller. It was far superior to his own humble craft. This brig boasted 2 decks. Unlike his makeshift double-decked boat, this ship's interior deck was spacious enough for an average-height person to move about comfortably. The mainsail was a fore and aft rig, resembling a jib. While less stable than a traditional square sail, it excelled in speed and maneuverability, particularly in calm seas where such advantages were invaluable. However, such a sail design also required greater effort to operate. For a lone sailor like Ethan, managing this ship at sea could easily become an exhausting ordeal. Should I sell it? That idea felt wasteful. It wasn't every day one came across a better ship without having to buy it. Selling it only to purchase another vessel later seemed absurd. Maybe it's time to find a crew, Ethan mused. Sailing solo feels more and more unreliable. By now, the sky had darkened completely, and the ship remained unlit. It looks like no one's on board. Ethan cautiously explored the cabin, but no signs of life emerged. Still, he refrained from lighting any lamps, choosing instead to remain hidden in the shadows. He stayed alert throughout the night. When the sun rose once more over the horizon, he finally confirmed that there were no other threats nearby. He thoroughly searched the ship again, this time inventorying the remaining supplies. To his surprise, the situation was better than expected. The ship was well stocked with food and fresh water, indicating that Rodney's gang had recently resupplied before finding the island. Could these bastards have been following me? Ethan muttered. The thought wasn't far-fetched. When he had set out to sea, Rodney had seen the direction he was heading. Although tracking someone across the vast ocean was no small task, the existence of floating islands and navigational pointers made it entirely possible. Once the course was set, it was simply a matter of sailing straight and heading to the first island indicated by the pointer. The odds of finding him were over 70%. I've still got a lot to learn, Ethan admitted. Next time, I'll need to make my route more erratic. At the very least, I need to completely avoid any obvious paths that could be traced. Having learned this hard lesson, Ethan mentally added it to his growing list of survival strategies. After securing the ship, Ethan left to comb the nearby shore once more. There were no signs of a camp. Rodney's group had likely rushed straight to the island's center upon landing. Perhaps, in their minds, whether Ethan was present or not, their priority was to secure the island's most valuable resources as quickly as possible. In their eyes, if Ethan was indeed on the island, he would likely be exploring the central areas. So no matter what, heading there first was the most time-efficient option. With all potential threats eliminated, Ethan resumed his exploration of the island. It took him another 2 months to fully uncover its secrets. Ethan searched every corner he could, and his most significant find was a hidden mine. While he couldn't identify the specific type of ore, he knew that any kind of mine held immense value. The raw materials extracted from it could be exchanged for a wealth of resources. Thanks to the extra cargo space provided by the newly acquired larger ship, Ethan was now able to transport a substantial amount of ore. Before long, rough chunks of ore were piled high in the ship's hold. To make room for them, he moved all the fruits and fresh water he had previously stored onto land. For his voyage, he only planned to bring along a small amount of fruit to meet his vitamin needs. As for fresh water, he decided to rely entirely on his water creation spell to supply him during his travels. With the ship suddenly laden with heavy cargo, its draft became noticeably deeper. It took considerable effort for Ethan to maneuver the vessel into slightly deeper waters and anchor it there. Just as he was about to resume his exploration, a sudden tremor nearly caused him to lose his balance. An earthquake. Earthquakes often served as early warnings for a sinking island. Looks like my time here is running out. This particular island had no wildlife, which meant it wouldn't remain afloat for long, maybe a few months at best, or as little as a few days. Ethan had already been living on the island for 2 months, so it had likely persisted for quite a while. It's a shame I couldn't find a magic stone, he muttered, disappointed. Ethan had always kept in mind the advice he'd received from the guild. His top priority on any new island was to locate a magic stone. When he first discovered the mine, he'd hoped it might contain what he sought. Perhaps the ore was buried deep, and with some luck, he could stumble upon a magic stone among the veins. But the reality was far from ideal. The mine turned out to be shallower than he had anticipated. No matter how far he ventured into it, he couldn't find anything remotely resembling a magic stone. The walls were lined with ore, sure, but none of it was what he was looking for. Unwilling to give up, Ethan decided to put the long sword Kasia had given him to use, employing it as a makeshift mining tool. For hours, he dug and hacked away like a miner. Yet, despite exhausting himself and dulling the blade, all he managed to collect were more useless chunks of ore. As the tremors became increasingly frequent starting at intervals of half a day and now occurring roughly every 2 hours, Ethan realized he couldn't delay his departure any longer. The tremors were also growing in intensity, and the ground was beginning to show visible signs of damage, cracks formed, and the hillsides started to collapse into deep craters. Every sign urged Ethan to leave immediately. Fortunately, Ethan had begun preparing to evacuate as soon as he'd felt the first tremor. He'd packed all his belongings, and to avoid wasting time navigating out of the bay in a hurry, he'd already relocated his ship to a more accessible spot. As another tremor hit, Ethan felt the ground beneath him quake violently. The increasing frequency of the shocks left no room for hesitation. But just as he was about to head for the shore, he noticed a flash of white light in a nearby crater. What's that? At first, Ethan thought it was just his imagination, or perhaps sunlight reflecting off some ore. But the faint, unmistakable ripple of magical energy told him otherwise. This wasn't ordinary ore. A magic stone. Without a second thought, Ethan sprinted toward the crater. Sure enough, nestled within the dirt was a white stone, faintly glowing with a soft light and radiating waves of magical energy. A white magic stone? I wonder what attribute it holds. He quickly assessed the terrain of the crater, analyzing the safest way to retrieve the stone. In mere seconds, he made his decision and leapt into the pit. In that moment, adrenaline coursed through him, and he moved with a speed and agility that far exceeded his usual limits. As the ground quaked beneath him, he managed to snatch the magic stone midair as it bounced loose from the shifting earth. Clutching his prize tightly, Ethan scrambled back out of the crater with the nimbleness of a monkey, following a pre-planned escape route. The moment his feet hit solid ground, he bolted for the beach like a man possessed. The distance to the shore wasn't far, but Ethan couldn't believe how close the magic stone had been to the very spot he had chosen as his departure point. Buried beneath the surface, it had remained hidden until the tremors exposed it. If not for a series of lucky coincidences, he would never have found it. Back at the shore, Ethan wasted no time. He hauled himself onto his small boat, raised the anchor, and set sail toward the larger ship he'd anchored farther out. Once he reached the brig, he turned to look back at the island. Although the tremors were growing increasingly violent, it hadn't sunk yet. Reassured that he had some time, Ethan allowed himself a moment to examine the white magic stone in his hands. What attribute does this thing have? He stared at it intently. The magical energy it emitted felt strangely familiar. Ethan hadn't encountered many magic stones before, the one he had seen was red, a fire-attributed stone. The only white magic stone he could recall seeing was the one the guild had used when helping him fill out his personal information. Chapter 22. Am I really this lucky? Ethan examined the white magic stone in his hands for a long time, turning it over and scrutinizing it carefully. However, he couldn't determine whether it truly matched the type he was hoping for. Despite his doubts, the sheer magical fluctuations emanating from it filled him with cautious optimism. Even though I know good luck doesn't last forever, I really hope this streak holds out a little longer. It was a shame, though, that his cheat ability didn't come with something like an attribute panel or stats screen. If it did, he might have been able to measure his luck directly or at least figure out its grade. Placing the magic stone securely on him, Ethan began to assess his overall gains from this expedition. Between the stone, the hidden mine, and the larger, faster caravel which he had named after its resemblance to caravel sailing ships from his previous life, this trip had been far more rewarding than expected. He felt confident that these finds would help him make significant strides in improving his strength. I still know too little about this world, Ethan admitted to himself. I don't even fully understand how to grow stronger here. As for his new ship, he decided there was no need to consider getting an even larger one for now. Operating a vessel of this size was already challenging alone, and unless he could recruit reliable crewmates, upgrading to anything bigger was completely out of the question. His original boat, the smaller Goddess of Dawn, could probably be sold back to the guild, but he planned to keep the name for his new vessel. And then there was the question of the ore. Would it be possible to craft something useful from it? Or would it be better to simply exchange it for finished products? Ethan didn't even know what kind of ore he had collected, let alone what it could be used for. I wonder, does this world have things like cannons or steam engines? From what he had observed, this world seemed to still be in the age of sailing ships powered by wind and manpower. He hadn't come across any steam-driven vessels or other mechanical propulsion systems. Then again, with something like magic stones around, maybe they've developed magic-powered cannons or engines instead. Recalling the magic stone-fueled stove he had seen before, Ethan felt his guess wasn't far off. If that's the case, well, I need to start collecting all sorts of rare materials and studying magic stone technology. As his thoughts wandered toward the future, Ethan began tying his original boat to the new caravel using several thick ropes. He let the larger ship tow the smaller one along. With the cargo hold now packed with heavy ore, the caravel's speed was noticeably reduced. While the ship should have been much faster than his original boat, the added weight made its pace slower than before. Thankfully, I've got plenty of food, and I can make clean water on my own. I'll just take my time. The slower pace gave Ethan the opportunity to focus on consolidating what he had learned during his time on the island. Life on the ship soon fell back into its usual rhythm. Every morning, Ethan would wake up and prepare breakfast. After eating, he would rest briefly before practicing swordsmanship. At midday, when the sun was high, he would read. He still had a stack of books he had brought with him. His mental strength had steadily grown over time, and with it, his reading speed had increased significantly. For example, he had already finished the thick pile of textbooks given to him by the Ancient One. Choosing the path of a mage really comes with some unexpected perks, Ethan mused with a sense of satisfaction. With his space-time orb, he could sense spatial energy and travel between different planes. Based on his experience in the Marvel world, he figured similar worlds would likely appear again in the future. All of this comes down to my choice to train spiritual energy as a mage, Ethan reflected. If I'd chosen the warrior path and focused on physical strength instead, I would have run into endless problems just trying to communicate. He also remembered that there were spells that allowed one to quickly master a foreign language. If he ever ended up in a world like Diablo or Warcraft, where the languages weren't earth-based, those spells would save him a lot of trouble. Of course, that would only be an option after his strength improved significantly. He'd need to become a full-fledged mage first. For now, he could only work toward that goal one step at a time, though there was still so much he needed to learn. After his midday reading session, Ethan would eat some fruit to replenish his energy. Afternoons were reserved for light exercises to consolidate his morning training. Depending on his mood, he might also catch some seafood for dinner or the next day's breakfast. As evening approached and the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan would anchor the ship for the night. Without a crew to take shifts, he avoided sailing after dark for safety reasons. Dinner marked the final meal of the day, after which Ethan would begin his spiritual power training. This nightly practice would continue late into the night before he finally went to sleep. His schedule was set in stone, with only occasional interruptions for minor tasks like airing out his books to prevent mildew or maintaining his weapons and armor. Whenever he maintained his equipment, he couldn't help but think back to the novels he used to read in his previous life. The protagonists in those stories never bothered to maintain their gear. A gun stays brand new after thousands of rounds without so much as a cleaning. And swords? They're either divine artifacts or legendary weapons crafted by master smiths, and somehow they're still pristine after years of neglect. I, on the other hand, have a pile of equipment that all needs cleaning and maintenance. It's such a hassle to take care of it all. Despite his complaints, Ethan handled his gear with utmost care. He knew these items were his lifeline, and his survival depended on them. As much as he grumbled about the effort, he was meticulous in his work, ensuring every weapon and piece of armor was in top condition. Damaged equipment could mean the difference between life and death. In truth, Ethan's habit of talking to himself was born from the crushing loneliness of life at sea. With no one to speak to for extended periods, he feared that his ability to hold a conversation might deteriorate over time. Whenever the opportunity arose, he would eagerly take it just to keep his mind sharp. Occasionally, the isolation made him realize how dire his situation was. If things went on like this, he'd either lose his mind or become completely numb. The solution was obvious: he needed to find a partner, someone to share this journey with. But, finding the right partner isn't that simple, is it? Trustworthiness aside, could he even share his secrets with them? What if they learned about his ability to travel between planes? Could they be trusted with that knowledge? Ethan wasn't inherently distrustful, but recent events had reminded him of the dangers of misplaced faith. Maybe I should look for companions in the worlds I've already traveled to. The advantage of this plan was clear. If he brought someone along from another world, the secret of his ability would already be out. Additionally, he could carefully choose individuals with proven character from familiar settings. At least then, he'd have a better idea of who could be trusted not to stab him in the back. He couldn't help but recall the countless plane travel novels he had read in his previous life. Recruiting allies from other worlds was practically a staple of the genre. Back then, he used to imagine what he would do if he ever gained a similar ability. He'd fantasized about recruiting a few likable characters and building a team. I wonder if this thing can actually bring people back with me, he murmured, glancing at the time-space pointer. He remembered the conditions for bringing objects between planes. Did bringing a person work the same way? Did he need to pick them up in a specific manner? Curious, Ethan summoned the time-space orb and poured his mental power into it, hoping to uncover more of its secrets. When he first activated the device, the burst of spatial energy had injected basic instructions into his mind, teaching him how to use it. Back then, his mental strength had been far weaker, likely limiting the amount of information he could process. Now that he was stronger, perhaps he could unlock more knowledge. Unfortunately, no matter how he directed his mental power into the orb, whether gently or forcefully the device remained silent. The only visible effect was that the pointer's form seemed to stabilize slightly under his influence. Beyond that, it gave him nothing. Do I really have to figure this out myself? He muttered, feeling a pang of frustration. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed something strange. The orb's display wasn't searching as it usually did. Instead, it showed an arrow a clear direction. Spatial energy. Ethan guessed at first, but something felt off. He realized the arrow wasn't just signaling the presence of energy, it was pointing somewhere specific, toward the left side of his ship. As the vessel continued to move forward, the orb subtly adjusted, maintaining its focus on the same target. Not too far away. Excitement surged through him. Ethan quickly adjusted the ship's course, steering toward the direction indicated by the pointer. That's right. There's something I've been meaning to figure out. A question had lingered in his mind ever since he first began traveling between worlds. Did time in this world run parallel to the other planes he visited, or did it flow differently? He had considered this before but had never been able to test it. Now, thanks to scavenging the bandits' supplies, he had an hourglass on hand, something he could use to measure the passage of time in this world while he was away. One day might not be enough to draw a conclusion, but at least I'll know if time here stops completely or keeps moving. After donning his gear, Ethan double-checked his preparations. He even secured several bottles of health potions in his belt pouch, just in case. Satisfied after confirming everything multiple times, he set the hourglass on the deck, watching as the sand began to flow. Taking a few steps back, he activated the time-space teleportation circle. I wonder what kind of world I'll end up in this time. Chapter 23. The all-too-familiar sensation of shifting planes struck Ethan once more, accompanied by a blinding brilliance that rendered him temporarily sightless. As the light faded and the world settled, he instinctively scanned his surroundings, his right hand already gripping the hilt of his sword. For once, he wasn't immediately surrounded. This was a rare occurrence. In his previous 2 plane jumps, he had landed smack in the middle of groups of hostile individuals. In the dark, grim world of Diablo, he'd been greeted by a cluster of rogues with bows trained on him, ready to turn him into a pincushion at the slightest misstep. Finally, no ambush for a change. He muttered under his breath, loosening his grip on his sword. Still, Ethan couldn't shake his wariness. The landing site chosen by the teleportation circle never seemed to be reliable, at least, not by conventional standards. Then again, he thought, perhaps being thrown into safe areas despite the initial chaos was its way of being dependable. Don't be alarmed, mage from another plane, a voice suddenly called out from behind him. Startled, Ethan spun around to face what seemed to be a steep, barren mountain wall. The voice had clearly come from there, but no one was in sight. An illusion, he wondered aloud, focusing his senses. Concentrating, Ethan probed the area with his mental power. Though he lacked the ability to project his spiritual energy outward, his heightened senses detected something off, a subtle incongruity. Yet, without additional means at his disposal, he couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. Before he could delve deeper, the answer revealed itself. Like rippling water, the mountain wall shimmered and dissolved, revealing a hidden passage. From within, a white-bearded old man stepped forward, accompanied by a blonde boy. The older man was dressed like the quintessential mage from legend, leaning lightly on a long staff as he approached. Greetings, traveler from another world, the old mage said, his voice slow and calm. His tone was warm and inviting, devoid of malice. Yet, the overwhelming magical energy radiating from him like a vast, unfathomable ocean was anything but comforting. The sheer power on display, unhidden and unapologetic, was enough to put anyone on edge. Please, don't misunderstand, the old mage continued, quickly suppressing his magical aura. As a fellow mage, I'm sure you understand that sometimes, precautions must be taken for a proper conversation. The oppressive atmosphere faded as he spoke, leaving behind only his gentle demeanor. In fact, the old mage added with a faint smile, to break through the dense energy barrier and reach you, I may have overexerted myself in making initial contact. It was then that Ethan realized the mage wasn't speaking in a language he recognized. Instead, the words resonated directly in his mind, an act of mental communication. Ethan's annoyance flared. Seriously? Again? Though he understood his own weakness compared to the mages he encountered, having his mind invaded without consent still grated on him. This is getting old, he muttered. I really need to figure out a way to block these psychic intrusions. Ah, young man, you're perfectly right to feel that way, the old mage said, his tone tinged with understanding. I hope you'll allow me to make amends. The elder mage's demeanor exuded wisdom and morality. He bowed slightly, offering a genuine apology and compensation without hesitation. For instance, he continued, I could craft you an amulet to shield your mind from mental attacks. How does that sound? Ethan blinked in surprise. Wait, can you read my thoughts? Oh, not at all, the mage replied, chuckling softly. I simply surmised that such a thing might be foremost on your mind given the circumstances. His sharp, perceptive eyes gleamed beneath his kind exterior. Ethan paused, contemplating the offer. The old mage had suggested crafting the amulet so casually, as though it were a trivial task. Clearly, he was confident in his abilities as an enchanter. Still, Ethan didn't feel an immediate need for such a defense. As his own mental strength grew, he reasoned, most enemies wouldn't be able to breach his mind unless they were overwhelmingly powerful. And if someone with that level of strength wanted to harm him, no amulet in the world would make a difference. For now, Ethan decided to set the matter aside. So, what should I call you? Seeing that Ethan was willing to talk, the old mage smiled warmly. My name is Merlin. You may call me that. Merlin. Ethan's brow furrowed. The name was iconic, synonymous with legendary tales of magic and myth. A powerful mage named Merlin? The implications were clear. But which Merlin was this? The name had appeared in countless works across various cultures and genres, from Arthurian legends to modern fiction. And while some versions were noble mentors, others were, less savory. Not the version with white hair and questionable morals. I can probably rule that one out. Doesn't look like he's carrying a staff made of futuristic tech, so another possibility eliminated. Ethan scratched his head in frustration. There were simply too many iterations of Merlin to narrow it down. Merlin, noticing Ethan's reaction, seemed intrigued. Young man, do you recognize my name? Or perhaps you've encountered me or someone like me on another plane. Ethan hesitated. Merlin's question caught him off guard, but it didn't take long for him to connect the dots. The fact that Merlin immediately identified him as a traveler from another plane suggested that the mage had a deep understanding of the multiverse, possibly even more than Ethan himself. Wait. A sudden thought struck him. Don't tell me, is the reason my teleportation circle brought me here because of you? Merlin froze for a moment before smiling knowingly. You're quick to catch on. I wasn't planning to hide it. In fact, even if you hadn't noticed, I would have told you soon enough. Ethan's expression darkened. His last encounter with a powerful mage had occurred when he traveled to the Marvel Universe. There, the Sorcerer Supreme, who guarded Earth from planar invasions, intercepted him. That experience taught Ethan that truly powerful beings could interfere with his teleportation. He hadn't expected to meet another such figure so soon. With this revelation, the prospect of using his teleportation circle to travel between planes became daunting. Who knew if next time he'd cross paths with someone who might kill him outright before hearing him out? Or, Merlin interjected, as though reading his unease, I could teach you how to better control that immense energy you wield, so it doesn't shine like the moon in a pitch-black night sky, drawing attention from others like myself. Ethan's frustration eased slightly. Merlin had hit on a sore spot, one Ethan was desperate to resolve. I really need to deal with that problem, Ethan admitted with a nod, but he wasn't about to let Merlin take full control of the conversation. That said, Your Excellency, Great Mage Merlin, what is it that you want from me? After all, you didn't bring me here by accident. Merlin had deliberately intercepted him, redirecting his teleportation to arrive at this very spot. That meant he had an agenda. Ethan had initially assumed Merlin might be similar to the Ancient One, a protector of this plane, but Merlin's repeated offers of help made Ethan reconsider. This is about something connected to me, Ethan murmured to himself, trying to analyze the situation. What could a legendary powerhouse like Merlin want from him? The only thing of value he had was his ability to travel between planes. However, Merlin's earlier words suggested he wasn't particularly interested in that. If he were, why offer to help Ethan better master his spatial energy instead of exploiting it? Why don't we talk somewhere more suitable? Merlin interrupted Ethan's thoughts. Surely, standing here all day isn't ideal. You're right, Ethan agreed. Then follow me, young man, Merlin said, turning to lead the way back into the magically hidden passage. As Ethan followed, he couldn't help but notice the powerful magical barrier he passed through. It felt like walking through a curtain of water, only instead of being soaked, he was washed in waves of magic. Strangely, the barrier seemed to replenish some of the mental energy he had expended during his teleportation. The passage wasn't long, and before long, the narrow path opened into a breathtaking valley. The scene was like something out of a dream. Flowers and trees filled every inch of space, their vibrant colors and fragrances merging into an intoxicating harmony. Ethan immediately sensed the extraordinary nature of the flora. This was no ordinary valley, everything here seemed to radiate life and magic. A paradise on earth, Ethan muttered in awe. Merlin smiled, clearly pleased by the compliment. This is my home, he said with a hint of pride. The only man-made structure in the valley was a modest-looking house. From the outside, it appeared to be an ordinary three-story building. However, the moment Ethan stepped inside, he realized the space within was far larger than it seemed. Magic, of course. Without stopping, Merlin led Ethan to a reception room. Inside, a table was already set with an assortment of fruits, their vibrant colors as inviting as the valley outside. Please, have a seat, Merlin offered as he sat down himself, gesturing for Ethan to sit opposite him. Once Ethan was seated, Merlin continued, originally, I planned to spend some time conversing with you before revealing my intentions. But it seems you prefer a more direct approach, so I won't keep you in suspense. Just as he was about to explain, Merlin glanced at the blonde boy standing nearby. Suddenly, as if recalling something important, he turned back to Ethan. Ah, forgive me, I'll need to take one more liberty with you before we proceed, Merlin said apologetically. Ethan tensed but remained seated, his hand unconsciously drifting toward his sword. There won't be any harmful side effects, Merlin assured him. You may feel a slight numbness in your head or a mild headache, but nothing more. Before Ethan could protest, Merlin raised his finger to his own forehead. A stream of glowing light flowed from his head to his fingertip. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pointed at Ethan, sending the light into him. Ethan froze. His body stiffened as the light entered his mind. The sensation was strange but not painful, it felt as though something had been carefully placed within his consciousness. Then it clicked. Ethan realized what Merlin had done. The old mage had transferred a portion of his own knowledge, specifically, a foreign language, directly into Ethan's mind. "Hello, my name is Arthur," the blonde boy said, stepping forward and introducing himself in the language Ethan had just learned. Ethan blinked, startled. He understood Arthur perfectly, despite never hearing the language before. Chapter 24. Arthur Pendragon. Even without the language package Merlin had transferred into his mind, Ethan would have recognized the boy's identity based on the pronunciation alone. Is this King Arthur? The realization left him mildly stunned. He was now certain that this world wasn't part of any movie universe he knew. If it were, movies about King Arthur mostly produced by British and American studios would have featured characters speaking English, not this unfamiliar language Merlin had taught him. Ethan's grasp of history wasn't exactly strong, most of it came from fiction and the occasional online deep dive. He knew King Arthur was a legendary hero of the British Isles, but the timeline of his existence was murky at best. In fact, it wasn't even clear if King Arthur had been a real historical figure. Here, however, there was no doubt, in this plane, Arthur was very real. Of course, the British Isles of this time period wouldn't use modern English or even Old English. Could it be Old Celtic? Ethan muttered, unsure. He turned his attention to the boy in front of him. Arthur's golden hair gleamed like the sun, his strong brows and bright eyes radiating sincerity and determination. His presence exuded an unshakable sense of righteousness. The phrase "like the sun at 8 o'clock in the morning" felt tailor-made for this young man. "Hello, Arthur. Nice to meet you. My name is Ethan," Ethan said, nodding politely as he introduced himself. Arthur returned the greeting with equal formality, performing a slight bow. "I am pleased to meet you as well, Your Excellency Ethan." With the introductions out of the way, Merlin, who had been quietly observing from the side, decided it was time to cut to the chase. "Now that the two of you are acquainted, let's get down to business," the old mage said, reclaiming control of the conversation. "Ethan, I'd like to ask for your assistance in something. That's why I stopped your teleportation." Ethan didn't interrupt, waiting for Merlin to explain further. Fortunately, the legendary mage didn't waste time on theatrics and quickly got to the point. Merlin explained that, after teaching Arthur for several years, he felt it was time for the young heir to the throne to expand his horizons. Arthur needed to see the world beyond his small corner of it, to gain knowledge and experience that would prepare him for the monumental task of ruling a nation. Initially, Merlin had intended to take Arthur on a journey across this plane to better understand the kingdom's current state. But then, Merlin noticed an enormous burst of spatial energy as Ethan's teleportation spell broke through the barriers between worlds. This inspired a bold new idea: why limit Arthur's travels to just one world when the multiverse was within reach? Merlin admitted that this idea had struck him suddenly, almost like a revelation. The overwhelming energy from Ethan's magic seemed to trigger the thought, and once it took root, Merlin couldn't shake it. Without wasting time, he acted, intercepting Ethan mid-teleportation to propose his plan. Ethan, however, was left speechless. "You're saying, you want Arthur to travel to other worlds with me?" Merlin nodded, completely serious. He believed Arthur could gain invaluable insights by experiencing the vastness of the multiverse firsthand. And while the idea was unconventional, even reckless, Merlin trusted his instincts. As a ruler, Arthur needs to know more than just this world. He must be prepared for challenges that others can't even begin to imagine, Merlin said. Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to process the sheer absurdity of what he was hearing. "You do realize that this is insane, right? Let's ignore everything else for a moment. What about his safety? You've seen my abilities. I can't guarantee I'll be able to protect him." Before Merlin could respond, Arthur stepped forward, his expression resolute. "If I lose my life on this journey, it will prove I'm unfit to inherit the throne," Arthur said firmly. After a brief pause, he added, "Besides, I've trained with Merlin for years. I'm more than capable of defending myself." Ethan stared at the young man, then turned back to Merlin, waiting for him to justify this madness. As Arthur said, Merlin reiterated, if he cannot survive the trials he faces, then perhaps he isn't meant to rule. Being a king means encountering dangers far beyond what most people can imagine. If Arthur is to lead, he must learn how to confront these challenges head-on. Ethan exhaled slowly. While he wasn't entirely convinced, Merlin's argument wasn't without merit. The world or worlds was a dangerous place, especially for someone destined to rule. "Fine, but what happens if we leave this world and never return? You've seen it yourself, I can't control these spatial energies perfectly. There's no guarantee I'll be able to bring him back." Merlin smiled faintly, as though he had been waiting for this question. "That is precisely why I intercepted you," Merlin said. "Your control over those energies is, frankly, terrible. But I can teach you. I can help you master them." Ethan's eyes widened. He was taken aback by the sheer audacity of the offer. A legendary mage, offering personal guidance? It was an opportunity no aspiring spellcaster could refuse. Merlin continued, "I will teach you everything you need to know about magic, and more. Not just the manipulation of space-time energy, but a comprehensive education in the magical arts. In return, you will take Arthur with you and ensure he gains the experience he needs." The offer left Ethan conflicted. On one hand, he desperately needed a mentor. Though he hadn't encountered any major obstacles yet, Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before his progress stalled. To prepare for that inevitability, he had been diversifying his studies, dabbling in potion making, magic circles, and anything else that might help him grow. But learning directly from Merlin? That was on an entirely different level. Everything about magic? Ethan asked cautiously, still grappling with the enormity of the proposition. Not just magic, Merlin said with a knowing smile. Ethan's hesitation began to melt away. This was an offer he simply couldn't refuse. More than anything, he hoped the transaction would be successfully finalized. If this had been a business negotiation, Ethan suspected he'd have to sign a long list of unfavorable agreements just to secure Merlin's help. Fortunately, no one present was a businessman, and this wasn't a commercial exchange. Everyone's moral compass seemed to be in the right place, so there was no need for formal contracts. Both sides reached a tacit understanding, their intentions clear. The next step was to deepen their understanding of each other. Whether it was to assist Merlin's teaching or build rapport with his future teammate, Ethan knew he'd have to explain certain details about himself. For now, let's set aside the specifics of your personal training, Merlin suggested. I believe what Arthur is most curious about is the nature of the worlds he'll be visiting. Ethan shrugged. He briefly recounted his experiences in the worlds he had visited so far. He glossed over the Marvel Universe, admitting there wasn't much to say since the Ancient One had intercepted him almost immediately. The time he spent there didn't allow for any significant exploration. He spent more time describing the Diablo world, focusing on the adventures he had experienced there. However, he limited his explanation to avoid overwhelming Arthur with unnecessary details. Finally, he talked about his home world, the vast, ocean-dominated world where floating islands dotted the sea. Ethan described how its inhabitants searched for magical islands and gathered materials to survive. This unique and fantastical world captivated Arthur. The young prince couldn't hide his fascination, his usual composure slipping to reveal a youthful enthusiasm. He squirmed in his seat, barely able to contain his excitement as he imagined the possibilities. When it came to discussing how he traveled between worlds, Merlin initially assumed Ethan possessed a powerful magical artifact. However, he quickly realized it was more akin to an innate ability, a talent that couldn't simply be taken or replicated. Merlin, despite his immense power, had no intention of trying to seize it. Ethan could only hope this trust in Merlin's character wasn't misplaced. So that's how it works, Merlin remarked after hearing Ethan's explanation. The old mage now understood why Ethan's mental strength, while above average for a normal person, wasn't particularly impressive for a mage. Nor did he have any magical reserves. Inspecting the time-space orb in Ethan's hand, Merlin frowned. The device was an enigma even to him. He couldn't discern its origins or its inner workings, much less the forces behind it. Still, he offered Ethan some practical advice. While I can't fully grasp the nature of this object or how it operates, I can tell you this, for any mage, energy no matter how complex can be controlled. The only variable is how difficult it is to do so. Merlin suggested that Ethan begin practicing energy control immediately. The massive reservoir of space-time energy within him was a resource Ethan was letting dissipate naturally. Instead of passively waiting for the energy to fade and trigger an unplanned teleportation, Merlin encouraged him to take charge. By controlling this energy, Ethan could potentially dictate when and how he traveled between worlds. If my theory is correct, Merlin said, as your control over space-time energy grows, your ability will evolve accordingly. Merlin wasn't entirely certain what form these changes would take, but Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. Could he learn to teleport with precision, traveling between worlds at will instead of being thrown into random ones? Perhaps he could store the energy within himself, using it only when needed. Maybe he could even return to specific worlds deliberately instead of leaving it up to chance. All of these ideas had crossed Ethan's mind before, but they had always seemed out of reach. Now, Merlin was pointing him toward a path to achieve them. Control over energy wasn't just useful, it was essential. Merlin's advice confirmed that Ethan's lack of mastery was the key limitation of his abilities. It also aligned with what Ethan had already started to suspect. Magicians, Merlin explained, must be especially cautious when absorbing new forms of energy. The first type of energy a mage interacts with often influences their development for life. Ethan hadn't begun practicing energy control earlier because he wanted his mental power to reach a certain threshold first, ensuring he had the strength to handle whatever consequences might arise. Chapter 25. Ethan had read in many of the books he currently owned that when a mage first absorbs energy and converts it into usable magic power, it's a critical moment that demands caution. The choice of energy is especially important, as it not only determines how effectively the mage can wield magic but also impacts the mage themselves. For instance, elemental energy is a common starting point for new mages. Most begin by aligning with a specific element. This initial energy not only grants greater control over that element but also influences the mage's spiritual power, personality, and even physical state. In some cases, the assimilation is mild, but more extreme energies, such as fel energy, can severely affect a mage's character and thoughts. Over time, prolonged exposure to such energies might completely change who they are. This is why, despite the theoretical ability to use any energy as a magical source, most mages avoid certain extreme or corrupting energies at all costs. Ethan had initially considered choosing water element energy to begin his journey as a mage. One reason was practical. The first spell he learned, Water Creation, had a natural affinity for water-related abilities. The more compelling reason, however, was environmental. The ocean-dominated world he had been exploring was practically tailor-made for water element magic, which would receive substantial amplification in such a setting. Additionally, water's ice element variant offered incredible versatility. It was practical, powerful, and, in Ethan's opinion, undeniably stylish to wield. Of course, real magic wasn't like a game. Choosing a specific elemental energy didn't mean a mage could only use spells of that element. Instead, the efficiency of casting other elements depended on how compatible they were with the mage's chosen energy. For instance, a mage who used water element energy would find fire magic less efficient and more costly to cast. That said, some legendary mages, such as Isandra, mastered multiple elements. Such mages either fully controlled elemental energy, allowing their spells to contain more than one element, or based their magic on highly adaptable energies like arcane energy, which could shift to suit different spells. If I'm not mistaken, you intended to start your journey as a mage by absorbing water element energy and mastering elemental magic, Merlin said. Ethan nodded, slightly surprised by how accurately Merlin had assessed his intentions. In the world of magic, classifications like elementalist or arcanist were largely superficial. True archmages didn't limit themselves to specific schools or energies. They strove to eliminate any weaknesses in their magical knowledge, achieving the ability to freely manipulate spells and magic attributes as needed. However, the journey to becoming such a mage was heavily influenced by the initial energy a mage absorbed. This choice could dictate how far they could progress and even shape their ultimate potential. You're right, Ethan confirmed. By now, Ethan had spent 2 days under Merlin's roof. During that time, Merlin hadn't begun teaching but had instead conducted a thorough assessment of Ethan's abilities. Now, it seemed, the lessons were about to start. There's nothing wrong with your choice, Merlin said thoughtfully. If I were in your position, I might have chosen the same path. He paused, as if carefully considering his next words. That said, I have a proposition for you, a path that's far more challenging but offers immense potential. If you succeed, your future achievements could be extraordinary. Would you be interested? Ethan frowned slightly, puzzled by the vagueness of Merlin's proposal. How extraordinary are we talking? Merlin took a moment to think, likely searching for a frame of reference that Ethan would understand. Finally, he smiled and made a bold comparison. I can't predict how far you'll go, it depends entirely on your own determination. But if you follow this path and succeed, your achievements will at least rival my own. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Despite his attempts to stay calm, the gravity of Merlin's statement made it difficult to suppress his excitement. Still, he managed to maintain his composure, refusing to embarrass himself in front of the legendary mage. Comparable to you? Ethan asked carefully. You mean the ability to observe endless planes, break through dimensional barriers, or even, destroy an entire plane? The first two possibilities seemed entirely plausible. Merlin clearly possessed the strength to traverse the multiverse, and Ethan wouldn't be surprised if he could breach even the most fortified barriers. As for destroying a plane, that was harder to gauge. At the very least, Ethan suspected that Merlin or someone like the Ancient One, who protected Earth from multiverse incursions, could easily destroy a planet if they unleashed their full power. While this didn't mean such mages could obliterate worlds with a single spell, their vast knowledge and cunning made them unpredictable and dangerous. For example, the Ancient One could theoretically summon Dormammu, plunging an entire plane into eternal darkness. Such an act would achieve the same result as outright destruction, showcasing the terrifying potential of powerful mages. That was what made mages so dangerous, the sheer unpredictability of their abilities. No one truly knew what they were capable of or what lengths they might go to achieve their goals. Ethan wanted to reach that level someday. The allure of becoming such a formidable mage made Merlin's proposal impossible to ignore. You should know that mages, at their core, are individuals who rely on powerful spiritual energy to manipulate magical forces and achieve their goals. Whether it's casting a fireball or performing advanced spells, the principles are fundamentally the same, Merlin began. Ethan nodded, waiting for him to elaborate. Spiritual power forms the foundation of all mages. The stronger your spiritual power, the more energy you can control, which in turn allows you to cast more powerful magic and pursue greater ambitions. Ethan was painfully aware of this. His spiritual power wasn't yet at the threshold required to qualify as a proper mage. He had been diligently working to improve it for years. Since acquiring the time-space orb, he'd also been exercising his spiritual strength through constant practice. But the power of spiritual energy does more than just allow mages to wield more energy, Merlin continued. It also determines the relationship between you and magic itself. What do you mean by that? Ethan asked, puzzled. Merlin explained in detail, and gradually, Ethan began to grasp the concept. The relationship between a mage and magical energy wasn't a simple master-slave dynamic. For a mage, understanding one's spiritual limit was crucial when absorbing energy. Without that awareness, absorbing too much magic could lead to severe consequences. The energy could start to invade the mage's mind, corrupting their thoughts and personality. Ethan recalled examples from the books he'd read. In milder cases, the mage's spiritual energy would be contaminated, leading to minor imbalances. In extreme cases, the mage's character and behavior would be fundamentally altered. For instance, Merlin explained, if a mage's spiritual power can handle 10 units of magical energy, but they try to control more than that, they'll begin to experience dangerous side effects. He clarified that this was a simplified explanation. While the quantity of spiritual energy mattered, its quality was just as important. Ethan started to piece it together. So, what you're saying is, I should focus on developing my spiritual power further before trying to absorb energy and convert it into magic. Merlin smiled and shook his head. Not exactly. The path I propose is far more unconventional, it requires you to avoid absorbing external energy altogether. Ethan froze, startled. He couldn't imagine how such a thing would work. Wait, you mean, no absorption at all? Merlin nodded. You see, mages don't necessarily need to rely on external energy. They can generate their own magic power. Ethan frowned, confused. He hadn't encountered this concept in the books he'd studied. From what he'd read, mages converted external energy into magic power and then stored it within themselves. While mages could naturally regenerate magic power over time, it was always assumed that this process was slower and secondary to external absorption. Seeing Ethan's confusion, Merlin explained further. The magic power generated by a mage internally is fundamentally different from that drawn from external sources. It's pure and far more adaptable, it can be molded to fit a variety of purposes with greater ease. Merlin sighed before continuing. Unfortunately, by the time most mages discover this truth, their spiritual power has already been tainted by the energies they've absorbed. The magic power they generate after this point naturally aligns with the attributes of the energies they were exposed to earlier. How strong this alignment is depends on the extent of the spiritual pollution. This was why mages referred to external energies' influence on their spiritual power as pollution. Even with countermeasures, eliminating this contamination was a time-consuming and resource-intensive process. Hearing this, Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Reflecting on his previous plans, he realized how close he had come to making a grave mistake. With his still developing spiritual power, it was almost inevitable that absorbing water element energy would have polluted his mind. Worse, if he ever tried to incorporate other elements in the future, the conflict could weaken his ability to control space-time energy or worse, render him incapable of it altogether. For the first time, Ethan was grateful for the delays that had prevented him from committing to his initial plan. Merlin's words felt like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of a precarious decision. So, Ethan said slowly, his understanding deepening, the path you're suggesting is for me to continue absorbing my spiritual power and rely entirely on it to generate my own magic energy. Merlin smiled, clearly pleased. Exactly. That's the path I believe is best for you. The implications of this path weren't lost on Ethan. It would be far more challenging than the traditional route. Without absorbing external energy, his progress in the early stages would be agonizingly slow. He'd be stuck with limited magical abilities, leaving him only marginally stronger than an ordinary person. Merlin watched Ethan carefully, expecting him to take some time to weigh the pros and cons of such a demanding choice. To his surprise, Ethan didn't hesitate. I'll choose this path. Ethan said decisively.